Chapter 21. Gaara glanced up from the floor as the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the hall beyond the bars of her cell. She was all alone at present. Naruto had been taken roughly 4 hours previously for medical examinations, and he had yet to return. It concerned the girl greatly, but she had also locked onto his chakra signal long ago, and had not felt it dwindle. Wherever he was roughly as healthy as he had been. At least he gave me my tunic back before they took him, Gaara thought to herself as the footsteps grew closer to the cell. The blonde's reaction to waking up with her shirt covering him had been quite humorous, if a tad sporadic. He had instantly flushed red and tossed the tunic back at her, seemingly flustered by the sight of Gaara in nothing but a thin tank top. At the memory, the redhead sighed. I'm not even sure why it made him uncomfortable. He looked more afraid of me without my tunic than he did while I was transformed. That boy is so strange sometimes, she recalled. Her thoughts were then interrupted by a tap on the metal bars of her cell. Standing on the other side of the barrier was the subject of much of Gaara's ire. You look quite ragged, if I may say so, Danzo greeted her rudely. The redhead gave him a half-lidded glare and kept her chin rested on her knees. I haven't slept in 8 days. Even for me, that's extreme. You also stole away my only source of positivity, she retorted tiredly. Danzo waved a dismissive hand and pulled up a guard stool in front of the cell to sit on. He'll be back within the hour. Worry not. I'm a harsh man at times, but I'm not sadistic. It's clear to me that you'd have tried something foolish by now if Naruto weren't your cellmate, he assured the girl as he made himself comfortable. Gaara straightened out one of her legs and rested one of her arms on her still bent knee. Why are you here? It's clear that you aren't going to treat any of my wounds, she asked suspiciously. The bandaged old man leaned forward on the cane he had been walking with and studied the girl. I simply have a few questions to ask you. That's all, he said calmly. Gaara rubbed her eyes and motioned for Danzo to ask his questions. First and foremost, I'd like to know if you were involved with the death of Hideo Miorga, whose body we found on October 17th. He was found mutilated in the janitor's closet of an apartment complex. In fact, the very same in which Naruto lives, he began. Of all the reactions he had expected to garner from his question, Gaara gave him one of the most unsettling and unexpected. Instead of growing tense, becoming defensive, or even simply remaining silent, the Jinchuriki lowered her head and began to laugh. It was a low, disturbing giggle. One that almost seemed to contain self-awareness. Her chuckles never grew louder than just above a whisper, but they were all too audible. After a moment or two, she calmed down, and when she did, she returned her attention to Danzo, revealing a dark smirk. I knew I should have chosen a better hiding place, but I still have the excuse of inexperience when it comes to cover-ups. I've never had to hide a body before, she said. The old man frowned. So you admit to being the culprit? Is that what I'm hearing? He pressed. The redhead shrugged her shoulders and allowed her posture to relax slightly. I have no way to deny it, so yes, I am. I didn't bother learning that wretch's name before I ran him through, but I killed him all the same. He had it coming, she explained. Danzo stroked his chin quizzically at the revelation. Would you mind explaining exactly why you killed a man whom you had no association with? You're clearly something of a sociopath, but you don't strike me as the type to murder without reason. You had a motive, and I want to know what it was, he inquired. Gaara snorted and scratched her cheek absently. Isn't it obvious? He had the nerve to try and harm Naruto. He planned to cause him pain. People like him deserve a shallow grave, and I gladly dug it for him, she said bluntly. The old man nodded and leaned back in his chair. That leads us smoothly into my second question. Why, pray tell, are you so fixated on that boy? To my knowledge, you have no history with him before the month that led up to the final round of the Chunin exam. What could possibly drive you to defend him so fiercely? He asked. Gaara opened her mouth to retort, but was cut off by Danzo adding on to his initial question. Before you answer that, may I try my hand at inference? He requested. After a moment of hesitancy, the Jinchuriki nodded in confirmation. At this, Danzo took a deep breath. I'm going to make the educated guess that your childhood has been as tumultuous, if not more so, than Naruto's. Your experience with unbiased and accepting people is limited, and you have no real perception of what it means to have empathy. At least, not in a fully developed sense. You're capable of connecting to those with shared experiences, but the number of people currently living who can claim to have those experiences is exceptionally small, he began. Gaara's frown strengthened into a scowl as the old man spoke. And as such, you've lived most of your life in self-induced isolation. You mentioned earlier that you'd never had to hide a body before, which implies that you've killed a number of people in the past. My guess would be that you killed them in response to their attempts to hold you accountable for your antisocial behavior. At first, at least. Past the first few killings, they became acts of self-defense. Danzo continued. Gaara clenched her jaw. Get to the point, she growled. Taking a great degree of pleasure in the young Jinchuriki's discomfort at the subject matter, the old man suppressed a short laugh. Upon meeting Naruto for the first time, you were struck by how similar he was to you. Similar, yet different. Similar, yet better. He hadn't yet been broken by the hardships of life the way you had. He was a beacon. Something to strive for. Touching, really. The mind of a child is incredibly adaptable. You were lost, so you found something to hold strong to. It was less about him than it was about your own stability, he concluded. Gaara stared at him silently, a look of thinly veiled hate on her face. You say all of that like you've known about my presence for quite some time, she said. Danzo nodded and leaned his cane against the wall. I knew what you were the moment you set foot in this village. Even before you met Naruto. Your chakra was so noticeably different from your peers that I couldn't help but take an interest. Back on topic, though. Was any of what I said incorrect? He asked. Gaara averted eye contact, her face twitching periodically. Perhaps it was about myself initially, but not anymore. I could care less what happens to me now as long as he's safe and healthy. And it's not as though it wasn't fitting for my interest in him to be born of selfishness at first. It is my namesake, after all, she said. Danzo gave a false smile. I suppose you're right. Expecting a girl like you to concern herself with the ethics of manipulation is a bit much. Though, murdering a man in Naruto's name certainly was a step in the right direction in a roundabout way, he said. What's driving you to break down and analyze my psychology this way? What's in it for you? Gaara questioned. Danzo stood up from his chair and took hold of his cane. It's all food for thought. You're a fascinating case of how upbringing can affect development. You likely were just a child at one time, but life has made you a freak. It's almost sad, he said insensitively. The redhead didn't respond. Taking this as his cue to leave her, Danzo took steps to exit the hall. Before he could leave earshot, however, Gaara's voice echoed through the corridor one last time. When Naruto is returned to me, I'll be examining him thoroughly. If I find a single new injury, I'll kill each and every one of your adherents. Don't think this cell can contain me, Danzo, she said menacingly. A smirk spread across Danzo's face as he walked away. What a monstrous girl? The prospect of feeling relief at the sight of one's prison cell was an odd one. Preposterous, even. The sight of one's detainment was not meant to bring the prisoner any sort of comfort. The opposite was intended. A prison was meant to inspire repentance in its residents by depriving them of the joys of life. Under certain circumstances, however, the simple familiarity of a single room could quell the discomfort of a prisoner. As of the present, it was indeed one of those situations. After having been under medical scrutiny for hours on end, Naruto found himself eager to just settle down. Solitude was not an option, but Gaara had proven herself to be a manageable cellmate. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and she kept her distance at the blonde's request. While the parameters of their living situation certainly did fit Naruto's preferences, he did find himself feeling guilty from time to time. Gaara had absolutely shattered his trust with her own hands, but she did seem to be genuinely regretful of her actions. Maybe, that's why I let her kiss me. As sort of a reward for being so nice about this. I still don't really trust her, though. Naruto thought to himself as he was led along down the hall that ended with his and Gaara's shared cell. Once they reached the steel bars, the guard opened the door with a set of keys and shoved the blonde inside. The push had been forceful enough to cause him to lose his balance, and he stumbled as a result. Before he could fall forward, he was caught by his arms and steered back upright to a stable standing position. Are you okay? Gaara, who had rushed from her sitting place on the wall, asked urgently as she gripped his shoulders. Naruto nodded and looked away from her wide, concerned eyes. Yeah, I'm fine. There's no need to dash, he said. Before he could finish, Gaara cut him off by yanking up on his shirt and examining his abdomen. The blonde immediately reeled backwards and pulled his shirt back down. What the hell are you doing? He asked, clearly incredibly uneasy about what had just occurred. Gaara looked at the floor and slowly walked towards him. Naruto's instinct was to back up, but opted not to do so. I just want to make absolutely sure they didn't hurt you. We both know that you wouldn't tell me if they did. I'm sorry if I shocked you, she said apologetically. Naruto gave her a skeptical look as she fidgeted with her bangs as she tended to. I'm fine, Gaara. You don't have to worry. I'm totally alright, he assured her. The redhead quit playing with her hair and gazed up at him. Can I please make sure? Just to ease my nerves. You're all I have right now, and I don't want your health to be a mystery to me, she asked meekly. Naruto's expression softened slightly. I'm not going to take off my shirt, he said. His fellow Jinchuriki shook her head and pointed to the floor. Then don't. Just sit down please, she said. The blonde sighed and did as he was told, taking a seat on the cold stone floor at Gaara's feet. His cellmate then knelt down behind him and ran her hands over his back. Tell me if anything hurts. Don't hide anything, she said softly. For the first 30 seconds, no reaction came from Naruto. Once Gaara reached his ribcage, however, he visibly flinched. They told me 3 are broken. They said a cast isn't possible, he said in a pained tone as Gaara gently felt his injured midriff. After a time, the redhead spoke. It was from when I knocked you backwards with great breach, wasn't it? She asked quietly. Naruto gave a reluctant nod. Gaara bit her lip and moved her hands forward to graze his stomach. I'm sorry for that, she muttered. She then ran her hands up his front until she reached his shoulders, at which point she tugged on him to turn around. Naruto slowly obliged, eventually rotating fully to face her. Once they were face to face, Gaara looked over his face and frowned. There was a cut on the bridge of his nose. One that had not been there before his departure for examination. So, they did hurt you? She muttered, her eyes seeming to glaze over for a moment as her expression darkened. Sensing her spiraling emotional state, Naruto tensed. It was my fault. I lashed out at one of the guards, so he hit me. It was my doing, he said frantically as Gaara turned around and stood to her feet. The blonde immediately shot up and grabbed her around the waist from behind. Please don't. I don't want any more blood. Please, Gaara. He begged. The redhead remained silent for several moments before sighing heavily and gently prying his hands from her. She then turned back into him and stepped forward. Why? Why are you so willing to forgive them? Even if you don't want blood, you wouldn't have to watch. I could make it quiet and clean. I can't stand to just let them get away with abusing you, she said in a fit of frustration as she rested her forehead on his chest and gripped his shirt with her hands. The Leaf Genin tried and failed to answer several times, but eventually found his voice. You need to learn to let things go. Especially things that don't have to do with you. I started the fight, and I paid for it. You don't need to stress yourself out over my issues, he said. Gaara clenched her jaw and snapped her head up. Their faces were now hardly an inch apart. Your issues are my issues now. I will not ignore your struggles. Right now, you belong to me, she hissed indignantly. Naruto backed up a step and looked away from her. Just, try to calm down. I don't want any bodies on my conscience. You care, I can see that now, but I can't just let you run off and kill somebody. Besides, our chances of getting out of here aren't going to get better if you get wild, he said uncomfortably. He then slumped down the wall and lowered his head as he sat. Gaara stared down at him quietly. He was the picture of exhaustion. His shoulders were sagging, his eyes were nearly closed, and his head was craned downward. He looked utterly defeated. It wasn't difficult to discern why that was. His comrades had been maimed, he had been arrested, and he was held up in a cell with the cause of both of those things. He had nothing to be happy about beyond simply being alive. Naruto, Gaara muttered aloud as she gazed at him. She had spoken quietly, but her words were detected nonetheless. Yeah, the Leaf Genin asked, not bothering to look up from the floor. The redhead collected herself for a moment and sat down a few feet from him on the same wall. You deserved better, she said. Naruto raised his head up and cast her a sideways look across the cell. With you, or just in general? He asked bluntly. Gaara laughed sadly and stared up at the ceiling. In this instance, both. As much as it angers me that you were hurt, I did nothing to ease any of your stress. Not just today, either. I practically forced myself on you yesterday, and all because I was feeling touchy. You've gotten a tough run of things, she said. The blonde genin shrugged his shoulders. Yeah, maybe. I'm pretty much used to things sucking at this point. This is just a harder version of what I'm normally up against. I'll pull through. And don't feel guilty about yesterday. It's fine. Honestly, it wasn't that bad, he replied. Gaara smiled to herself. Thank you, I'm glad I didn't make you too uncomfortable. As for the rest, please believe me when I say that I want to help you. I want to help you be at peace. Any way I can, she said sincerely. The blonde rubbed his eyes and sighed. Can you do something for me, then? He asked. Gaara nodded eagerly and awaited what his request may be. Get some sleep. I know it hurts you, but you're going to either die or lose your mind if you don't get some rest, he urged her. Much to Naruto's surprise, she nodded. Yes, on one condition, she said. Before the Leaf Genin could ask the obvious question, Gaara answered it for him by scooting closer to him and leaning her head on his shoulder. Let me rest on you, and I'll try. I don't think I'll get anywhere close on my own, she clarified. Ignoring his conflicted emotions and burning face, Naruto nodded and shifted to make her more comfortable against him. Sure. Go ahead, he said. Gaara then closed her eyes and laid her hand over his. Within moments, her breathing appeared to even. Unsure of whether or not she was truly asleep, Naruto chose to keep his final remark silent. You're the sweetest thing when you actually calm down, Gaara. I'm kinda surprised they let you in here. They weren't going to, but I didn't give them much of a choice. Naruto and Sasuke shared a low laugh. It was nearly sunrise, and the Uchiha had apparently forced his way into the blonde's prison wing to pay him a visit. It was a welcome arrival, as the only people the Jinchuriki had been able to interact with for the past week had been Gaara, Danzo, and occasionally the guards. Limited selection, to say the least. Sasuke had arrived only moments earlier, but the blonde's mood had already lifted somewhat. "Glad you forced your way through. How've you been since the invasion?" Naruto asked his friend in a hushed tone. Sasuke, who had not bothered to look closely at his teammate until the present moment, frowned. "Other than the hospital time, I've been more or less fine. But, what's that about?" he asked, pointing to Gaara as he spoke. Quickly realizing what he was referring to, Naruto sighed. The redhead was asleep, and she was still leaning against Naruto as she had been before. She had yet to awaken. "She fell asleep, and she asked to use me for support," the blonde explained tiredly. Sasuke's frown did not falter at his explanation. "And you let her?" he asked skeptically, clearly still struggling to understand what exactly he was looking at. Naruto glanced at his slumbering cellmate and then back to Sasuke. "Yeah, I guess I did. She doesn't sleep a lot. She'd be a hell of a lot worse if I didn't make her nap," he said. The Uchiha sat down in front of the cell and pursed his lips. "You sound sympathetic to her. Why is that?" he asked. Naruto shifted carefully so as not to wake the girl resting on him. "That's kind of a long story. I still don't trust her fully, but I'm pretty sure she isn't going to hurt me," he said. Sasuke studied Gaara silently, watching her breath and press on his teammate. "You get why this bothers me, right? She hasn't really been all that pleasant. Not to anybody but you, apparently," he said carefully. Naruto nodded stiffly. "Yeah, I get it. But still, I don't really think she's that awful. She's just a little erratic," he said. Sasuke sighed and looked the blonde in the eyes. "No offense, but you haven't seen what I've seen with her. When you showed up, she changed. I don't know what history you two have, but it clearly altered her demeanor. She was a monster when Shino, Kiba, and I fought her," he said. Naruto drummed his fingers on the cold floor pensively. "I know. I haven't forgiven her for what she did to you guys, but I still can't subscribe to the idea that she's just evil. I don't buy it," he said. Gaara then moved a bit, making a small noise as she did so. Sasuke tensed at the possibility of the girl awakening, but it soon came to pass. She was still unconscious, and her head was still leaned against Naruto's neck and shoulder. "Maybe she isn't with you, but she's shown no restraint against everybody else. If you hadn't shown up when you did, she'd have killed me. Same goes for when I saved Shino and Kiba. She's ruthless, Naruto," Sasuke said. At his words, a recent memory returned to the blonde. "So, they did hurt you?" Naruto shuddered slightly as he recalled the dead look in Gaara's eyes as she had prepared to raise hell on the security staff of the prison. Had Naruto not rushed to stop her, Gaara certainly would have added several more names to her ledger of violence. The triggering factor had been the blonde's injury at the hands of a guard, but Naruto still found himself wondering. Could it have all been an excuse? An excuse to crush another slew of people? A quick glance at Gaara's sleeping face brought about great turmoil within Naruto's mind. The contrast between the brutal atrocities she had committed and the tranquil quality about her features was stark and extreme. Much of what Sasuke had said was clearly driven by a bias against the girl, but none of it was factually incorrect. She had indeed come close to killing 3 of his comrades, and there were rumors of another murder that had apparently occurred in Naruto's apartment building. Other than her strange interest in the Leaf Genin, her time in Konoha had been defined by savagery. Even if she is, does that really make her a monster? "It's not like I haven't gone berserk before, and she was under orders to come and kill me?" Naruto asked quietly. Sasuke nodded his head firmly. "Yeah, I think it does. Especially since she was smiling while she was beating me up, and I swear to you, I heard her laughing while I was on my way to get Kiba and Shino out of there. She's a sadist through and through," he said as he scowled at the sleeping Jinchuriki. "I still want to believe that she's being honest with me. She seems apologetic about everything that's happened, for whatever that's worth," Naruto muttered. Sasuke stood up from where he was sitting. "It isn't worth a damn thing. Besides, I doubt she means it. I'm sorry, but I can't get behind the idea that she was just having a bad day when she tried to kill us," he said. His expression then tamed slightly. "Look, I'm just apprehensive. I don't think she can be trusted. Not by you, not by anybody. It's nothing against you, and maybe you know things about her that I don't, but please, try to understand where I'm coming from here," he said. At this, he turned around and began to walk away. Before he could disappear around the corner, though, he stopped. "I know that you probably feel attached to her because she's like you, but trust me, Naruto. That girl's more thorn than flower," he assured the blonde. A moment later, he was gone from view. His footsteps slowly faded into silence as he walked away. Once he was gone, Naruto released a breath he had been holding. Since when are you a poet, Sasuke? He thought to himself in reference to the Uchiha's final words to him. Sasuke's visit had been fairly brief, and it hadn't been particularly positive. The moment he had noticed Gaara's presence, he had become agitated. It wasn't difficult to understand why that was, but it was disappointing nonetheless. He's right, you know. The blonde flinched at the sudden noise. It was spoken right into his ear. Looking down and to his left, he saw that Gaara's eyes were now open. How much of that did you hear? Naruto asked. The girl exhaled through her nose and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Nearly all of it. I woke up early on into the conversation. I remained silent for obvious reasons, she explained. The blonde tensed slightly, a reaction Gaara easily noticed. You're so expressive. Especially when you're afraid. How cute, she muttered, pressing herself into him further as she spoke. Naruto reddened at the increased contact. What did you mean? Just now. What was Sasuke right about? He asked in an attempt to change the topic. About me being untrustworthy. You yourself said that you'd never forgive me for what I did. I despise Sasuke Uchiha for a variety of reasons, but I agree with him on this one thing. You trusting me is foolish, the redhead replied. Naruto frowned and glanced down at her, causing his ear to brush through her hair. What's gotten into you? Yesterday, you were almost begging me to trust you. What changed? He asked. Gaara took several moments to answer him. My nightmares were memories this time. Memories from the invasion. They returned me to the day of the invasion. I relived the entire thing. From my encounter with Shino Aburame and Kiba Inuzuka to my battle against you. I could see everything. I swear I felt it all again. Every punch, every drop of blood, she said, her tone unsettling and dark. What are you getting at? Naruto asked nervously. Gaara wrapped herself around his arm and clamped down on it. He was telling you the truth. I laughed, I grinned, and I enjoyed myself. I was buoyed by their fear and pain, she said. Naruto stared at her wide-eyed, extraordinarily uncomfortable with the information being revealed to him. By this point, Gaara had pressed her face into Naruto's shoulder. I know how awful it is. I know. She said britly, repeating the final two words several times before lapsing into silence. It was then that Naruto noticed that his shoulder was damp. She was crying. Her sniffles were audible, and her body was racked with tremors. Naruto needed to respond. He needed to speak, and he knew it. Unfortunately, the shock of Gaara's sudden shattering had affected him as well. His mouth was dry and paralyzed. I know I'm a freak. I know I'm insane. I know it's wrong. I don't want to kill, but I can't stop. The girl stuttered tearfully. Finally finding his voice, Naruto spoke one word. Why? He asked hoarsely. The redhead bit her lip and crawled fully on top of him in his lap. It wasn't a gesture of domineering confidence. It was akin to an infant seeking comfort. This sentiment was further evidenced by what she did when she had fully settled. She didn't glower over him. Instead, she curled up and pressed her face into his chest. He won't get out of my head. He won't leave me alone. She whimpered fearfully as her tears soaked his shirt. Naruto instantly understood. The very same thing that prevented her from sleeping was to blame. At least somewhat. Gaara. He whispered quietly. Gaara tensed and reached up. Her hand then covered his mouth. Don't say my name. It's ugly, she said weakly. The blonde slowly peeled her palm from his face and kept hold of it. No, it isn't. Even if you've done some awful things, you did them to keep your sanity. Maybe I still can't forgive you, but you aren't ugly or a monster. You're human, he assured her gently. At this, Gaara straightened her back and removed her face from his chest. Her hands then found their way to the sides of his face. I love you so much, she said shakily as she gazed up at him. Her cellmate maintained eye contact and studied her. I don't really get why. Even now, he said honestly. Gaara slid herself up on his lap and put her hands on his shoulders. You're the purest person I've ever met. You've given me some hope, if only a little. That's more than even my own family has ever done for me. You have the husk of my heart, she said. Without warning, she crushed her lips to his messily. After a few moments, she pulled her mouth from his. You make me feel warm and safe, she whispered with her forehead leaned against his. The leaf genin looked away from her guiltily. I can't say how I feel right now. I don't know yet, he said. Gaara ran her hands through his hair and smiled softly. I don't expect you to love me. I'm arguably insane, I've killed in cold blood, and I hurt you tremendously. I have no right to expect you to reciprocate, she said sadly. Her cheeks then gained a red tint. But, could you let this wreckage kiss you a little bit? I want to thank you. For everything you've done for me, she requested. Naruto met her eyes and nodded. Gaara then tilted her head to the side and pressed her lips to his softly with her arms draped over the back of his neck. They cycled through breathing and kissing for nearly 3 minutes until Gaara made space. You taste sweet, she said affectionately. Naruto blushed uncharacteristically and averted his eyes from Gaara's loving gaze. Thanks. You're a lot better than you were yesterday, he said awkwardly. The redhead smiled proudly and let him shift underneath her to make himself more comfortable. My only happy dream was about kissing you, so you could say I had practice, she said somewhat shyly. She then shrunk down into him again and tucked her head underneath his chin. But, we don't have to kiss anymore. That's okay with me, she said. Naruto proceeded to pleasantly surprise her by wrapping an arm around her and hugging her into himself. I actually didn't hate it. Your lips are soft, he said. Gaara turned pink at the compliment and nuzzled her face into the crook of his neck. A spell of silence then cast itself over the pair as they held one another in the face of the rising sun. After a time, Gaara broke the silence. Even if you leave me in this cell when you're released, please don't forget about me. That's all I ask, she said quietly. Naruto shook his head. I'm not leaving you in here. Not a chance in hell, he said firmly. Gaara chuckled and ran her hand along his abdomen. What do you plan to do then? I could break my way out of here without much effort, but that would require me to kill, she asked. The blonde pried her off of him just enough for their eyes to meet again. We're breaking out of here, and we're doing it without hurting anybody, he replied. The redhead smiled at his determination and gave him a peck on the nose. She then collapsed into him again, this time closing her eyes while she used his chest as a pillow. That sounds wonderful. Wake me when you're ready, she said with a rare yawn. Naruto frowned and glanced down at the girl in his arms. Are you sure you want to sleep again? He asked, greatly concerned by the prospect of Gaara encountering more nightmares. I'm happy, Naruto. So happy. Even if I have nightmares, I'll have you, she said as she drifted off to sleep once again. If it's too much, and you wake up, please don't hide it from me, he said. Gaara nodded slightly and closed her eyes. I love you so very much, Naruto, she said finally. The leaf genin kept to his silence for a moment or two, searching for the proper and honest thing to say. I'm glad. Don't stop. I'm getting there. Sasuke flopped down onto his bed and removed his forehead protector, tossing it onto his nightstand upon pulling it free from his head. Despite having awoken only an hour earlier, he found himself feeling utterly exhausted. His trip to the prison had been tiring in a number of ways. Practically breaking past the guards had been stressful, maintaining his calm in the face of a sleeping Gaara had been nearly impossible, and listening to his teammate speak about the very same girl who had wreaked havoc on them only a few days earlier in a sympathetic light had been fairly jarring. She's off her rocker, Naruto. I don't care how nice and gentle she is with you. It isn't real. It can't be, he thought to himself in frustration. The Uchiha had more or less made his thoughts on the girl vocal during his visit, but he had still suppressed many of his harsher comments for fear that Gaara had been silently listening. The subtle degree of fear Sasuke had experienced opposite the pair of Jinchuriki had been infuriating. Fear was a limiting emotion, and it had greatly restrained him. No matter how much I hate it, she's still stronger than me. I can't afford to start a fight with her if she gets released at some point, or if she ever decides to smash her way out of that cell. Even if Naruto can beat her, she might just kill me quickly a third time around, he admitted to himself. Gaara was contained, and yet he still felt powerless. Both literally and metaphorically. The image of her head leaning on Naruto's shoulder sickened him. You were screaming for blood. You had us dead to rights. You'd have taken your time killing us if you weren't operating on limited time, and you still have the nerve to get touchy with Naruto. You're a sadistic whore, Sasuke growled within his mind. His jaw was clenched, his hands were curled into fists, and his eyes were narrowed. He hated the situation. He hated it strongly. Above all else, he despised Gaara. She was an enemy, but more than that, she was a parasite. One that ate away at a person. Before he could fall too far into his darker thoughts, Sasuke let out a sigh. It was pointless to mull over things he couldn't control. If bygone history was any indication, he would get his chance. To do what, he did not know, but a chance would present itself. An opportunity to right the wrongs of the present situation. In the back of his mind, though, there was a sinking feeling. A feeling that things would not be resolved easily. There would be tremendous struggle. Perhaps against an unexpected foe. It was an off-putting feeling, and it drew a shudder from the Uchiha. I'll just play this by ear. No point in letting it distract me from everyday life. Naruto will be released in early February, so it won't be too long until he's away from her. Yeah, this will just sort itself out, he assured himself with a deep breath. It was possible that he was convincing himself of a false reality, but it mattered not. He needed to remain calm and focused. Life would not cease. Especially not with a war on the horizon. If anything, his attention would be required more than usual. Strange times. Not particularly good ones, but strange all the same. Gaara's eyes slowly fluttered open as she was gently shaken awake. The first thing she saw was the face of Naruto, who was cradling her head and upper back. She was still on top of him as she had been that morning, and based upon the state of her body temperature, they had not separated once during the hours of her slumber. These realizations brought a smile to her face. "Good morning," she greeted him sleepily. Nightmares had been a predictable issue, but they had also been far less prevalent than they usually were. For the first time in an immeasurably long time, Gaara felt well rested. "Good night, actually. You slept all day," Naruto corrected. The redhead's eyes drifted toward the singular window their cell harbored. It was indeed still dark, and the temperature of their cell was frigid. With all of this in mind, she turned her gaze back towards him and nestled into him a bit more. "Did I? I'm sorry for the trouble. You made me very warm, so I got a little too comfortable, it seems," she said through a yawn. Naruto shook his head and brushed a bit of hair out of her eyes, causing Gaara to curl up against him a bit more. "No, you're fine. You didn't move a ton, so holding you wasn't bad at all," he assured her. Gaara then recalled what she had said to her fellow Jinchuriki just before drifting off to sleep. "Since you woke me up, does this mean that you wish to escape, Naruto?" she asked. The blonde nodded stiffly and sighed nervously. "Why yeah. I think I'm ready. Let's break out of here," he said. Gaara studied him for a moment and then reached up to turn his face back towards her. "We can't stay in Konoha for obvious reasons, so tell me, where are you planning on going?" "I'll follow you no matter where it is, but I'd like to know ahead of time," she asked. Naruto remained silent for several moments, seemingly struggling with something. "We're going to the coast. I think I know a place to regroup. Somewhere I read about a while ago," he explained. The redhead shifted in his arms and maintained her gaze. "It sounds to me like you aren't entirely willing to stay away," she said curiously. Naruto's expression darkened slightly at her words. "Danzo is too much for us. I knew that about 30 seconds into my conversation with him. He's stronger than you and I put together. I need time to develop and grow before I come for him," he said. Gaara tilted her head off to one side. "Oh? This is a new melody from you. I never took you as the type to hold grudges," she said. The blonde shook his head and relaxed slightly. "I'm not usually, but he crossed every line. He wants to make me a weapon, and he used you as a bargaining chip. I can't forgive that. I'll make him pay for it in blood," he said. Gaara then sat up and made her way to a kneeling position in front of him. "Well, I'm glad I mean enough to you for such a thing to anger you so. You're very sweet," she said before giving him a peck on the nose and standing to her feet. "Now then, let's get moving. I'm just dying for some fresh air," she said. The redhead then spread her arms out to either side of her and closed her eyes. For a moment, there was silence, but it was soon broken with a humming sound that was soon followed by a clicking noise. The door of their cell then swung open. "How did you?" Naruto began, trailing off by the end as Gaara helped him to his feet and led him out into the hallway. She then gave him a smile and tapped the lock. There are usually small collections of dust and metallic particles in the inner workings of locks, and if you can move those masses around in the right ways, you can open most doors. "I learned that trick fairly young," she said proudly. The blonde frowned. "You could have gotten out literally whenever you wanted. Why did you bother staying?" he asked quizzically. Gaara then turned a light shade of pink and began to fidget with her hands. "I saw an opportunity to make things right with you, and I took it. Maybe things aren't fully mended yet, but I got to sleep against you, so I don't regret waiting. I also figured that you would eventually grow tired of imprisonment," she explained. Her fellow Jinchuriki nodded and glanced down the surprisingly empty hallway. "Yeah, that makes sense. It's probably a good thing we cuddled up, honestly. We'd have frozen to death on our own," he half-joked. The pair then made their way down the corridor cautiously, keeping a close eye out for traps of all shapes and sizes. After a slow trek, they reached a door that seemed to lead to another block of the prison. After looking underneath the door, Naruto spotted sandals. "There are guards on the other side. At least 4 of them," he reported to his companion. Gaara furrowed her brow and knelt down next to him at the base of the door. "Why do you think it is that we, likely the most dangerous of the inmates, have no guards posted while these fools do?" she asked curiously. Naruto shrugged his shoulders and stood back up. "We didn't do much other than sleep, talk, and, kiss a little. Good behavior, maybe," he guessed. The girl suppressed a giggle and nodded. "Perhaps, yes. Oh well. I'm certainly not complaining about the ease of exit," she replied. The blonde then gave her a more serious look as she rose to an upright position. "No killing. We aren't even going to badly hurt anybody if we don't have to." "Got it," he said somewhat sternly. Gaara nodded. "Understood. I'll do my best to keep things clean. Also, my gourd was taken to a room near the end of this upcoming block, so our priority should be retrieving it," she said. "How do you know where it is?" he asked. The redhead put her hand on the handle of the door and prepared to turn it. "It's laced with my chakra. I can sense its location," she explained. With that in mind, she pushed the door open. Once the opening was large enough, both Jinchuriki rushed through it. Naruto's estimation had been correct. There were 4 guards stationed in the area, and they immediately took action to stop the escapees. Unfortunately for them, their efforts were in vain. The first of the guards was doubled over by a blow to his stomach by Naruto, and the following 2 were rendered unconscious by forceful strikes to their jaws by the blonde. That left only one shinobi in their path, who attempted to run in the opposite direction to escape them. Before he could reach the end of the hall, he was chased down and knocked out by a strike to the back of his head with the blunt end of a kunai from Gaara. "Good, now my gourd should be in that room," the redhead said with a finger pointed at a door on the left wall of the block. It was diagonal to what appeared to be the exit of the section. After a brief jog, the pair reached the door and threw it open. Sure enough, Gaara's gourd laid in the far right corner. "Pity. I've grown used to feeling lightweight," Gaara muttered as she strapped it over her shoulder and stretched her back. Naruto chuckled. "That thing's about 2/3 the size of you, so I'll bet it's rough to carry," he said humorously as his companion joined him at the exit of the hall. "I can't help that I'm small," she huffed. A moment later, they crashed through the next hall. It was much the same as the first, though with 3 extra guards to contend. Despite the ease with which they were passing through the facility, Naruto still found himself growing ever more nervous. Up to now, Gaara had kept her promise to be non-fatal, but each and every time she neutralized a guard, there was a pause before she would leave them be. She was visibly struggling. "You okay?" he asked after the final guard had been disarmed and knocked out. Gaara didn't immediately respond, prompting Naruto to put a hand on her shoulder. The contact drew a flinch from the girl. She then turned to look at him. One of her eyes was golden and sporting a diamond-shaped pupil. The pair stared at each other for several moments before the blonde took hold of her hand and led her off towards the next door. "How about I handle the next hall? It's the last one, I think," he suggested. Gaara nodded stiffly and tightened her grip on his hand. "Why yes. I think that would be wise," she said, her voice strained. Upon entering the 4th, and assumedly final, hall, they were met with a surprising sight. Area was entirely empty. In fact, it wasn't even a prison block at all. It was simply an open room with a large door at the end. "Well, that's that, I guess," Naruto said, leading Gaara towards the door as he spoke. When they reached the large door, he kicked it open. As expected, open air lay beyond it. "We need to get to the border. Keep hold of me." "I'll lead," the blonde said. Gaara nodded and joined him in a sprint northward. Unfortunately, it would not be so easy. Something was amiss. The air was hanging stiffly, it was strangely cold, and the silence of the night felt unnatural. All of these factors combined to set Kakashi very much on edge. The Jonin had never been one to sleep early, but it had always been a thing he had considered. Tonight, no such thought had crossed his mind. Even before the tension had truly set in. Setting aside the book he had been reading, Kakashi threw his legs over his bed and sat up. His nerves were buzzing. "I can't quite put my finger on it. What is it?" he pondered as the air conditioning hummed in the corner of his dwelling. He had long been capable of discerning the factors behind his instincts and gut feelings, but this particular occasion was stumping him greatly. He had half a mind to simply wander the streets until his feelings brought him to the source, but his more logical side told him to wait and see. Something told him that rushing in now would be a poor idea. Unable to control his curiosity fully, the Jonin closed his eyes and focused his senses to scan the village as a whole. After several tedious moments of pinpointing and searching, he discovered the likely cause of his unease. The tension was emanating from the lockdown block of the prison. Specifically, 2 signatures. They were powerful, they were moving. Within moments, Kakashi identified who they belonged to. Once he did, he sighed heavily and walked to his window. So, they're going for it. As much as I feel like I should be surprised, I'm not. This was inevitable, he thought to himself. He was conflicted. Naruto breaking out of his cell had felt like an unavoidable issue, but it was also one that wasn't entirely unjustifiable. His imprisonment was far from just to begin with, and he had every right to oppose it. With Hiruzen gone, his voice would never be heard by those in power. Doubly so with Danzo at the helm for the time being. It was never a question of if, but of when. Chances are, they have nobody on hand who's strong enough to stop them from just leaving. They aren't out of the building yet, but they will be within 2 minutes. Guy is halfway across the desert with a recon team, and Asuma still hasn't recovered from the invasion. That leaves Kurenai, Sasuke, and Kakashi reviewed. At this thought, he frowned. That's an issue. Kurenai can't handle Gaara. Not a chance in hell. And we've already seen Sasuke try and fail. Naruto is a question mark when it comes to willingness to fight, but if he resists, he's even stronger than Gaara, he thought somewhat nervously. Jonin were bound to be deployed, but few were capable enough. Sasuke was almost certainly going to catch wind of what was going on fairly soon, and once he did, he would come running. I need to get there first. This'll get ugly if I don't, the silver-haired ninja concluded with a nod to himself. After putting on his forehead protector, covering his left eye, and throwing on his flak jacket loosely, Kakashi opened up his window and leapt down to the street below. He immediately broke out into a sprint for the prison. It took him no more than 40 feet of running to realize his error in judgment. On a dime, he shifted his trajectory towards the northern border of Konoha. The likelihood of the pair remaining at the prison for much longer was low, and if anything, they'd be making a haste to reach the border. The only real question is what they plan to do. They can't stay in the village now. If they try, they'll be cornered and tossed into separate cells inside of 2 days. Probably tortured in Gaara's case. But there's no way they don't know that. Kakashi thought to himself between breaths. He was panicked. The chances of his encounter with Naruto and Gaara being anything but incredibly ugly were exceptionally low, and the more the Jonin thought about it, the more and more prominent a certain question became. What exactly did he plan to do? What was the proper course of action? It was a pertinent thing to ask oneself in such a situation. If he were to stop them and turn them in, which he could easily do, they would be detained once again, and likely under harsher conditions. There was a not insignificant chance that Gaara would end up dying in the process, and Naruto would likely be imprisoned for far longer than previously scheduled. I could care less what happens to Gaara, but if she goes down tonight, he goes down with her, Kakashi contemplated. As he was grappling with the choice he was being forced to make, a figure crashed across the rooftops in the same direction as the copy ninja. After a moment's observation, Kakashi stopped running and watched the person leap across infrastructure. It was Sasuke. If he's going where I think he is, then he's about to do something incredibly reckless, Kakashi thought as his student shrunk into the horizon. Yet another decision had now presented itself to the Jonin, and it needed to be made quickly. I'll slow down my pace and keep an eye of the 3 of them until I arrive. If things get dicey, I'll speed up, he decided. He then broke out into a hasty jog with the intention of reaching the border within roughly 10 minutes. It was a gamble to be sure, but one that gave the silver-haired ninja room to breath. With his heart racing and sweat running down his brow, Kakashi focused his senses. Slow them down, Sasuke. Just for a little while. Sasuke grit his teeth and picked up the pace at which he was running. Time was of the essence, and try as he might, he couldn't reach a speed that would calm his nerves. The very thing he had feared had happened. Gaara had escaped her confinement, and she had brought Naruto with her. It was a nightmarish scenario. One that the Uchiha would not allow to complete itself. He was approaching the border rapidly, and his dojutsu had locked onto the pair. He was set to intercept them just as they would reach the upper border of Konoha. It would certainly be close, but Sasuke was moving more quickly than they were. He would get there first. I don't know why she's slowing herself down by dragging him along with her, but it can't mean anything good. From the feel of things, she's ready to fight. Her chakra is all over the place. Just like it was when we fought, he thought to himself as his legs carried him across the rooftops as fast as they physically could. Several minutes later, the trees of the forest came into sight. Along with them, at the edges of his peripheral vision, Sasuke caught sight of what he was moving to intercept. Gaara and Naruto were running from the east towards the edge of the village. With his adrenaline pumping, Sasuke burst forward one last time into a powerful leap. He landed directly at the edge of the forest, squarely between the foliage and the pair of Jinchuriki. They both stopped with a flinch as the Uchiha rose up from his knees and straightened himself. "Imagine meeting you here," he greeted them sarcastically with his arms folded across his chest. He then noticed several oddities. Most chiefly was the fact that Gaara was grasping his teammate's hand tightly with her fingers laced through his. Beyond this, it appeared that Naruto had been the one leading Gaara rather than the other way around if his positioning was any indication. "Sasuke. I didn't think you'd be here," Naruto said hesitantly. The Uchiha raised an eyebrow and let his arms drop to his sides. "Neither did I. Not until around 8 minutes ago, at least. Now, would you mind explaining to me what the hell is going on?" he asked. The blonde took little time to respond. "What does it look like?" "We're leaving for a little while," he said sharply. Sasuke cast a glare towards Gaara and took a step forward. "And whose idea was that?" he asked. Naruto pointed to himself as his red-headed companion kept her eyes fixed on the ground. "Mine, actually. I don't have a ton of reason to stay here as of right now, so I'm taking my leave," he replied. Sasuke scowled. "What the hell is that supposed to mean? No reason to stay here? We have a war on our hands." "You have every reason to stay," he questioned incredulously. The blonde shook his head and glanced back at the village to his back. "Like hell I do. You know damn well what Danzo's going to use me for if I stay here," he snapped back. A look of confusion then passed over the Uchiha's face, prompting Naruto to sigh. You really don't know, huh? Well, all you need to know is that I don't feel like being objectified or used. You know that, he said. Sasuke's mouth pulled into a thin line. Look, if you run, they'll send hunters after you. You'll be in the goddamned bingo book. I won't let that happen to you, he said firmly. Then, for the first time since the two parties had encountered one another, Gaara spoke. You plan to oppose our exit? She asked, her eyes still hidden behind her bangs. Sasuke swallowed and drew a kunai. If I have to, I will, he said. The moment the sentence had left his mouth, the redhead released Naruto's hand and stepped in front of him. It was then that Sasuke caught sight of her eyes. They were identical to those of her transformed state. The golden hue brought back the memories of the beating he had suffered at the Jinchuriki's hands. I hadn't originally planned on fighting you a third time, not after you nearly removed my head, but so be it. Let us begin, Sasuke. Gaara growled as a plume of sand erupted from her gourd to act as an extension of her will. The Uchiha assumed a taijutsu stance and drew a second kunai. Let me handle him, Gaara. Please, put the sand away, Naruto said nervously. Gaara shook her head and took a step toward Sasuke. Oh hush, Naruto. This won't take very long, she hissed darkly. Her voice had gained a disturbing edge. Just as the blonde was about to take steps to put himself between them, a blur flashed across his field of view. What in the dash? Sasuke began as the blur landed in front of him. The entity's landing kicked up a sizable amount of dust, but it cleared quickly. Once it did, the identity of the blur was revealed. Kakashi-sensei. I should have seen it coming, I guess, Naruto said nervously. The Jonin glanced back at Sasuke, shook his head, much to the surprise of both sides. If Sasuke hadn't arrived to cut you off when he did, I wouldn't have been a factor. Your planning, if you actually did any, was perfectly sound, he said. He then cast a glance at Gaara. Stand down, half-pint. I'm well within my rights to put you in a coma as long as I don't kill you, he ordered menacingly. The redhead begrudgingly did as she was told and stepped back to Naruto's side. Good. Now, the two of you might want to get going, Kakashi said. Sasuke, Naruto, and Gaara all stared at him wide-eyed. Though their shock was equal, it was the Uchiha who was the first to speak. What? You're letting them leave? He practically yelled. The Jonin gave a nod and maintained his focus on the pair in front of him. As I'm sure Naruto's alluded to, their reasoning for leaving is more than justified in this case. Danzo plans to weaponize the fox within Naruto for the war effort, and he's likely to use Gaara as leverage. I don't like it any more than you do, but it's either this, or what essentially amounts to slavery for the both of them, he explained. Sasuke opened his mouth to refute his teacher's points, but found that he couldn't. I'm serious, you two. Get moving. We don't have long, the Jonin ordered Gaara and Naruto. The pair snapped out of the trance of shock they had entered and did as they were told. They made their way past the two ninja blocking their way and stepped into the forest. Where are you heading? Kakashi asked quickly, clearly aware of the waning time at their disposal. The coast of the Land of Fire? Naruto replied. The silver-haired ninja tossed him a small object. Don't move in straight lines. Mix up your routes to throw off your trail. They'll have hunters on your ass inside of 3 days, he said. And consider that a parting gift, he concluded. Needing no further prompting, Gaara and Naruto disappeared into the forest silently. Once they were fairly long gone, Sasuke spoke once again. Was that really a good idea? He asked tightly. Kakashi sighed and stared up at the full moon above their heads. Maybe not in the short term, but in the long term, it'll save both of them a lot of grief. Danzo is a warmonger, and I'd rather not let him get his paws on either one of them. Especially Naruto, he said honestly. Do you really trust her that much? Gaara, I mean. I'm not sure she isn't even more dangerous to him than Danzo is, Sasuke asked. Kakashi shook his head. I trust her sanity less than I trust her intentions. I'm fairly sure she's like a lost puppy with him. What worries me more is her obvious lack of control over that monster she keeps under wraps, he said. Sasuke put away his kunai and sighed. I still don't like the idea of Naruto traveling alone with her, he said quietly. The Jonin put a hand on his student's shoulder and nodded. I understand, Sasuke. Believe me, I do. But we just have to let it go for now, he said. The Genin glanced up at his teacher. What are we going to do in the meantime? He asked. Kakashi's visible eye narrowed at the question. We're going to make sure Danzo doesn't take power. I think now would be a good time to settle. Naruto nodded and flopped to his back on the ground at his feet. He and Gaara had been running for nearly 4 hours, and they were both spent physically. The stress of the situation had triggered their adrenaline, which had fueled them to a point, but the human body still had limitations. The route they had taken actually led them back around the forests of Konoha southward, as their final destination would be the coast. The journey would be long, nearly 2 weeks on foot, but it would inevitably be worth the trouble. I'm surprised you managed to keep up. No offense, Naruto commented as Gaara sat down next to him. The redhead shrugged her shoulders and wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead. I have a running theory that we Jinchuriki are simply a cut above normal people when it comes to endurance. I'm quite tired, but like you, I could keep running if I needed to, she replied. Naruto sighed as he looked out over to sunrise. It'll help us outrun the hunters, that's for sure. If what Sensei said was true, we don't have a ton of time before they show up, he said. Gaara pursed her lips and pensively picked at the grass on the ground. Taking notice of her seeming turmoil, the now former Leaf Genin tapped her on the shoulder. Hey, what's up? He asked gently. Gaara turned her head back towards him and maintained her silence for several odd moments. Should the hunters catch up with us at some point, I can't promise with any certainty that I won't end up killing them, she said, unease clearly audible in her voice. Can you tell me why? The blonde inquired. The girl then looked him in the eyes and gave a sudden scowl. Because they're out to either kill you, or bring you back to that snake Danzo. I've already killed a man for your sake, and I'd do it again, wrong as it may be, she said. The moment she had finished speaking, her eyes widened. Well aware that she had said too much, the girl covered her mouth and clenched her jaw. You, what? The blonde asked quietly. Sensing that her wisest course of action was honesty and openness, Gaara removed her hand from her mouth and let it drop. It was on our birthday. After I left you on the roof to get you food. I noticed a man entering the building, and I felt apprehensive for some reason. I decided to follow him, she began. Naruto, who was still obviously uneasy, nodded and motioned for her to continue her account of the murder. I trailed him up to your apartment, and then I made my presence known. He revealed that he was there to break into your home and abuse you. You had told me earlier that night that you avoided your dwelling on October 10th to prevent such things, and it made me so angry. To see a man like him plotting to hurt you blinded me with rage. I strangled him for a minute or two before impaling him and concealing his body. Gaara concluded ashamedly. Naruto took a painfully long time to respond. You didn't have to kill him, he finally said. The kunoichi nodded her head and looked away from her companion. You saw for yourself in the prison. I have a hard time controlling myself once battle starts. It's no excuse, I'm well aware of that, but still. Besides, any and all who set out to harm you will be punished by me. If anybody deserves to be treated kindly, it's you, she said. Naruto's expression was heavily conflicted. You're so weird to me. Sometimes, you're adorable and sweet, but other times, you're a murderer. How can a person be both of those things? He asked. Gaara gave him a sad smile and shrugged her gourd from her shoulders. I was just a murderer before, so I'd consider this an improvement. You've changed me a little, but you still haven't cured me of my worst instincts. I doubt you ever will, she said. The blonde studied his complex companion as she awaited his response. You've known me for all of 2 months. Give it a few years before you say that I can't change you. You're a good person. I know you are. You just need to believe that, he said strongly. Gaara's eyes became slightly glassy at his words. Years, she whispered, seemingly struggling to grasp the information. Somewhat confused by her reaction, Naruto frowned. Yeah. We're gonna be gone for a while. Danzo is strong as hell. We're gonna be spending a lot of time together, he said. Gaara opened her mouth several times to respond, but failed numerous times before finally rediscovering her voice. You'd actually stay with me for that long? Really? She practically squeaked. The blonde scratched the back of his head and gave her a puzzled look. Yeah, I would. I'm not just going to leave you out in the middle of nowhere. That'd be cruel. You're kinda my partner from here on out, he said. Without warning, Gaara tackled him to the ground and hugged him tightly. Thank you. She stuttered and she constricted him. Her companion shifted underneath her and propped himself up on an elbow with Gaara still clinging to his abdomen. You're welcome, I guess. Now could you not squeeze so hard? You're breaking me in half, he said in a slightly pained tone. The redhead did as she was told and lightened her squeeze. She didn't fully release him, though. Instead, she crawled up on him and planted a kiss on his cheek. You make me so very happy, she said softly before rolling off from on top of him and smiling to herself. Naruto touched his cheek where her lips had made contact and sighed. Do you have to climb me every time you want to kiss me? He complained lightly. Gaara shrugged her shoulders and assumed a cross-legged sitting position. Well, if you engaged me rather than the other way around, I wouldn't have to close you down. You're much bigger than me, Naruto. I'd have to get on my toes if I wanted to kiss you standing up, she said. The blonde raised an eyebrow. I'm not even that big a guy. You're just tiny. This is more your fault than mine, he said jokingly. The redhead flushed and kicked his foot. We've already talked about this. I can't help that I'm a little smaller than most girls. I'm 5 feet tall, if that. Be considerate, she grumbled. Naruto grinned and ruffled her hair playfully. I like you like this. Stay loose, Gaara. You're more fun when you are, he encouraged her. Gaara nodded jovially and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. She then reached back and tapped her gourd, prompting it to expand and close around them into a shelter. Caught off guard by the sudden isolation, Naruto flinched and fell back against the sand. I think we should sleep. Traveling at night is likely smart, so resting while the sun is out is our best choice. Sorry if I startled you, Gaara said as the blonde recovered his wits. Probably a good idea, yeah. Should one of yous take watch? Naruto asked. His fellow Jinchuriki shook her head and snapped her fingers, causing the opening that had remained at the top of the sand dome to close. A side effect of this action was that the interior of the structure was now almost completely dark. If the dome is touched, I'll know. We're perfectly safe in here. No worries, Gaara assured him. Sounds handy. But did you have to make it pitch black? Naruto asked as he leaned back against the sandy barrier. He then felt a weight crawl onto one of his legs and lean against the left side of his chest. It can't be helped. Either way, I'm the only thing in here other than yourself. You can relax, Gaara said as she made herself comfortable against the former leaf genin. Naruto, opting to simply embrace his current position, wrapped an arm around Gaara and allowed her to remain glued to him. You're really physical. You like this kind of thing a lot, don't you? He asked in reference to the girl's recently acquired tendency to attach herself to him. Gaara peered up at him and smiled. The first time I latched onto you on the roof, I only did it because I was cold. After about 30 seconds, I realized that I absolutely loved being pressed against you. You're very warm and strong, she said. Naruto snickered. That's the girliest thing I've ever heard you say, he said. The redhead furrowed her brow at this and gave him a curious look. What do you mean by that? Is it strange that I like being held by you? She asked skeptically. Naruto shook his head. Not really, I guess. A lot of girls are into that, I think. In Konoha, most of the girls are pining after Sasuke. They'd kill to be cuddling with him, he said. Gaara scrunched up her nose at the information being presented to her. Why on earth would that mongrel be sought after? She muttered. Naruto chuckled and allowed the girl to step over his free leg to fully settle on top of him. I know that you don't like him, and I get it, but he's actually a decent guy. Sorta prickly, but he's a good person, he assured Gaara. He's also a meddling wretch. Maybe he is a better person than I'd care to admit, but I still dislike him, she said. The pair then lapsed into silence for several minutes. Do you not like me touching you so much? I can sleep elsewhere if you'd like, Gaara asked carefully. Naruto thought for a moment. I don't mind much, honestly. You're super light, so it doesn't make me uncomfortable. You also don't really put your hands anywhere where they shouldn't be. You can stay where you are, he replied. The redhead breathed a sigh of relief and closed her eyes. I'm not exactly sure where my hands shouldn't be, but oh well. I'm glad. Get used to this. I very much like using you as a mattress, she said. I can tell. Get some sleep, Naruto said in response. Gaara nodded and prepared herself for whatever nightmares she may encounter. Before she could fully drift away, she spoke once more. I know it hasn't been very long since we first discussed this, but, do you love me? She asked quietly. Naruto exhaled through his nose. You're still hard for me. It feels really wrong to love a person that kills, but at the same time, you're doing a damn good job of being lovable. I just don't know. I want to, but I'm not sure I can right now, he said honestly. Gaara bit her lip. It's my own fault, I suppose. In my defense, I never expected to love a person. Even if you never truly love me back, I'm satisfied as long as you let me stay with you, she said in a small voice. I'm not saying I never will, Gaara. Just not yet. I need time to sort things out. Until then, I'm more than willing to let you do this kind of thing, Naruto said. Deciding to press her luck, Gaara sat up on top of him and cupped his face. Does this kind of thing involve kissing? She asked hopefully. Naruto rolled his eyes in the dark and sighed. You've kinda been kissing me a lot lately, he pointed out. The redhead knocked her forehead against his playfully. I'm like a child with a new toy. I want to use it lots. You're very gratifying to kiss. Very easy on my lips, she said. The former leaf genin finally relented. Yeah, okay. You can kiss me or whatever, he grumbled. Taking full advantage of the opportunity, Gaara delicately pressed her lips to his and traced the outline of his face with her hand as she indulged. After a time, she gave him room to breathe. I tried to be more gentle this time, she said. Naruto reddened a tad and glanced away from her face. Did you really not know what kissing was when you asked me? Because you're really good at it, he said awkwardly. Gaara nodded and giggled. I had no clue, but I also knew that if I was ever going to learn, it was going to be from you. And, it sounds to me like you enjoyed that last one, she teased. Yeah, fine. Maybe I did, the blonde grumbled. Satisfied with his confession, Gaara slid back down his body and tucked her head under his chin. I'm glad. Now, I think we should sleep. Good night, Naruto, she said. Naruto cracked a smile and ran a hand through her unkempt red hair. Good night, Gaara. Kakashi heaved a deep breath as he completed his second of 8 laps around Konoha. It was early morning, only 4:30, and he had found himself unable to return to sleeping after waking up at 3. Deciding to make good use of his time rather than simply lying in bed uselessly, he had taken off running without bothering to put on a fresh shirt. The Jonin's cardiovascular endurance had always been superb, but recent times had forced him to call that fact into question. During Team 7's first week of drilling, Naruto had beaten his personal best time by nearly a full minute. To be beaten was one thing, but to be beaten by an hardly pubescent genin was entirely another. Despite desiring to right that wrong months previously, Kakashi had found himself too swamped with separate responsibilities to ever truly train himself individually. The vast majority of his exercise was done with Team 7, for Team 7. Leading a cell was an exhausting lifestyle, and free time was a rarity. And I'm spending my morning off running in circles. What a life I lead, the Jonin mused to himself boredly as he avoided a fallen branch. Though extremely dull, downtime of any sort was a welcome break from the absolute chaos that was bound to ensue. With Naruto and Gaara's departure the previous night not having become public knowledge just yet, the village was essentially in the calm before the storm. The moment that information became widespread, a state of hysteria was likely to set in. With the general populace well aware of the oncoming war, the fact that they possessed a pair of Jinchuriki had been a great comfort. And now they're traveling to the other end of the country to do God knows what. It's funny. For the first time in a long time, Naruto was a beacon of hope to these people, but he left before he could take advantage of it. Kakashi thought to himself. A frown then spread across his masked face. But then again, it was selfish hope. They still didn't give a damn about Naruto. They were just concerned for themselves. Self-centeredness is a common trait around these parts, the silver-haired ninja thought. He then increased his already rapid pace. He was fairly tired already, but the key to stamina activities was to reach a plateau at which one's exhaustion was neither increasing nor decreasing. The balance was essential to maintain a proper pace. They'll probably send out hunters today. I feel sorry for the poor schmucks that are dumb enough to take that job. Kakashi contemplated as the image of Gaara's maddened eyes flashed across his conscience. While much of Sasuke's trepidation about Gaara of the Sand was founded on personal disdain, he was indeed correct about one thing. She was exceptionally dangerous. She was a willing murderer, powerful, seemingly unstable, and incredibly difficult to kill. A death sentence for anybody that didn't possess enough raw power to neutralize her. Sasuke was more than skilled enough to contain her for a stretch of time, but with no real way to injure her consistently, he was doomed to lose. Kakashi himself was more than capable of slaughtering the girl, but doing so was unwise. For better or worse, Naruto was attached to Gaara in some way, shape, or form. I've got a strong feeling those two got nice and friendly in prison. Throw two hormonal kids in a cell together, especially a pair of love-starved outcasts, and you're bound to get some interesting results, the Jonin pondered. It was a fair explanation for several things he had observed upon arriving at the northern border. Upon returning to Naruto at Kakashi's behest, Gaara had instantly latched onto his hand and maintained a grip on it. Beyond this, the manner in which they spoke to one another was one that implied familiarity. Why'd you have to get involved with a nutcase, Naruto? Kakashi muttered under his breath as he waved to a shop owner. Well, there's a reason I gave him a copy of Makeout Tactics before he left. If he's going to be alone with her for a while, he may as well make the most of it, Kakashi thought to himself with a grin as he recalled tossing the small orange book to his student just before Naruto had departed. He then reached the conclusion of his third lap. Only 5 remained. At this realization, the Jonin groaned internally. Why do you torture yourself like this, guy? Sasuke impatiently motioned for Kiba to rise to his feet. It was the third time in 5 minutes he had sent him to the floor off of a counter. Sparring was a rough activity by nature, but the Uchiha was redefining that standard. He was fighting like he had something to prove. This temperament had not gone unnoticed by Kiba, but the Inuzuka heir had also correctly deduced that bringing it up would be unwise. With Kiba fully recovered and back on his feet, Sasuke resumed his attack on his comrade. The boys quickly entered an exchange they had had several times. They both threw straight, right-handed punches, slipped their heads to their respective lefts, and rebounded off the shift with their opposite hands. In turn, they exchanged hooking left hands, and both landed squarely on their opponent's jaw. Sasuke's mechanics were slightly tighter, allowing him to torque more power into the punch. As a result, Kiba's legs turned to rubber and failed him as he stumbled back and caught himself with his hands. I think we're done for today, Sasuke said, much to Kiba's relief. After regaining his equilibrium, the Inuzuka heir made his way over to Sasuke and sat down next to him. He looked to be deep in thought. Something on your mind? Kiba asked. Sasuke initially didn't react, instead opting to maintain his silence. Eventually, he did acknowledge the boy he had just sparred with. It's been a week since it all happened. I figured I'd have heard something by now, he said vaguely. His response lacked detail, but Kiba knew what he was referencing. They're rogue now. The only news we're gonna get on them is whether or not the hunters put them in body bags, he said. The Uchiha cracked his stiff neck and frowned. We've already had a squad come back empty-handed. There's no way they've gone far enough to be out of reach, and it feels unlikely that either one of them has the savvy to hide from an experienced hunter. It just doesn't add up to me, he pondered aloud. His mentioning of the failed squadron, Kiba was struck by something. You're right about that. They definitely aren't sharp enough about stealth to stay hidden. Especially not Naruto, he said. Sasuke raised an eyebrow at his comrade's tone. Sounds to me like you have an idea as to what may be going on, he said. Kiba nodded and settled into a cross-legged sitting position. When my clan goes on hunts, a tactic we use once in a while is sending off one pack to drive the prey in one direction, and then intercepting them as they adjust their route with another pack. The point of the first advance is entirely to get them to react, he explained. It took Sasuke little time to understand what he was insinuating. So, what you're saying is that the first squad of hunters was a diversion to make Naruto and Gaara move, and that the next set they send out is the real cleanup crew, he asked. Kiba nodded in confirmation. Exactly. They aren't out of the woods. Not at all. Gotta wonder if either one of them's picked up on that. If not, they might be screwed, he said grimly. Sasuke considered the information for several moments before shaking his head. Naruto's probably clueless, but I doubt Gaara is. That girl is nothing if not observant. She's also a sensor type. She's probably expecting them, and even if she isn't, she'll feel them coming a mile away, he said. Kiba chuckled slightly. If they can't get the jump on those two, I think the hunters are in for it. Gaara's a monster, and apparently Naruto is even stronger than she is. I don't see how a few hunters are going to beat them, he said with a shake of his head. Sasuke then recalled back to a piece of information that Kakashi had passed on to him several days previously. Apparently, they didn't kill any of the guards during their escape from the prison. Not one of them. They were all either unconscious or incapacitated. None of them were even badly injured, he muttered. Kiba furrowed his brow. What's that got to do with anything? He asked skeptically. Sasuke snapped back to attention and looked to the Inuzuka heir. It makes me wonder about something. There's no way Gaara would have held back from killing with no prompting. She's a stick of dynamite with a lit fuse. She isn't controlled enough for that. Naruto had to have talked her into it, and if that's the case, he's probably going to hold her to that from here on out, he said. Are you suggesting that they might not kill the hunters? He inquired. Sasuke gave a nod in response. It's not guaranteed, but maybe. I don't know how much Naruto can really control Gaara, but I guess it remains to be seen. He definitely is stronger, so if he's dedicated to pacifism, he could always just take her down again, he said. Kiba then posed a question Sasuke himself had been grappling with. What's up with those two anyways? They were enemies a week and a half ago. Why are they suddenly soul mates or whatever? He asked. It was a fair thing to ask. There was little information to be gleaned from the Uchiha's encounter with the pair other than the fact that the Jinchuriki did seem to be on familiar terms. To be honest, I don't know for sure. I'm convinced they had history before the final round, though. Gaara changed completely when Naruto showed up. It was really strange. I actually visited Naruto before they broke out, and she was leaning on him, totally out cold. Sasuke said. That's fucked up. Like, really. If that means what it sounds like it does, Naruto is getting touchy with a psychopath. Why would he do that? Kiba asked, seemingly disgusted by the idea of Gaara and Naruto being intimate with one another. The Uchiha shuddered. Worst part is, I'm pretty sure that's what's going on. It would explain a lot of things. Honestly, though, I can't fault Naruto a ton, he said. The Inuzuka heir scowled. Why the hell not? She's the enemy, and he should know better, he asked gruffly. Sasuke's expression then saddened slightly. Because, for all that she's done wrong, she's something to him that nobody else is. She's relatable. They've been through a lot of the same pain, and let me tell you, nothing is more comforting than shared experience. I hate her, and I'd kill to get another crack at her, but Gaara was always going to get to him. It was never a question of if, only when. He said. Kiba reluctantly relented. Yeah, maybe. Either way, I hope I never have to deal with her again. She was scary, he said. He then paused. Wanna get lunch or something? He asked. The Uchiha thought for a moment before climbing to his feet and nodding. Sounds good to me. Gaara traced shapes in the dirt at her feet. She was bored. Excessively so. There was very little to do other than sleep at the moment, and she had given up on trying several hours ago. In the 7 days that had passed since their departure from Konohagakure, they had managed to fix their sleeping schedule at Naruto's behest. The request had sparked a short debate on the topic, but they had eventually come to the agreement that they would indeed travel during the day on the condition that they decrease their rate of movement slightly. According to Naruto, we'll now reach the coast in roughly 17 days. A bit longer than before. Then again, that's partially my fault, the redhead thought to herself as she recalled a separate discussion she and her companion had had. Having remembered Kakashi's warning to the pair as they had left pertaining to the timeframe in which hunters would come for them, Gaara had been incredibly on edge when the third day of their travel arrived. She had been insistent on running with her gourd open so as to be ready for incoming attacks, and her knuckles had been white the entire day. Much to her and Naruto's surprise, no hunters came. The day was as uneventful and dull as all the rest. After taking a few moments to consider why it may have been, Gaara had come to a realization. Their route was being monitored and stalked at. Upon coming to this conclusion, the girl made a suggestion. I think we should take another path to the coast, Gaara said. The proposition earned her a skeptical glance from the blonde. Why? We're making good time doing what we're doing, he asked skeptically. The redhead glanced around them cautiously and then looked back to Naruto. I feel as though we're being watched. I'd rather not take the risk of being blindsided, she explained. Naruto immediately understood what she was referencing. Hunters, right, he inferred. Gaara nodded and looked on ahead towards an oncoming collection of buildings. They were near a town. Let's settle on the outskirts of that settlement, and then move in the morning. We'll discuss specifics then, she said. Naruto nodded and set out running towards the town, prompting Gaara to follow after him. Whether or not it was the right call to make remained to be seen, but Gaara felt much more secure in their safety now that they were following an alternate path. Though, her own safety mattered little to the redhead. Her decision to move them along a different route was more driven by her desire to keep Naruto out of harm's way without resorting to violence. He was more than capable of defending himself, but his pacifism would likely come back to bite him should he allow even one hunter to live. If left alive, they would inevitably return to Konoha with valuable information about their whereabouts and physical condition. It would be an endless chase. Gaara herself was more than willing to simply cut off the snake's head, so to speak, but she risked nigh permanent disapproval from Naruto by doing so. It was a difficult situation, and one that Gaara despised. There was a serious argument to be made that murder would actually prevent future killing from becoming a necessity. Unfortunately, such a morbid line of thinking would likely fall on deaf ears with Naruto. His stance on murder was a noble one, and it was perfectly justifiable. In certain situations, though, it could also be problematic. It amazes me that somebody so immensely strong could be so gentle by nature. Well, to a point. You certainly do have the capacity to be a force when you need to be. Gaara mused as she gazed at Naruto's sleeping face that lay in her lap. I wonder. If our situations had been reversed during our clash, would I have shown you the same mercy you showed me? She wondered to herself. A quick review of the day of the invasion revealed the obvious answer. I'd have made it as painless as I could have. Still, though, I'm happy with the way things are now. Even if the travel is a bit tedious, she thought to herself. Despite her satisfaction with and appreciation of her current situation, a small twinge of guilt still existed in the back of her mind. For as much as she had benefited from the turn of events, others had not been so fortunate. Gaara's trend of leaving blood and broken bodies in her wake had not been broken just yet. Seemingly in response to her growing unease, an unwelcome voice chimed in. 1 dead, 3 injured, and another whisked away. Not a bad run of things. Well done, Gaara, a dark voice congratulated the redhead. It was a voice Gaara knew all too well, and one she had banished to the corners of her mind since arriving in Konoha. It had still been ever present, but much softer and more suggestive rather than demanding. Leave me alone, Shikaku, Gaara growled within her mind. A low chuckle rippled through her subconscious. I think I'll pass. You have nothing to threaten me with, so I fail to understand why I should listen to you, Shikaku replied. The redhead forced herself to relax and glanced down to make sure Naruto was still asleep. If you want me to go on a rampage, then you're out of luck. I'm in no mood, she said with a scowl. The demon shifted around in her mind and grinned. Aren't you? You didn't feel that way in the prison, and you'd have taken great pleasure in cutting down Sasuke Uchiha at the border. Violence is who you are. No amount of forced affection will ever change that, he said darkly. Gaara shook her head and clenched her jaw. I only ever killed to keep you quiet. Never because I wanted to. If anybody is defined by violence, it's you, she countered. Shikaku laughed out loud, his cackle mad and unrestrained. Spare me, runt. Your killing of the man in the apartment complex was entirely of your own accord. I didn't even have to make the suggestion. You were so consumed by hate that you took a life. I was almost proud of you, he replied. Gaara then hid her eyes behind her bangs and suppressed an urge to punch something. I killed him because he deserved it. That murder was born of love, she snapped back. Shikaku snorted and worked his way to the forefront of her mind. Were your maimings of the leaf genin born of love? No, better yet, do you think such reasoning puts you on some sort of moral high ground? Are you really that deluded? He questioned his Jinchuriki. Gaara bared her teeth and tried to push the demon back into the depths of her subconscious. It was no use. Shut up, she hissed aloud. Shikaku then heaved a sigh and pondered something for several moments. I'm an old being. You're far from my first Jinchuriki, though you're certainly the most naive. It's strange, he mused. Before Gaara could demand a further explanation, Shikaku continued speaking. Of all my hosts, you've been by far the toughest to break. I've influenced you plenty, but you still haven't given in to me. You don't even know how children are made, and yet your will is the strongest. Then again, if this conversation is to be taken at face value, you've found your own excuse to kill, so perhaps you just don't need as much prompting, he concluded. When the redhead didn't immediately respond, Shikaku retreated back into the lower regions of her conscience. I'll leave you be for now, but always remember. Love or no love, you're a killer all the same. Hunters are on your trail. You don't have very long, he said before disappearing. For a time, Gaara simply sat in silence, her body shaking slightly as she struggled to calm herself. Conversations with her inner demon never went particularly well, but this most recent encounter had been abysmal. Is it already morning? Gaara flinched and glanced downward. Naruto's eyes were slightly open, just barely visible in the darkness of the sandy shell. Feeling a small speck of warmth return to her, the redhead reached down and grazed her fingers over his eyelids to close them. No, not yet. I'm sorry for waking you, she whispered back. The blonde gave a tired nod and closed his eyes once more. His breathing soon evened, signifying his return to sleep. Gaara sighed and leaned down to touch his forehead with her lips. Come what may, I'll protect you. A man with reptilian skin and serrated teeth glanced to his left at his partner, who appeared to be deep in thought. It was his most common state of being, but it still created a few too many uncomfortable silences. It also tended to lead them off course. When he committed himself to a task, he pursued it relentlessly. He was tireless and focused. Give me one good reason that we should be in the land of fire, the sharp-toothed man asked impatiently. His partner paid him no heed. He simply kept up his pace and remained fixated on the terrain ahead of him. Disliking being ignored, the reptilian man growled slightly. Don't ignore me. Tell what we're doing, he said a bit more forcefully. His partner finally acknowledged him by stopping suddenly and casting him an eerie look. I have a message to deliver to a man. I need to reinforce the terms of a deal I made with him some time ago, he replied. He then sighed. Try to be patient, Kisame-san. We'll be arriving within days, he said. Kisame raised a non-existent eyebrow and gave his partner a skeptical look. I never took you for the type to blackmail. I'm stuck between being impressed and being disappointed. You're an odd one, Itachi, he said. The Uchiha adjusted the collar of his black and red robe. I'm not blackmailing him. I'm just holding him accountable. That's all, he corrected as he filed his nails with one of his many kunai. Kisame chuckled. Let me guess, it involves your bite-sized brother? He asked. Itachi gave a curt nod, clearly still focused on whatever he planned to do upon their arrival at their destination. It goes without saying, but I'd prefer if you kept this little endeavor quiet from our superiors, he said. Kisame shrugged his shoulders and jogged to catch up with Itachi, who had increased his walking pace. It's not as though I could get away with it if I tried. Our dynamic is well established at this point, he said. The Uchiha's lips pulled into the ghost of a smile. You have little reason to worry. You're on my good side, unlike a certain someone. Of all the places Gaara had expected to be ambushed, in the middle of a somewhat populous township had felt like the most unlikely. In broad daylight, no less. In many ways, it had been her own fault. Opting to take a pointless walk was likely not the wisest of decisions in their current situation, but the redhead had done so nonetheless. The walk had started out quite pleasantly. The people were generally quite friendly, with an old woman even referring to Gaara as the cutest thing she'd ever seen at one point, but it had become anything but tranquil fairly quickly. Any ninja of any value was capable of detecting pending danger, sensor type or not. It always started a subtle feeling of unease. A nagging sense that something was wrong. It then tended to progress into genuine nervousness, which would quickly evolve into a sharpened focus. It was a process. One that a person needed to master should they hope to survive in a world filled with danger. Gaara's focus did indeed sharpen, but not enough to avoid the worst possible start to the fight to come. That poor start began with a kunai whizzing past her face and slicing open her cheek. Unflappable as always, the redhead simply narrowed her eyes and glanced around her as the civilians of the township looked on in a panicked silence. They had clearly never seen real combat before. Not in person. Their reaction actually served Gaara well, as it made her task of sorting out who was and wasn't threatening significantly easier. Within moments, Gaara had picked out 8 individuals whose posture and demeanor did not fit those around them. With the identification process out of the way, Gaara began to ponder what she planned to do. Naruto is at the opposite edge of town, and he isn't a censor. I'm likely on my own. So be it then. I have the freedom to end this as I please, she thought to herself as the 8 people she had silently picked out all moved in unison. She had guessed correctly, which was good, but she was also being surrounded, which was decidedly not good. Deciding to clear the area, Gaara allowed her sand to explode from her gourd in all directions. The massive cloud of sand hovered and twisted around her like a specter, sending the crowd around her into a fearful retreat. All that remained after a moment were the people that had been surrounding her. Taking a glance at each of them individually, Gaara cleared her throat. Is there really any point in keeping up appearances now that we're this deep in? Your henges are meaningless, she asked, folding her arms across her chest as she spoke. Though she received no verbal response, the figures around her changed in appearance. They now resembled the Umbu of Konoha, though with slight differences. Their masks were much the same, but their attire was darker in color with less uniformity. I figured we'd have more time. We changed trajectory 4 days ago, and quite sharply. Perhaps they predicted this, the redhead thought to herself. The arrival of the hunters certainly complicated things. Depending on how difficult a task they turned out to be, they would slow down her and Naruto's rush for the coast, and the battle itself would likely start rumors throughout the region they were currently in. You'd be wise to tell us where Naruto Uzumaki is as of now. Reveal that information, and we may let you live, a hunter to her left said. The redhead shifted her eyes towards the man who had spoken. Aren't you supposed to retrieve us? That's what I thought hunters were for, she asked, a hint of sarcasm dripping into her voice. The hunters then drew kunai as a collective group. We have very specific orders regarding the 2 of you. Naruto is to be left alive and retrieved no matter what, but you're considered an expendable commodity. We can do without you, the same hunter explained. Gaara laughed to herself and allowed a smirk to spread across her face. Then what I'm about to do to you could be considered self-defense, she said before sending her sand outward in an omnidirectional wave. The hunters all jumped straight upwards to avoid being crushed. They then sent a rain of kunai and shuriken down towards the stationary Jinchuriki. A portion of her sand instantly returned to her vicinity and deflected them, completely shielding her from harm. Once the hunters touched down on the ground once more, they all charged in with longer blades drawn. Despite attacking her from nearly every direction, they still found no success. They simply could not penetrate her barrier. At this realization, Gaara sighed and gave them a bored look. Come now. A genin gave me more trouble than this less than 2 weeks ago. Your pride is on the line, she goaded them. The sound of a chuckle then alerted her senses. We know that. We also know how he did it, one of the hunters said. A burst of flames then crashed into Gaara from behind and sent her to her knees. The sediment surrounding her instantly repelled the hunters straining against it in response. Though the redhead was not down for long, the pain in her back remained. The flames had burned away the back of her tunic and seared her skin. Even with the assistance of her tailed beast, it would take several hours to heal. Blindsiding tactics. Only 7 of them charged at me. I should have paid better attention, she lamented as she grit her teeth in response to the pain. She then came to a silent decision. Hate it all you want, Naruto. I'm solving this problem right now, she vowed. A tendril of sand then shot out and seized one of the hunters by the throat. Before the others could realize what was about to happen, a snapping sound echoed throughout the empty street. The hunter she had selected then dropped to the ground. He was dead. At this, the group redoubled their efforts to strike her down. Unfortunately for them, Gaara was now entirely focused on the task at hand, which was to comprehensively eliminate each and every one of them. 2 were killed instantly in identical fashion to the first, as their necks were broken in short order. The 5 that remained reacted by gathering together in front of her, seemingly preparing to drive a hole through her defenses with blunt force. I wouldn't put too much stock into the idea that linear blitzes are the answer to your endless list of problems, but I can indulge you if you'd like. Gaara sneered. The hunters then took her invitation. They made a charge for her front, only scattering at the last moment. Predictable, Gaara thought to herself confidently as she restrained each of them individually. With her enemies momentarily right in front of her, Gaara drew a kunai and slashed it across her field of vision. What resulted was a spray of blood that painted her face. She had cut 2 of their throats in one fell swoop. What the hell are you? One of the 3 remaining hunters sputtered as he was fully encased in sand with one of his comrades. The redhead gave him a falsely sweet smile and raised up one of her hands, causing the mass of sand they were trapped within to rise. That depends on your perspective. To most, I'm an outcast. To very few, I'm just a socially awkward little girl. To you, I'm an executioner, she said darkly. She then closed her hand into a fist. The mass of sand then collapsed in on the two unfortunate hunters, crushing them utterly. All that remained was a single hunter. Would you prefer to die quickly or slowly? She asked the man as he dangled before her. Just as the hunter began to respond, however, a new voice reverberated across the area. What the hell is going on? The redhead looked back over her shoulder, spotting Naruto standing at the edge of the block with a kunai drawn. He looked both shocked and angry. Ironically, it was difficult to tell who these emotions were directed towards. Unfortunately, his arrival had weakened Gaara's focus. Her sand's grip around the hunter softened just enough for him to kick Gaara off balance and cause her to drop him. The final hunter then made a charge towards Naruto, much to the shock of both rogue genin. A scream of panic escaped Gaara's throat just as the hunter swung his blade down towards Naruto's neck. Just before the metal could touch the blonde's throat, though, the hunter stopped. Gaara's eyes widened. Slowly but surely, the man slumped to the ground at Naruto's feet. A quick glance at the former Leaf Genin's hands told the entire story. The kunai he had come with was no longer there. He had stabbed the hunter as he had entered. Once it was clear that the man was dead, Gaara heaved a sigh of relief. Thank God, she thought to herself. Sadly, Naruto's reaction was far less positive. He stumbled back away from the body of the man he had just impaled and fell to his rear end with his eyes practically popping out of his skull. His mouth hung open, his hands were shaking, and his breathing was rapid. It took Gaara little time to realize what was happening. She immediately rushed over to him, easily hopping over the body to do so. Are you okay? She asked urgently. Naruto stared right through her. He was in shock. Deducing that words were useless at the moment, Gaara reached out and pulled him into a tight hug. After a time, she let him go and studied him. Talk to me, Naruto, she gently pressed. He attempted to do as he was told, but fumbled over his words numerous times before finally squeaking out a sentence. I killed him, I really killed him. He whispered hoarsely. He was struggling badly to cope with the reality that he had taken a life. Gaara gripped his shoulders firmly and steered him away from the body. You did what you had to do. He was moving to kill you. It was self-defense, she assured him. Naruto shook his head rapidly and shuddered. I didn't have to kill him. I could have just knocked him out. But I panicked and He stuttered. The redhead bit her lip and cupped his face. It was utterly heartbreaking to listen to. He would have killed you, Naruto. Letting him live would have made things harder in the future. The hunters would have come back, she reasoned carefully. Tears then started falling from the blonde's eyes. He might have had a family. I might have just killed somebody's dad, he said tearfully. Gaara gingerly turned his head upwards to make him meet her eyes. Maybe, but he was also about to take you away from the people who love you. I don't know what I'd do with myself if you died, and I'm sure your teacher and teammates would be heartbroken. It works both ways, Naruto, she said. Her fellow Jinchuriki's bottom lip quivered as he gazed at her, seemingly bothered by something. Within moments, Gaara realized what the issue was. My face matching my hair isn't helping you, is it? She asked with a sigh. Naruto shook his head and turned away from her. Much to his discomfort, Gaara pulled his face back in front of hers. Why? Why do people die wherever you go? He asked britly. The redhead gave him an apologetic smile and shrugged her shoulders. I'm a monster. Simple as that. A monster that loves you, and a monster that's going to protect you. I know you're scared of me, and that's okay. I just need you to understand that you're always safe. I cross my heart, she said sincerely. The blonde then fully broke down into tears, wailing and sobbing as Gaara held him tightly against her chest. Eventually, he calmed down slightly and pulled a few inches away from her. Am I a monster now? I killed somebody, he asked. Gaara shook her head and gave him a brief, unintentionally bloody kiss on the lips. Absolutely not. You never will be. You're the sweetest, warmest person I know. You're an angel, if anything, she said lovingly. Naruto stared into her blood-framed blue eyes for several moments. I think I love you, he said with uncertainty. Gaara felt her spirit soar at his words, but remained calm to ask a question. What makes you say that now? What changed? She asked curiously. Naruto glanced back at the body and pursed his lips. I couldn't say it before because I thought it'd be wrong to love a killer, but I guess I'm one too now, he explained ashamedly. His words hurt the redhead slightly, but she had also known of his reasoning in the back of her mind the entire time. I'm glad you can love me now, even if it came about through undesirable means, Gaara said. She then helped Naruto to his feet and wiped the blood from her face. We should leave. I doubt we'll be welcome here after this, she suggested. The blonde nodded stiffly and took the hand Gaara had silently offered him. Why yeah, let's get going. Gaara sighed contentedly as she leaned back in the sheets. It had been nearly 2 weeks since she had slept in a bed, and she had forgotten how much more comfortable it was than the ground or a cell's floor. She and Naruto had advanced on from the township after their brutal encounter with the hunters, and using the money Gaara had discreetly looted from their bodies, they had checked into a roadside inn. Much to the redhead's delight, they were sharing a single bedroom. At present, Naruto was taking his first shower in many days. Gaara had allowed him to go first, as she wanted to revel in the humble luxuries of a hotel room. Namely the bed. She had rolled around on it, fallen off of it, and hidden herself under the covers, among other things. Since they had practically no luggage, the room was very open. They were also sheltered from the elements by something other than a dark shell of sand, which was a great comfort to both. In general, Gaara was overjoyed. Other than her merciless slaughter of the hunters, it had been a brilliant day that was only bound to get better. Though by means that were less than ideal, Naruto had finally accepted his love for her, and he seemed to be recovering well from his accidental killing. He had been in fairly high spirits upon their arrival at the inn. His comfort is my comfort, his happiness is my happiness. Stay this way, my love, she thought to herself. As her eyes drifted across the room, she spotted something on the lamp table that stood in the leftmost corner. It was a small object wrapped in cloth, no larger than a notepad. It was the item Kakashi had tossed to the blonde just before their departure. With her curiosity mounting, Gaara swung her legs over the edge of the bed and made her way to the lamp table. After crossing the room, she unwrapped the cloth to reveal the identity of the item. It was a small book with an orange cover. When subjected to further scrutiny, it also had 2 words printed across one of the cover sides. Make out, tactics. Gaara muttered to herself, perplexed by the odd choice of titling. Deciding that she had little else to do, the redhead took the book back to the bed with her and slid back under the covers. She then opened the book and began to read. For the next 5 minutes, she carefully consumed its contents. The more she read, the more intrigued and confused she became. Immediately, there were concepts and words she had never heard before. Luckily for the girl, answers were provided for her many questions as she flipped through the pages. For reasons she could not fully discern, Gaara took great pleasure in reading the small orange book. It was enjoyable in a way quite unlike anything she had ever experienced. Unfortunately, her reading session was interrupted by the sound of the bathroom door opening. Suddenly feeling as though what she had been doing was wrong in some way, Gaara instantly hid the book under her pillow. Slowly but surely, Naruto emerged from the bathroom. Oddly enough, he was wearing a set of pajamas. You're not gonna believe this, but they actually have extra clothes in there. I think I saw a nightgown or 2, he notified his companion. The redhead nodded and nervously removed herself from the bed. Good to know. I think I'll take my shower now. I'll try not to be long, she said as she passed him and made her way into the bathroom. Once inside, she shut the door behind her and looked around. As Naruto had said, there were 2 separate piles of extra clothes. One was clearly meant for men, as it had shirts and long pajama pants, while the other was nightgowns. Relieved that she wouldn't be forced to sleep in her bloody tunic, Gaara relaxed slightly. Her mind then wandered back to the small orange book. I think I'll read the rest of it tonight. Though, that would mean I can't be as close to him as I'd like to be, she thought to himself. She then shrugged and turned towards the shower. Oh well. We're booked for 3 nights. I'll just have to snuggle him tomorrow night instead. Sasuke glanced around the room pensively. He had been summoned to the Hokage building nearly 20 minutes ago, and he was still awaiting the arrival of his summoner. It was a mind-numbing experience. The room was bland, and there was virtually nothing interesting to look at. Oddly enough, sounds didn't appear to echo in the small chamber. It was fortified. Soundproofed, it seemed. Though the identity of the person who had called for him was still factually unknown to him, Sasuke's intuition led him to an obvious answer. An unsettling one to be sure, but one that made a great deal of sense. This is on you, sensei, the Uchiha grumbled within his mind as he recalled Kakashi's vow to meddle in political affairs. A few moments later, the door across the room from him creaked open to reveal the suspected arranger of the sudden meeting. Danzo, who had just entered the room, looked the young genin up and down before nodding to no one in particular and shutting the door behind him. He then sat down on the opposite side of the room in an identical chair to Sasuke's. Forgive the long wait. I had some minor errands to run. Inventory and such, you understand, the old man apologized politely. Sasuke remained as stoic as was possible given his position. That's fine. What exactly am I here for? Missions are mostly shut down at the moment, if I'm remembering right, he asked. Danzo nodded his head, but quickly made a correction to the genin's response. Missions of little importance, yes. Prominent issues and happenings still require our attention, though. Which, as I'm sure you've easily deduced, is why you're here right now, he replied. The Uchiha perked up slightly at the revelation, but tempered himself. The man before him was still not to be trusted. Not in the slightest. You've got an assignment for me, then? Am I hearing this right? He inferred. Danzo folded his hands in his lap and adjusted his positioning in his chair. Before we get to that, I'd like to know your opinion on something, he said, earning a narrowed look of skepticism from the genin. Why would you need my take on something? You're the one in control? Sasuke asked. Danzo mentally applauded the Uchiha for his boldness, but maintained his calm. Because, it directly pertains to you. I would like to know your exact measurement of Gaara's strength. Depending on what you say, I may have some information for you, he said, piquing Sasuke's interest. Why would you need to know that? The success or failure of the hunters should tell you all you need to know, Sasuke pointed out. Danzo shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps, but an accurate measurement of her capabilities is still impossible to discern from a pile of bodies. Especially with Naruto present, given that he was quite obviously beyond her when they fought on another. You faced her twice. You know better than anybody else, he said. Sasuke pondered whether or not he should answer for several seconds. There was good reason to keep his mouth shut, but doing so could cost him. Eventually, he relented. She's stronger than me, but weaker than Naruto. She can transform into a demonic form when she's cornered, but it takes time. That second state is what I couldn't beat the first 2 times we fought. She's probably too much for a group of hunters to handle. Especially with Naruto there to help, he explained. Danzo stroked his chin and nodded along. Yes, that's what I figured. She did appear to be transformed when we captured her. Though, she did revert once we imprisoned her. Now, this segues us smoothly into my second question, he said. Sasuke furrowed his brow and hesitantly motioned for the old man to continue. Danzo leaned forward in his chair. Given more time to prepare with foreknowledge of what she's capable of, do you think that you would be able to bring her down in a third encounter? He asked as he eyed the boy intently. Sasuke thought for a moment. That, seriously, depends. I know for a fact that I can kill her with a jutsu of mine, but it's a dice roll. So, I guess the answer is maybe. He said. Danzo nodded and stood up from his chair. I know how much you'd like to fight her again. And believe me, I understand why. She's taken away one of our own, and she's a threat to any and all who stand against her. Your ire for her is perfectly justified. Something I think you'll find interesting, according to what we can infer from their initial route and directionality of travel, they're heading for the ruins of Uzushiogakure, he explained. Sasuke looked on in confusion as the old man headed for the door. Why would they be going there? That doesn't make any sense, he asked. Danzo stopped in the doorframe and glanced back at the Uchiha. Doesn't it? You are aware of who used to dwell on that coast, aren't you? He asked. Sasuke shook his head and awaited an answer to his silent question. Before you were born, Uzushio was an ally of Konoha. The swirl symbol on our uniforms was once their emblem. They were wiped out long ago. That's why Naruto has so few family members, among other things. The Uzumaki clan hailed from the coast, the old man said. A dry chuckle then escaped his lips. I don't know when he found out about that, or even how, but I suppose he's returning home in a sense, he said. The Uchiha's eyes widened as numerous things snapped together within his mind. As he processed, Danzo stepped out of the room completely. Do with that information what you will. If you wish to discuss a task to pursue them, come talk to me. I'm sure we can work something out. You're free to return to your daily business whenever you so choose, he called from the hallway before disappearing around a corner. Once he was gone, Sasuke released the breath he had been holding. His mind was spinning. His emotions were at war with one another. It felt cruel to potentially rob Naruto of a chance to settle in what essentially was his homeland, but to let Gaara's atrocities simply go unpunished felt equally wrong. Justice or mercy? An agonizing choice indeed. His disdain and disapproval of the red-headed Jinchuriki was potent, and it ate away at him daily, but she was still a person to whom Naruto was endeared. Silently, with great hesitancy, Sasuke rose to his feet and exited the room. I'll do what I have to do. Naruto sighed and rubbed his eyes tiredly as he plodded towards his and Gaara's temporary base of operations. The hotel had been cheap, if not high quality. The low price had been quite appealing, and the blonde had been prepared for the conditions. What he had not been prepared for, however, was the negligible difference in quality between his former apartment and the less than appealing hotel room he and his fellow Jinchuriki would be sharing for the following 2 nights. It was late, nearly 11:30, and Naruto was nearing the end of his rope. Days of relentless travel, leftover grief, and a literal ocean of stress had drained his usually boundless supply of energy substantially. As he trudged on down the final stretch of the hallway, The former genin of Konoha tore his mind away from the depressing path of his nostalgia and focused himself on the situation at hand. The destination he had in mind was half a country away, but still reachable. Once he and Gaara arrived, it was likely they would not be forced to move to retain their invisibility from the hunter shinobi of the leaf. With the help of Gaara's sand, it was likely that the pair could reach their endpoint within 2 weeks. It really is handy that the sand can operate without draining Gaara's chakra. That way we can just hunker down and rest whenever we need to, he thought to himself. At that thought, the blonde reached the door to his temporary dwelling. He gripped the handle and turned it, pushing the door open and stepping inside a moment later. The lights were off save for a lamp in the corner, which Gaara was seated by. The sound of his entry drew a lazy glance upward from the redhead. "Back from your stroll?" she asked calmly. Naruto nodded and flopped down onto the bed that was centered against the northmost wall of the relatively small room. "It got a little cold, so I gave up. Besides, I don't think being outside alone is a great idea right now," he explained. Gaara stood up from her small wooden chair and stretched. "Yes, that's true. Though, I highly doubt a simple squadron of middling ninja could even lay a finger on you if you took them seriously," she replied. The blonde nodded and removed his slashed forehead protector. "Probably true. The problem would still be that our hiding place wouldn't be a hiding place anymore. We'd have to move again," he pointed out. The rogue kunoichi chuckled dryly. "I'm well accustomed to sleeping very little, so I'd be up for it. You on the other hand, not so much," she said jabbingly. Naruto sat back up on the edge of the bed and looked at his companion. She was wearing one of the nightgowns provided by the inn that they had discovered the night before. It was simple and clean. Despite the conservative and bland nature of the outfit, he found himself momentarily stuck in a stare. Luckily for him, Gaara had distracted herself just long enough by fidgeting with a few strands of her hair to give Naruto time to recompose himself without catching her attention. "You've been sleeping more lately, but I still think you need more rest," he said. Gaara met his gaze and shrugged. "Sleeping against you has been a great help, so you have no need to worry. I won't die from sleep deprivation. Though, I'll likely always have these horrendous circles under my eyes," she said, her voice lowering to an irritated mutter for the final sentence. Despite her hushed tone, Naruto heard her. "Says a lot of good about you that you manage to be pretty with the circles, though," he commented. The moment the statement left his mouth, Naruto felt himself redden. Fortunately or unfortunately, his words had a similar effect on Gaara, who immediately turned pink. "Well, you've never seen my eyes without them, so you wouldn't know any better," she stammered, a small smile on her face as she averted eye contact. Pushing through his nervousness, Naruto forced himself to speak further. "Maybe not, but I like the way you look," he said awkwardly. The redhead clasped her hands together down by her waist and looked to the floor. "Save for a few stray comments, those are the first compliments I've received in quite some time." "You're very sweet," she said gratefully. Naruto scratched the back of his head. "No problem. You deserve to be told the truth, so that's what I'm doing," he said. It took Gaara little time to decipher the underlying compliment. "Thank you, Naruto. I'll be blunt, I didn't come to love you for your appearance. Not that you're ugly, far from it. But this conversation is just a reminder of what drew me to you," she said, finally raising her gaze up from the floor to look at him. The blonde felt his chest tighten at her use of the word love. Gaara, as a shark would smell blood, easily noticed the effect her words had taken. "I know that you haven't been told that you're loved very much, but you'll be hearing it plenty from now on. I mean it every single time. More than I can express," she said warmly. The former genin of Konoha relaxed a bit and smiled. "For a girl who sucks at being social, you sure do have a way with words," he said with a grin. Gaara chuckled, sat down beside him on the bedside, and leaned her head on his shoulder before sighing contentedly. "Only with you, Naruto. I'm still a mess with other people. Not that it matters. You're all that I value, frankly. Well, save for my sister and brother," she said softly. She then turned her head and kissed his cheek. Naruto smiled and gently put an arm over her shoulders. "You'll make some friends along the way. Trust me, you will," he assured her. Gaara nodded and brought herself closer to him with her mouth now close to his ear. "I appreciate your confidence in me, but for now, I'm satisfied with just you," she whispered in his ear. For reasons unknown to him, Naruto shuddered. As she always did, Gaara quickly detected his subtle reaction. Buoyed by the blonde's subconscious acknowledgement, Gaara kept her lips in close proximity to his ear. "I have a question for you. A similar one to the one I asked you in the prison cell," she continued. Naruto immediately turned a deep red color. Suddenly, he found that his tongue was tied. When he didn't respond, Gaara filled the silence. "You do remember, don't you, Naruto-kun?" she purred. The addition of the honorific pushed the blonde over the edge, prompting him to attempt to scoot away a few inches. Having anticipated the movement, Gaara simply fell back while grasping his arm. Her momentum pulled Naruto on top of her as her back hit the bedsheets. "Don't leave me now." "I was only teasing," she joked as Naruto stared down at her uncomfortably. Opting to give in rather than resist further, the former Leaf Genin sighed. "Yeah, I do remember what you asked me. You asked me about how kissing worked and what it was," he said. The redhead nodded and reached up to touch his face. "Yes, I did. You were an excellent teacher," she said suggestively. Naruto's eye twitched and his face flushed further. "You didn't really give me much of a choice, you know," he grumbled. Gaara smiled and brushed back his bangs gently. "Oh please. You enjoyed yourself whether you want to admit it or not." "I know I certainly did," she replied. Naruto rolled his eyes. Yeah, I get it. You said you had another question. What is it? Hand-holding or something?" he asked. Gaara shook her head and shrugged one of her nightgown's shoulder straps off on the left side. "I've been doing some reading recently, and the book told of a step beyond kissing. Something called sex, I think," she said, slowing her rate of speaking near the end to recall the term she had just learned. The moment the explanation had been concluded, Naruto's eyes widened to saucers. "What the hell have you been reading?" he asked tensely. Gaara gestured over to the table on which the still-lit lamp stood. Next to the light source was a small orange book. The color of the softback immediately clicked in Naruto's mind. "Man, I just can't catch any kind of break, can I?" he thought to himself tiredly. Before he could retreat further into his thoughts, Gaara snapped him back to attention by speaking again. "Now, as for my question, it's actually more of a request. I would like you to have sex with me, as the book would say," she clarified. Naruto remained silent for a moment. "Do you know what you're asking me?" he asked carefully. Gaara nodded her head and blushed a bit. "Yes. I'm asking you to remove your clothes and insert your dash," she began. Before she could finish the sentence, Naruto cut her off. "No, that's not what I mean. If you've read that book, you know how it literally works. What I'm saying is, do you really want to do that with me?" he cut in. The redhead nodded and reached up again. This time she wrapped her arms around the back of his neck and pulled him downwards towards her lips. She then kissed him softly for several moments before releasing him. "I don't want to do this simply because I get warm between my legs when I look at you, though I do from time to time. I want to do this because the people in the book were happy. They treated the act as a symbol of unity between man and woman. I want that with you. I want us to be bound together," she said. Naruto pursed his lips and averted his eyes from hers. "That's really sweet, but being tied to me isn't something you should want. We already share a birthday," he said dejectedly. Gaara sighed and turned his face back towards her with her hands. "I want everything to do with you. Your pain, your sorrows, your flaws, everything. Being connected to you is something I not only desire, but something I need at this point. You're all I have," she said quietly. Naruto felt his heart melt at her words. "Are you sure? We're kinda young," he pointed out. The redhead nodded and shrugged the second shoulder strap of her nightgown from her body. "Young in body, but given how much we've been through and the things we've seen, I'd say we're more than qualified. Now please, let's love each other," she said as her chest and collarbone became more exposed. Naruto considered his options for a moment before nodding. "Okay, I'm willing," he said. Gaara then pressed her lips to his, applying more force than before. After a moment of adjustment, the blonde returned the gesture in kind. Once they had exhausted their oxygen, the pair separated their mouths. A thin trail of saliva connected their lips as they took in breath. Gaara licked her lips and smiled softly before laying flat on her back and squirming her upper body fully out of her nightgown. "Please be gentle," she requested as she gazed up at the boy she loved. Naruto gave a reassuring nod. From that night forward, they were bound together. Kakashi glanced to the leftmost corner of his room for the umpteenth time in the past 10 minutes. Numerous times, he had been alerted by one or more of his 5 senses to a presence in that very spot. Interestingly enough, said corner contained a chair. Despite his unease, the Jonin had remained on his bed throughout the night. Logically, there were a variety of reasons for him to be concerned, but dwelling on them would likely reduce his sleeping capabilities to nil. Such was the risk of being meddlesome in the political structure of one's village. To a degree, the danger he may or may not be in was entirely his own fault. Danzo Shimura was a person who was quite perilous to cross, directly or indirectly. At least I know that I'm not the only one who distrusts him. I'm not entirely alone, Kakashi thought to himself. He had spent much of his time recently on the outskirts of the council's meeting room, making suggestions, sliding in comments from the sidelines, doing all he could to subtly tarnish the depressingly good name of Danzo. It had required him to take an assignment as the bodyguard of the council as a whole, but it had been worth it. He had gleaned a significant wealth of information simply by closing his eyes and listening. As expected, an election for the position of Hokage was being discussed. Predictably, the names being discussed for candidacy were all those in favorable standings with the council. With Hiruzen gone, they're essentially free to set out a buffet of agenda-pleasing options. Danzo is the most controversial of them, but he's also the most likely to win despite that. I think my tampering has helped on that front just a bit, but it still isn't enough yet, the silver-haired ninja pondered. It was a dire issue. Should Danzo assume the position of Hokage, the Hidden Leaf would essentially be transformed into a political war machine. Though the man religiously preached his love for the greater good, his imagined society was far from ideal for those not fortunate enough to be born into prominence. It was an elitist society. Kakashi himself likely would have no trouble fitting into such a place, but the lives of those around him were more important than his own in his mind. Preventing his rise would be far from easy, and it was potentially pointless, but giving up without trying was not a thing he had ever been willing to do. Not just pertaining to the situation at hand. It simply wasn't in his nature, and never would be. At this point, all I can do is badmouth him and use what little sway I have to make things as hard for him as possible. Kakashi lamented with a sigh. It was greatly frustrating to be so desperately opposed to somebody, and yet be nearly powerless before them. Brief thoughts of more forceful methods had crossed the Jonin's mind exactly once, but they had quickly been cast aside. Though one would have a difficult time discerning it based purely on his outward appearance, Danzo was an incredibly daunting combatant, and one that Kakashi was unequipped to deal with. Then, as the Jonin was deep in thought, a slight creaking sound emanated from the leftmost corner. Finally, having had enough of the mystery, Kakashi sat up straight and whipped a kunai that he had been fiddling with at the chair. Before it could connect with the chair itself, however, it was deflected with a spark. It bounced off of the still invisible barrier and whizzed past Kakashi's left ear before lodging itself into the wall. Slowly but surely, a figure became visible. The clearer it became, the more uneasy Kakashi grew. After a few moments, the identity of the intruder was clear. It's a little early for this kind of thing. Most assassinations happen at night, you know, the silver-haired ninja pointed out as Itachi Uchiha put away the larger-than-average kunai he had used to deflect the projectile Kakashi had thrown his way. I haven't even spoken a word, and you're already jumping to conclusions. You're sharper than that, Kakashi-san, Itachi said with a sigh as he crossed one leg over the other. Kakashi swung his legs over the side of his bed and sat up straight. Given who your employers are, I think I've got good reason to assume, he countered calmly. The rogue Uchiha gave no noticeable response. They're less my employers than they are my coworkers. For the most part, anyway. But, rest assured, I'm not here to kill you. If I were, you'd be dead already, he said stoically. Making certain that he avoided eye contact, Kakashi shifted in place. Makes sense to me. Well, since you're here, I'm guessing you have something to tell me? You don't strike me as the type for visits, he replied. Itachi nodded slightly and glanced around the room, seemingly to make sure that they were entirely isolated from the outside world. I'd like to make this quick, so I'll cut right to the matter I'm here to resolve. First on that docket is a piece of advice I have for you. Do not leave your home under any circumstances for the next 36 hours, he said. Kakashi furrowed his brow, but kept his eyes glued to the floor. And why should I listen to you? You aren't exactly trustworthy, he questioned lightly. The Akatsuki shrugged his shoulders and folded his arms across his chest. I've committed many sins, but dishonesty has hardly been one of them. Especially lately. I've no reason to lie to you. As for why you should follow my advice, it's because I'm guessing you'd rather not be framed for first-degree murder, he said bluntly. The Jonin's eyes widened slightly. What do you mean by that? Explain yourself, he said, clearly puzzled by what he had just been told. The rogue Uchiha let a low chuckle escape before recomposing himself and standing up from the chair he had been occupying for an unknown amount of time. Let's just say that I'm about to solve a problem of yours for you. Though not in the spirit of being helpful, shall we say. This is personal business that happens to overlap with your agenda, he explained. Instantly catching on to what was being insinuated, Kakashi shot to his feet to meet Itachi. Why are you telling me any of this, then? If you aren't actually here to help, you wouldn't be giving me a heads up, he pointed out. The Akatsuki remained silent for several moments before replying. I'm not here to help you. Not specifically, but the person I am here to assist would be quite broken up if tragedy of some kind were to befall you, so I saw fit to keep you out of the line of fire, he said before disappearing in a puff of smoke. Left in a state of panic, Kakashi simply stood in silence for a number of seconds before dropping to his rear end on the bed and running his hands through his own hair. That was jarring, he muttered to himself. After reviewing the new development several times, he laid down on the bed and closed his eyes. 36 hours, huh? May as well sleep through it. Naruto groaned and stretched his back as he looked over the in-room. It was clean and tidied. Surprisingly, its current state of cleanliness had actually been at the blonde's behest. Upon awakening alongside Gaara under the covers of their shared bed, Naruto had decided to wake himself up earlier than usual by picking up any items lying on the floor, putting the showering supplies back in their proper places, and generally doing light maintenance. It had taken roughly a half an hour, and Gaara had awoken halfway through the process. Interestingly enough, she had simply watched him work, seemingly endeared by his efforts. He was now finished with the cleaning, and there was little else to do than engage with what essentially amounted to his significant other. "How'd you sleep?" he asked with a smile as the redhead rubbed one of her eyes and yawned for the third time that morning. "Extremely well. Better than I have in a long, long time." "I have you to thank for that," she said, glancing away from him shyly with a twinge of red on her cheeks as she replied. Though initially puzzled by her timidity, the obvious reasoning hit Naruto in the back of the head within moments. Suddenly feeling quite awkward, the former Leaf Genin laughed a bit and scratched the back of his head. "Why yeah. I guess so. I'm glad you slept well. You definitely could use the rest." "I crashed pretty hard myself," he said. Gaara then returned her gaze to him, her expression quizzical. "Do you think what we did last night is the answer to my sleeping issues?" she asked curiously. The blonde immediately shook his head. "No, I don't think so. I really doubt it. You just need some help getting to sleep, I think," he replied quickly. His words made Gaara's face fall slightly. "Oh, I see," she muttered dejectedly. Sensing her drop off in enthusiasm, Naruto's expression shifted and he stepped forward, putting a hand on her shoulder once he was close enough. "Hey, you all right?" he asked gently. Gaara glanced back up at him and then back at the floor again, seemingly quite bothered by something. "Do you really think that, or did you not enjoy sleeping with me?" she asked. Naruto suddenly realized his mistake and sighed. He then leaned forward and kissed her on the forehead. "That's not it at all. Last night made me super happy. It was really something. But I don't think we should be doing that kind of thing much." "Not right now," he said carefully. The redhead frowned slightly. "Why not?" "That was absolutely wonderful, if a little painful at first," she asked skeptically. Naruto glanced at the bedside table, where the orange book lay. "I'm guessing you haven't read that thing all the way through yet, right?" he asked in response. His fellow Jinchuriki nodded and motioned for him to expand on his question. "Well, in the end, the two characters have a baby," he said simply, letting Gaara do the rest of the thinking for herself. It took her a few moments, but she eventually reached the logical answer. "Sex makes babies?" she asked, obviously dumbfounded by the revelation. Naruto suppressed a laugh and nodded in confirmation of her discovery. "Yes, Gaara. Yes, it does. Which is why we shouldn't do that again until we're a lot older, okay?" he said. The redhead thought for a moment before giving him an odd look. "Are we going to have a baby?" she asked, almost sounding hopeful at the prospect of birthing a child. The blonde shook his head. "No, I made sure that we wouldn't. Like I said, we're gonna save this kind of thing for when we're a whole lot older," he said. Gaara sighed and nodded reluctantly. She then reached out and pulled him into an embrace. "Okay. I can live with that. Still, thank you for humoring me last night. I really adored being that close to you." "You're very sweet, Naruto," she said, her voice slightly muffled due to her face being pressed against his shoulder. The former Leaf Genin squeezed her gently. "I wasn't humoring you. You've never really gotten what you wanted, and I figured I'd give you something to be happy about for once." "You've more than earned some love, Gaara," he said kindly. The redhead responded by relaxing against him and glancing up at his face. "Can we have a baby someday?" she asked innocently. Naruto shrugged his shoulders and released her from his grip. "When we have a place to stay and a home to raise it, sure. Not anytime soon, though," he said. Gaara smiled and stood up from the bed. She then gave him a peck on the lips before disappearing into the bathroom. She seemed to be overjoyed. The shower then started inside the bathroom, prompting Naruto to begin making the bed. "She's sorta weird, even now, but that's what makes her so cute," he thought to himself. Minutes later, Gaara emerged from the room wearing her old tunic and pants, which were now clean. "I cleaned it in the shower. The back is still singed, but it should do for now," she explained. "We should probably get moving soon. We'll be at the coast in around 12 days if we're fast," Naruto said in response. After a brief discussion of travel schedule and pacing, the blonde took his turn in the shower and cleaned his clothing. Once they were both clothed and bathed, they checked out of the inn and stepped out onto the road to continue on. "Would you mind telling me where we're going, Naruto?" "You still haven't told me," Gaara asked as they walked down the immensely long dirt path. "It's a place I've never actually been to, but somewhere I think would make a great place to settle and prepare for a while since there's nobody there," Naruto explained. The redhead raised an eyebrow. "An abandoned town, perhaps?" she inquired. The former Leaf Genin kicked around a rock at his feet. "Yeah, sorta. A little different, though. I think we'll be pretty safe if what I've read about it is actually true, he said. Gaara then slipped her hand into his. As we've established, you're perfectly safe in my care no matter where we go. I do hope that this place is habitable, though. I'd like to settle too, she said. From there on, they spoke little. There was little to be said. At present, they needed only the company of one another. The single visible eye on Danzo's face narrowed as a presence made itself known to his senses. He was no longer alone. Despite the rays of sun beaming through the window of his study, he still could not directly see his uninvited guest. It mattered little. To be sharp without access to one's own sight was a trait all competent shinobi shared. Clearing his throat strongly and taking a seat in his chair, the bandaged old man spoke. Show yourself, whoever you are. I know you're here, he called out. For a time, there was silence. For such a time, in fact, that Danzo began to doubt the accuracy of his senses. Relaxing slightly, he poured himself a cup of tea from his steaming thermos. Once the cup was full, he lightly blew on it to begin drinking. Lovely morning, don't you think? Hardly past 9:30, and the sun is already shining. Danzo slowly set his cup down and straightened his posture. He recognized the voice all too well, though he wished he hadn't. Footsteps then quietly echoed through the room as the man made his way around the desk and brought himself into the bandaged old man's field of vision. What compelled you to grace me with your presence, Itachi? Danzo asked while the rogue Uchiha stared down at him from his not insignificant height. Itachi simply maintained his icy stare and pulled up a chair away from the wall to sit himself down on. I'm a man of order, Danzo. I value things such as organization, peace, and uniformity. By extension, I value abidance by terms. Of all our differences, I believe that is our only similarity, he said vaguely, taking note of Danzo's avoidance of eye contact as he spoke. His words offered no clarity, but the councilman was sharp. If this is about the arrangement you made with the council upon your departure all those years ago, I fail to see what the issue is. Sasuke is still unaware of the truth, he replied. Itachi shook his head and rested his elbows on the desk. That wasn't the only deal we made. I also specified that I wished for him to be left out of politics. Recent developments seem to have wiped that from your memory, he corrected. His tone was calm, but the underbelly was one of menace. In what way have I involved him in politics? If anything, I'd say he's fairly free to roam given the situation at hand. I fail to see your point, Danzo asked. I'm well aware of your scheme to send him cross-country after the Jinchuriki. You're playing to his hatred of the girl to coax him into making the decision himself. Should he succeed, he'd no doubt retrieve Naruto Uzumaki, who you plan to use for a war you're soon to declare. Itachi replied. The bandaged old man scoffed at the accusation. Naruto Uzumaki and Gaara of the desert are both rogue ninja. It's the proper legal process to send somebody after them. Konoha's hunters are incapable of bringing them back, so I'm turning to your brother, who at least has a fighting chance. It isn't politics. It's logic, he countered. A scowl then manifested on Itachi's face. You and I both know that he can't best either one of them in combat reliably. Especially not Naruto, and he'd be utterly crushed if they were to attack him as a combined force. In fact, I dare say that's what you're counting on, he said dangerously. Danzo's face visibly twitched, a clear sign of discomfort. You have absolutely no ground to stand on for that statement. You're being fanciful, he hissed back. The rogue Uchiha then calmed slightly, leaning back in his chair to make himself more comfortable. Oh, I have plenty of ground to stand on. I know what you hide beneath those bandages, you rat. I also know what you did to Shursui. You've gotten slyer about your tactics in the years since, but the goal remains the same. You wish to send Sasuke to his death at the hands of Gaara. With him dead, his eyes would be yours for the taking. You would also have the built-in excuse that Sasuke chose to attack them of his own accord, he said in an eerily even tone. Before Danzo could even begin to respond, Itachi stood up from his chair and adjusted his collar. As he did this, the red ring he wore on his right hand caught Danzo's eye for a split second with reflected sunlight, causing the old man to flinch slightly. I've always been watching. Your atrocities have always been known to me. Unfortunately, I've never quite been in a position to punish you myself. Even now, I won't be the one taking your life, he said ominously. He then let out a short laugh. I'd suggest either the chandelier or the window, he said before disappearing into a swarm of illusionary crows. Shocked and confused, Danzo took several deep breaths. Once he was calm again, he relaxed. Empty threats. Nothing but bravado, he thought to himself, still slightly perplexed by Itachi's final words to him. He then went back about his daily business. The Uchiha's words would soon come true in a sense. That night, after having grown concerned about the long seclusion of Danzo, the old man's assistant entered the study to a shocking sight. At 9:32 that night, Danzo Shimura was found hanging from his chandelier. Exactly 1 week had passed since the apparent suicide of Danzo Shimura. 7 painfully long days had dragged on since the night of his death, and each one grew progressively more chaotic. The first 2 days had been rife with questions and an underabundance of answers. The following 3 were defined by mass confusion as to the circumstances behind his passing. The most recent 2 had been slow, with very little happening in any sense. Things were still not normal, per se, but they were indeed less chaotic. The chaos had not yet ended for Kakashi, though. No, at present, his future was unpredictable. This was because he currently sat before the Council of Konoha for reasons unknown to him. He had heeded Itachi's words and remained in his home for exactly 36 hours after their conversation, mostly having passed the time by sleeping and occasionally eating. It seemed extremely unlikely that he would be accused, let alone convicted, of staging Danzo's death to appear a suicide, but stranger things had happened before. The worst aspect of the Jonin's current situation was quite the opposite of what one might assume. In general, people usually lost their nerve when faced with a large crowd of people. In particular, a large crowd of prominent people. That was not what Kakashi was currently contending with, though. As of now, only 5 people sat before him. Every one of them held a legitimate degree of influence, but it was hardly the crowd that Kakashi had expected upon his summoning. For whatever reason, the small audience brought him great unease. Perhaps it was the focus and pared-down nature of it all. There was little to look at other than the council members, which was unnerving to say the least. Worse yet, nothing had been said since his arrival in the council room 5 minutes previously. In fact, it wasn't until the 8th minute that a word was spoken. "Have you a guess as to why you're here, Hataki-san?" an elderly councilman asked calmly from his elevated seat above Kakashi. It was a trap of a question, and the silver-haired ninja knew it. Despite the obviously underhanded nature of the inquiry, Kakashi felt little actual pressure to answer it carefully. "I've got a few ideas. None of them are all that great, honestly," he replied. A murmur circulated through the quintet before him. After a moment of hushed discussion, the same man cleared his throat to silence the others. "This may come as a surprise to you, but you actually aren't in any hot water. We find your sudden disappearance several days ago to be strange, but we also have no way to link you to Danzo-san's suicide. As it stands, you're an innocent man," he informed the Jonin, causing him to relax subtly. "What am I here for, then? Given the situation, I doubt you just wanted to chat?" Kakashi asked skeptically. The councilman responded by tossing him something. After fumbling with the object for a moment, the silver-haired ninja caught a firm grip on it and flipped it over. It was a Suna forehead protector. Upon further examination, there was blood crusted on the metal. "Let me guess, this was Gaara's?" Kakashi inferred as he gestured to the foreign object. The council gave a collective nod in confirmation. "It was found amidst the mess they left in the prison when they broke out. As for why exactly you're here, we actually would like to ask for you advice on a matter pertaining to our next course of action," a different council member clarified from Kakashi's left. "As you're likely aware, we've determined that they're heading for the southern coast. Given that Uzushiogakure lies there, we have every reason to believe that they intend to take refuge in the ruins. With that in mind, we'd like to take steps to retrieve them," another from the opposite side explained. "And you want Sasuke to be on that retrieval team, right?" the Jonin guessed. There was then an uncomfortable change in demeanor from the council. "We have very few options. Our hunters have nothing for them, and we've already seen Sasuke have a promising amount of success against Gaara in particular. According to Academy scores, he should also outclass Naruto quite handily," the man who had first acknowledged Kakashi said carefully. The silver-haired ninja sighed and stood up from the chair that had been provided for him to sit in. "You've got a few things wrong. First of all, the success Sasuke had against Gaara was almost entirely Pyrrhic. He'd have to get extremely lucky to win that fight reliably. Second, Naruto is stronger than both of them. By a fairly huge margin, actually. He largely held back against Gaara, and he still beat her pillar to post. You know that as well as I do," he said. Several members of the council began to respond, but they were swiftly cut off by Kakashi. "Also, I don't really trust you any further than I could pummel you. For the most part, you've all been on board with Danzo. He planned to use both of them as instruments of a war that doesn't need to be happening. I have no reason to believe that you aren't operating under that same agenda," he said. Initially, there was an uneasy silence. It was clear that at least some of the accusations Kakashi had levied at them held truth, though how many was difficult to discern with any accuracy. "While we did agree with Danzo on a variety of matters, we were never fully supportive of his plans for the Jinchuriki. Namely Naruto, who we disapproved of his future machinations for. I can assure you that he would be treated fairly upon his return. As for Gaara, we would be legally required to punish her, but her sentencing could be lightened due to the extenuating circumstances, the leftmost councilman said. Kakashi gave a derisive snort. Oh please. All that'll be different without Danzo around is that you won't be threatening him with Gaara's suggested execution. I know all about what he planned to do. There's absolutely no way he could have set all of that up without going through the council first. You're as bad as he was. I do think you're probably going to be easier to negotiate with, though, he said vaguely. What are you implying, Hatake-san? The central councilman asked with narrowed eyes and a suspicious tone. The copy ninja held up Gaara's forehead protector. Sasuke still falls under my jurisdiction, and you can't send him out after them without my consent. I'll let you do it, but on 3 conditions, he said, earning the begrudging intrigue of the council, who all gestured for him to continue. First of all, you're going to call a meeting with the council of Sunagakure. They're in the same position we are. Raza, the 4th Kazekage, is dead, and that invasion was arranged by Orochimaru. Our leaders were killed by the same man. We have no reason to be fighting one another. We're twice their size in terms of military might, so a war would be nothing more than a pissing contest, he began, eyeing each of the men before him intently. Can you agree to that? Of all the things I require, this one is completely non-negotiable. We don't need a 4th world war, he pressed. It took a few moments, but he received a reluctant nod from the group. Satisfied with the result, Kakashi continued speaking. Secondly, if I agree to let Sasuke go to Uzushio, I want to send Niji Hyuga with him. And before you ask, it's because somebody needs to keep Naruto occupied if they can't just talk them into coming back, he said. The rightmost councilman raised an eyebrow. If I'm not mistaken, Niji was soundly beaten by Naruto during their match. What makes you think he'd be of any use against him a second time, he asked. On the most basic level, Niji is hard for Naruto. He's a whole lot weaker in a literal sense, but he'll always have the ability to stick around long enough to give him trouble. He'd be there to buy time, Kakashi replied. With no other questions to ask, the central councilman glanced at the clock. You said you had 3 conditions. What's your 3rd requirement? Make it quick. We don't have all day, he pressed. The Jonin ignored him at first, choosing to turn around and head for the door rather than answer. Just before he exited, though, he cast them one last glance. If Sasuke and Niji can't bring them back, don't send anybody else after them. Leave them be. You do realize how poorly this could turn out, right? Not really. A loss for either side means good things for the other in one way or another. Guy rubbed his temples and shook his head. He and Kakashi had gathered for lunch nearly an hour ago, and though it had taken a shocking amount of time, the topic of Kakashi's summoning the previous day had finally reared its head. While he had not been especially appreciative of the silver-haired ninja volunteering Niji for such a perilous assignment without his consent, Guy had relented and given his blessing. It was a necessity, though one that pertained to an entirely optional task. What if Gaara kills them both? Who does that benefit? He asked. Kakashi gave him a bored look and took a sip of his half-empty glass of water. You and I both know that Naruto would never let her. Besides, if she beat Sasuke, I highly doubt she'd even try to kill him. Maybe I'm reaching here, but I think Naruto's opinion of her means a whole lot to that train wreck. They won't die unless something wild happens, he assured his comrade casually. Guy's eye twitched slightly. You're awfully calm about this. We have absolutely no way to know if Naruto can actually control her. Even if he can, are we sure he won't do something he regrets? He's good by nature, but tapping into the fox is bound to cloud his judgment somewhat. Also, consider that minor injuries could become major if left untreated. They'll have a month-long trek back no matter the result, he pointed out. The silver-haired ninja set his cup aside and glanced out the window of the cafe in which they were situated. They'll be given medical supplies for the road, so that shouldn't be a huge issue. What I'm a whole lot more worried about is Sasuke, to be perfectly honest. He's an unknown quantity, he said, drawing a frown from Guy. How do you mean? The taijutsu master asked skeptically. Kakashi ordered another cup of water and drummed his fingers on the table pensively. I'm concerned about his mental state heading into a third fight with her. He isn't built to handle Naruto at this point, and he knows that, but he very much believes that he can take Gaara down. That would be fine if it weren't coupled with what seems to be a real desire to kill her. That complicates things. Let's say he does beat her, and then he puts a knife in her, that could ruin our chances of Naruto coming willingly, he pondered aloud, seemingly quite deep in thought. The seal on his neck also feeds into that, doesn't it? Guy asked his conflicted friend. Kakashi leaned his face on his arm and lazily accepted a full glass of water from the waitress. It does, and I don't know if locking it down is the best idea right now. It ran rampant at the end of his second fight with Gaara, and it took almost 6 hours to contain it again. Putting another seal on it would take a while, and it would need to be stronger. He would probably still be weakened by the time they reached Uzushio, he said, clearly stumped by the predicament. What do you plan to do? We Jonin aren't allowed to leave the village for the time being, not until things are sorted out. It feels to me like we should leave them alone until you or I can go after them, Guy said. Kakashi pursed his lips. I've made a deal with the council regarding that, actually. Should Sasuke and Neji fail to bring them back, they've agreed to simply forget about them for now. I don't really know how to feel. In some ways, I think that those two settling down in the middle of nowhere is a terrible idea, but in others, I think Naruto deserves the chance to make a life of his own. A life that isn't chained down by a system that's biased against him. As much as I hate to admit it, Gaara probably deserves that too, he said. His fellow Jonin gave him a sympathetic look. Understandable as that is, you still can't let your emotions get in the way of the task at hand. The boy deserves better, that much is true, but he can still make a life here. He just needs to give people a reason to respect him. Hard as he works, few know. Lee was in the same position until he took Gaara to death's door. People's opinions are malleable, he said. The silver-haired ninja shook his head. If that were true, they'd have revered him after he broke Neji in a goddamn taijutsu match. People didn't care about Lee, but they also didn't have any strong opinions on him. They hate Naruto, Guy. They cheered for him after he knocked out Neji, but only as a sign of respect for what he'd accomplished. Not as a sign or respect for him. It'd take something miraculous for him to get on their good side, he countered. His expression then softened slightly. I just don't think it's fair to expect him to wait for that. I want him back here, but letting him go isn't a thing I'm against, he said a tad more quietly. At this, Guy stood up from the table. Let's take our minds off this for a bit. Let's take a jog, he said with a gesture towards the door. Kakashi sighed and paid for their drinks before setting out with him to exercise. Though he still lacked the raw enthusiasm of his comrade, he did, in fact, enjoy himself to some degree. Naruto suppressed a yawn as he leaned back against the interior of the sand shell. He was tired, both physically and mentally, but he had found himself unable to sleep. For once, the paradigm between himself and Gaara had been reversed. Most nights, Gaara remained conscious for a time, holding and squeezing the blonde before eventually falling asleep. Tonight, Naruto seemed on track to take her place in that role. They were less than 5 days away from their destination, which was fortunate. The weather was growing colder. It was also quite convenient that the pair were openly romantic by this point. Huddling was an extremely effective way to maintain warmth. At present, Gaara was cradled in his arms much like an infant. She was curled up into him with her legs and head being supported by Naruto's arms. She was shockingly light. Less than 100 pounds without question. Recent times had truly emphasized just how small a girl she was. Generously 5 feet tall, extremely light, and with very little actual muscle. She felt like a bundle of straw. Despite this, she was inhumanly durable. She had survived a hidden lotus from Lee, been impaled by Sasuke, and had taken a horrendous beating from Naruto during the invasion. Through all of that, she had never once completely broken. Funny. Looking at you now, I'm starting to get protective. Not that you need protecting. You're just so little, the blonde mused as he gazed down at her sleeping face. Though he had initially been somewhat dismissive of it, she was quite an attractive, if somewhat scruffy-looking girl. She was pale white, but her skin was virtually flawless, her eyes had dark circles, but her irises were a striking blue. She was very pleasant to look at when she wasn't reveling in her madness. Even in horrible situations such as their encounter with the hunters, she had managed to calm him. Her face had been painted with blood, and her lips had tasted of iron, but her always shocking purity had warmed him. A part of Naruto knew all too well that accepting and relishing her affections was a moral tragedy in some ways, but he also knew that she was entirely a product of the environment in which she had been forced to grow up. When Naruto had shown her kindness and mercy, she had returned it with every fiber of her being, though to him only. Her morality was very much a mutually exclusive trait that only he and her siblings had seen, but it still existed. It won't take that much to show her that people are worth the trouble. It'll take some time, but I know I can help her be herself with other people, the blonde thought to himself. For the next few minutes, he simply let his mind drift and listened to Gaara softly breath. Eventually, his eyelids grew heavy, prompting him to close his eyes. He then carefully laid down on his side with Gaara still in his arms. The shift caused the redhead to stir slightly, a quiet groan escaping her as she unconsciously nuzzled her face into his chest. Naruto smiled at this and ran a hand through her crimson hair. "Good night, Gaara." Neji exhaled through his nose and glanced to his left. They had exited the village nearly an entire 12 hours ago, and their pace had only slowed a handful of times. Rest was going to be a rarity. His assignment to accompany Sasuke across the land of fire 5 days previously had been a sudden one, and a thing that he found greatly surprising. Of all the people to be chosen for such a task, Neji would not have included himself in the running for a variety of reasons. He hardly knew either Sasuke or Naruto, and his task on the journey was confusing to say the least. He had been decisively beaten by Naruto once before, and yet he was being sent to face him again. The broad reasoning behind the mission was logical, but the specifics were confusing. If the rumors and reports were true, Naruto had completely overpowered Gaara after Sasuke had failed to do so 2 consecutive times. If more ludicrous-sounding tales were to be believed, he had done so quite easily as well. If that was the case, the mission Neji and Sasuke were embarking on was entirely pointless. Gaara was a seeming impossibility for Sasuke to defeat, and Naruto was much the same to the Hyuga. In fact, the blonde supposedly battering Gaara in domineering fashion heavily implied a newfound level of strength that represented an unclimbable mountain for both himself and Sasuke. Then again, he himself clarified to me that he was unable to freely access the upper reaches of his strength. Given that he was almost certainly enraged, the power he used against Gaara may not be consistently present. Even so, I'm likely to lose to him again unless I get tremendously lucky, though it pains me to admit it. Neji pondered as he and his unlikely companion sprinted across the open fields of the rural country. It was quite unlike him to take up such a dangerous task when there was no direct, personal benefit. Should they succeed, temporary fame and prestige would almost certainly follow, but it would be superficial. It would do little for him in the long run. Perhaps he was driven to willingly go along with the assignment to simply see what there was to see. Unlike Sasuke, he wasn't fully invested in the situation emotionally. Naruto meant virtually nothing to the branch Hyuga beyond a desire to overcome him, and Gaara of the Sand was more or less an enigma. In spite of this lack of interest in the people involved, Neji still found himself curious as to what exactly drove Sasuke to so doggedly pursue them. His friendship with Naruto was the easiest answer, but it was clear that there was far more to it than that. He held an obvious disdain for the diminutive redhead, but for it to burn so powerfully was frankly puzzling. While the girl's crimes in Konoha had been numerous and unsettling, they had actually done minimal lasting damage. Kiba and Shino had recovered from the beating they had received quite quickly, and Sasuke himself was completely healed. The whispers of a separate murder she had committed likely held some truth, but the victim in question wasn't one that the Uchiha had known personally to Neji's knowledge, and Sasuke had hardly ever been one to preach of justice and righteousness. With all of that in mind, the chances of Sasuke's hatred for Gaara being born purely from her atrocities felt quite unlikely, as strange it sounded. Based upon what I know, he doesn't know her well enough to despise her on a personal level. They met for the first time when they faced off against one another at the beginning of their match. His only experiences with her were in combat. What on earth could have triggered this? Neji wondered to himself. What limited conversation he and Sasuke had shared on their hours-long run up to this point had been on the topic of what they planned to do upon arriving in Uzushiogakure. Through these exchanges, the Hyuga had deduced that this operation was much more about Gaara than Naruto. Sasuke obviously did care for his teammate, and wished for him to return to Konoha, but his focus was very much on his trilogy with Gaara. A single look at the raven-haired genin was extremely telling. His eyes were fixed on the horizon ahead, and they never wavered. His body held a tension that only a person fully consumed by an ambition could endure. Facing Gaara again meant the world to him. He was out for something, and it could have been any of an endless list of possibilities. Redemption, retribution, revenge, clarity, perhaps even blood. Anything of the sort would fit. Who knew something so outwardly simple could possess so many potential layers? It doesn't concern me, not really, but it certainly is something to think about. I have a feeling I'll be given answers once the chaos ensues, the Hyuga mused. A slight chuckle then escaped him aloud. Funny. It's so unlike me to pine after knowledge that doesn't pertain to myself, he thought to himself. A moment after this thought had crossed through his mind, Sasuke stopped running abruptly, prompting Neji to do the same and await an explanation. After a time, he was given one. I think it's time we rest. It's late, and we should get some sleep. We've got a tent each, so start setting up, the Uchiha said shortly before unpacking the knapsack tied to his back. For around 5 minutes, the genin worked in silence, the uninteresting sounds of unfolding cloth and the pounding of stakes filling the silence. Once they had both finished establishing their separate tents, they cast each other tired looks. Tell me something, Sasuke, Neji said, earning a cocked eyebrow from the ever-brooding Uchiha. What would you like to know? Can't guarantee an answer, though. I'm only half conscious, he replied smoothly. The Hyuga took a seat at the entrance of his tent. What will you do if, and possibly when, we get blown completely out of the water in Uzushio? You seem quite invested in this, but even you must know how abysmal the odds are, he asked directly, not bothering to censor himself in any way at all. Sasuke stared down at him for several moments before giving a predictable scoff. We won't lose. Well, you might. Naruto's a juggernaut at this point, so there's no shame in that. I'll break Gaara, which is all we need. With her as a bargaining chip, we can make him come back with us, he replied bluntly. Neji frowned at his sentiments and shifted slightly. How can you be so sure? You've already fallen to her twice. No offense, but your confidence is misplaced, he said. Sasuke joined him on the ground and rested his chin on his knees. Both times I fought her, I figured things out about the way she fights. She has weaknesses. Ones that I can exploit. I had no way to be ready for her the first 2 times, he said. Neji tilted his head to one side. It's unfortunate that neither one of us was conscious during Naruto's encounter with her. It seems that he found the formula for beating her. He did it easily, apparently, he commented as he recalled what he had heard about the unseen battle. Sasuke shook his head and picked at the grass on the ground. Naruto just clattered her. He isn't a strategist, and never will be. I could feel his chakra in my sleep. He overwhelmed her with raw power. Makes sense, given how much power he showed against you in the last few moments, he replied. The Hyuga was briefly annoyed by the reference back to his loss, but it quickly passed. I'd never actually been knocked out before that match. He hit like an explosive tag. Logically, that route to victory against Gaara doesn't exist for you. She's quite obviously stronger than you past a certain point, Neji said. Yeah, that's not how I'm going to go about this. There are other ways to defuse her, Sasuke said vaguely, increasing the branch Hyuga's interest. It sounds to me like you have something in mind. Would you mind telling me what it is? I'm just dying to know, he asked semi-sarcastically. She's strong, but she's a complete mess. Everything is an ugly charge or a wide swing. She's also totally crippled in confined spaces. I can poke holes in her approach, and I can kill her for those mistakes. I almost did the second time we fought, Sasuke explained. Neji extended his legs out in front of him to stretch them. Sorry to say, but technical skill can be overcome by raw power, no matter what the so-called experts tell you. If you're outclassed physically, your chances of turning that fight around with nothing but skill are slim to none. It's frustrating, but it's the truth, he said. Sasuke shot him a challenging look. I have ways of closing that gap. Don't you worry, he assured his short-notice companion. Taking his shift in tone as a cue to end the conversation, Neji shrugged his shoulders and began to retreat back into his tent. I wish you luck. We won't arrive for another 4 weeks, so we have plenty of time to think and talk tactics. Get some sleep. The pace won't slow tomorrow, he said before closing the flap. The rest experienced by the boys only lasted a few hours, but it was just enough. It was visible in the distance. The outline some kind of wreckage. It was enormous, and it consumed much of the horizon. It was still roughly a mile away, but it was all that was visible. At the sight, Naruto motioned for Gaara to increase her pace to match his energized jog. It was a long run, but one that eventually paid off with an absolutely fascinating and heartening sight. After 5 minutes of near sprinting, they reached the edge of the great sight. Once there, the blonde admired it for a second or two before leading his fellow Jinchuriki beyond the border of the wilderness and what lay before them. Gaara's eyes widened as she and Naruto entered the boundaries of what she assumed to be their final destination. All around them were broken-down structures and cracked stone streets. It looked like a relic of the past, and the landscape was vast. It was a massive, broken, abandoned city. A consistency throughout all of the visible ruin was a swirl symbol that marked most of the larger chunks of rubble. Running through the center of the city was a wide river, clear and blue. It was early morning, nearly a full month after their departure from Konoha. The journey had been long, arduous, and even a bit painful, but they had finally arrived. I think it's time for you to explain where exactly we are, Naruto, she said breathlessly as she admired the broken but beautiful architecture. The blonde took several long moments to answer, as he himself hadn't finished taking in the new environment around him. Once he was finished, he turned to Gaara and smiled. This is, or used to be, Uzushiogakure. The village hidden in the whirlpools. It was destroyed a while ago, and people haven't lived here for a long time, but it was where my family came from. This was the home of the Uzumaki clan way before I was born, he explained. The redhead's eyes widened at the new information as several things snapped together in her mind. His insistence on keeping that fact quiet still perplexed her, but his insistence on traveling as far as they did now made sense. Uzushio was a maze, a grotto, and a stronghold all in one. It was hidden away on a forgotten coast, miles and miles away from all other civilization. It was massive and seemed to be quite intricately designed, and several large structures in view were still intact. It was an absolutely perfect fortress. One day, I found a book at my door that was written about this place and its history. I think old man, the third Hokage left it for me. He never told me anything about my parents or anything like that, but I'm pretty sure he was the one who let me in on this place, Naruto said, seeming to be thinking aloud. Gaara noticed a slightly pained quality to his voice at the mention of the deceased Kage. The man's passing had clearly affected him. In response to his dip in mood, Gaara took his hand. Did the book describe this place's layout? She asked curiously in an attempt to change the topic. Naruto snapped out of his trance and gave a surprising nod. Yeah, actually. I don't remember a lot of it, but I think I know where a few things are, he replied. The redhead stepped closer to him and wrapped herself around his arm. Give me a tour as best you can, then. If this is going to be our base of operations for the time being, I'd like to know my way around, she encouraged him. At this, the pair began to traverse the former hidden village. It truly was the size of Konoha, if not larger. There were numerous different sectors, each defined by a different type of standard building. Much of it was wrecked, but enough of it had maintained for patterns to be noticeable. In the hour that they spent on the southern side of the river that ran through the center, they identified 3 distinctly different areas. One was clearly a residential district, with several of the buildings in the area broken open to expose what appeared to be the bedrooms of former inhabitants. Another was what seemed to be a market, as there were numerous covered areas where tipped-over tables lay. The third and final area they observed was entirely one enormous building. Shockingly, it was more or less undamaged. There were cracks here and there littered throughout its stone exterior, but it hadn't fallen like many of the other large buildings. At this discovery, they stopped exploring to focus their attention on it. What do you think it is? It's larger than any building in Suna. Gaara asked as she stared up and marveled at the structure's height. Naruto shrugged and gestured towards the large door. Only one way to find out, he said as he tugged his companion along towards the entrance. It took him several tries, but he was eventually able to force the door open with his free arm. With the door now ajar, the pair entered the building. What they saw answered the most obvious question of what immediately. Scattered across the floor in front of them and up 2 opposing staircases were books. Hundreds of them. They had been thrown from the vast shelves that occupied the distant walls of the building. It was a library, and an extremely large one at that. I feel so small in here. It's enormous, Gaara breathed, completely mesmerized by the aged store of knowledge before her. Naruto's reaction was no less mystified. It was awe-inspiring. The sheer number of books was staggering, and it appeared that there were multiple levels to the library. It took both of them nearly 5 minutes to fully grasp the sight. "Wanna look around, or should we save that for later?" Naruto asked. The redhead tightened her grip on his arm and stepped back, accidentally off-balancing the blonde. Once he had regained his balance, Gaara shook her head. "The sun has yet to rise, and this place is exceptionally large on its own. I say we make the most of our time and explore the other side of the river." "We have all the time in the world," she said. The former Leaf Genin smiled and allowed her to lead him out of the library. They then made their way to the river several hundred feet to the north of the enormous library. Upon reaching the edge of the river, they encountered a problem. "What's up? You look nervous?" Naruto asked Gaara, who looked quite apprehensive about stepping any nearer to the water than she already was. It took the blonde no more than 10 seconds to deduce what the issue was. "You don't know how to walk on water, do you?" he asked. The former Suna Genin shook her head and shrugged her shoulders. "Other than the odd oasis, there are no bodies of water in the desert. It wasn't a skill I felt the need to learn. They taught it in the academy, I think, but I hardly attended past the first year," she explained. Naruto scratched the back of his head. "I'm guessing you don't know how to swim either. You could float yourself over with your sand, right?" "That could work," he suggested. The redhead thought for a moment. "Perhaps, but what if I lost my balance and fell in?" "We have no idea how strong the current is," she pointed out. Naruto gave her a humorous look. "You're trying to get me to carry you, aren't you?" he asked with a jovial grin. Gaara flushed red and glanced away from him. "Am I really that transparent?" she asked meekly. The blonde laughed out loud and scooped her up, causing her to squeak and reactively wrap her arms around his neck for support. "Yup. You're pretty easy to read for me at this point. Don't worry about it." "I don't mind," he said as he escorted her across the river. "I swear, that gourd is even heavier than you are," Naruto grumbled. Gaara gave an exaggerated pout and lightly knocked her forehead against his cheek. "We've been over this 1,000 times. I can't help that I'm little. I may have been bigger if I hadn't been born prematurely," she grumbled. They then reached the northern side of the river. Once they were firmly grounded, Naruto set her down and ruffled her messy red hair. "Yeah, well, you're still fun-sized. Don't sweat it. Makes carrying you easier," he said playfully. Gaara gazed up at him with pink cheeks and sighed. "At least it benefits us somehow." "I do like being cradled," she admitted. After a few more light quips back and forth, the Jinchuriki set out to explore the second half of Uzushio. Just before they could enter the ruins, Gaara stopped. Naruto made it roughly 10 feet before noticing and glancing back over his shoulder. The girl was staring back in the direction from whence they had come with narrowed eyes. "Gaara," the blonde called out quizzically. Gaara flinched and turned back to face him once again. "Oh, sorry. I was just admiring the river," she said quickly. It was a blatant lie, but Naruto opted not to press the issue any further. After all, there was a tremendous amount of exploration yet to be done. Naruto's eyes cracked open slowly as he was roused from his sleep by the passing of time. It was still dark, but it always was. The place in which he and Gaara had chosen to make their home lacked lighting, and sunlight was unable to reach it. That was because their current dwelling was underground. In the 2 weeks that had passed since their arrival in Uzushiogakure, the pair had discovered a number of things. First of all, they had discovered the true scope of Uzushio's area. According to Gaara, who had apparently walked a lap around the entire city during one of her sleepless nights, it was 8 miles long and 6 miles wide, with a total area of 48 miles. It was a large settlement, and save for a few small animals scattered throughout, they were all alone. The second thing they had found was that the enormous library had a basement of sorts. Though, basement likely wasn't the right term. It was much more of a small, hidden chamber. It had clearly been lived in at a time, most likely by a librarian. It was equipped with a decently sized bed, a table, and several old lanterns that no longer worked. Overall, it had still appeared habitable, and given that the residential districts on either side of the river were mostly destroyed, it had been their best choice. In total, they had slept in the underground room 9 out of their 14 days in Uzushio. The bed was fairly comfortable despite its long retirement from use, and the chamber itself was quite warm when compared to the cold December air above ground. The only recurring issue was the lack of light. They generally spent their days exploring the village above, and retreated back under the library when the sun set, but waking up at a proper time was practically impossible. Sleeping or 1 hour felt the same as sleeping 12 when you had no light to tell you what time it was. At present, Naruto was contemplating this issue. He had just awoken, and he felt fairly well rested, but there was no real way to know if morning had come other than ascending to the surface. Doing so would likely cost him his ability to return to sleep if it was still dark out. There was also another predicament. Gaara was still very much asleep, and she had unconsciously latched herself onto his back while they slept. He was effectively being backpacked. Gaara had joined him in sleep 7 out of the 9 nights they had stayed underground, and each time had produced its own odd position upon their awakening. Naruto was always the first to wake up, and he had done so with Gaara draped on him in a number of ways. The first night, he had come to with his red-headed companion entirely attached to him with her arms wrapped around his neck and her legs hooked around one of his own. Several other times, she had simply rolled on top of him in the middle of the night. She was incredibly mobile while sleeping when unrestrained. The blonde found it to be endearing for the most part, which made it more a positive than a negative. As of now, though, it was something of a bother. The girl needed sleep more than almost anybody else, and peeling her off of himself would almost certainly wake her. If she were to awaken, she would almost certainly insist on following him about until sundown. For all that she was a gentle and loving partner, she was also greatly protective and possessive. She hardly ever let Naruto out of her sight if she could avoid it. It was both comforting and unsettling. "I'd get used to it, if I were you. It isn't going to change," a voice rang from the back of Naruto's mind as he pondered Gaara and her habits. The Jinchuriki's face scrunched up in discontent at the sound of his demon's voice. "Quit reading my mind. It gets old real quick," he grumbled back at the enormous fox. Predictably, the response he was given was a mocking laugh. Patronizing as always, the beast took his sweet time responding. "My point is this, you're trapped. If you ever begin to have second thoughts about that girl, don't think you can just walk away. This is your life now. She is your life now. I've seen types like her before. They don't let go of what they consider theirs easily. Most of the time, not at all," he said. Naruto scoffed at the dark being. "What do you know about people? All you do is destroy them," he asked sarcastically. He could then feel the demon shifting around within his mind. "I'm an ancient being, my naive vessel. I have inhabited countless people across the ages, and I've roamed the globe. I know the human race well, and I've conversed with an endless number of you apes. She's of a specific class. I think the right word would be parasite. One who clings and drains," he said. Naruto scowled and tried to push the dark being away to no avail. "Why does everybody say that kind of thing? I mean, sure, she's made her mistakes, and she's done some awful stuff, but just look at how she's been lately. She's just a lonely girl," the Jinchuriki snapped back. The fox audibly sighed. "I understand that you aren't the sharpest knife in the drawer, but you can't possibly be this blind. Have you noticed that her mercy extends to quite literally 3 people? Those being yourself, and her siblings. It's quite possible that the latter two have faced the brunt of her insanity before, so you may be the only true recipient, he replied tiredly. The former Leaf Genin furrowed his brow. What are you getting at? Quit being so vague about this, he questioned, sounding quite puzzled by the implications of the demon's point. Let me answer your question with another question. If a person's morals only show themselves when it suits their desires, does their morality really exist at all? She's been fairly transparent about the way she feels about human life. It means practically nothing to her. You alone stand in her good graces, the fox said, fully expecting a fiery reply from his container. Much to his surprise, no such thing came. When it didn't, he filled the silence. It's all up to you, in the end. I feel much the same about people as she does, but I know that you don't. I won't say too much, but you'll soon get your chance to choose. Push comes to shove, you'll be reminded of who she is without you to sate her, he said before disappearing into the deepest depths of Naruto's mind. For several minutes, the blonde lay still with Gaara's body pressed to his back. Try as he might to deny it, he knew all too well that the redhead was a criminal. He knew that she was a killer. And yet, he loved her. A small part of himself loathed it, but that self-hatred was still overridden by his affection for the petite girl who he had met in the forest. He had come to know her, learned to understand her, and, in the end, he had slept with her. It had been tumultuous and bloody, but she had won him over. There was no disputing his feelings. They were perfectly clear. There's no point in caring about what she's done anymore. I made this bed, so I'm gonna sleep in it, he swore to both himself and Gaara. At this, he turned around and faced his lover. He then leaned forward and softly kissed her lips. When he lightly pulled away, he saw her eyes flutter open in the dark. Is it time to wake up? She asked with a sleepy, half-lidded gaze. Naruto shrugged his shoulders at the question. No idea. Can't tell what time it is down here, he replied. Gaara then locked her hands behind his back and pulled their bodies together. She was now flattened against him under the covers with her face hovering centimeters from his. In that case, let's just stay like this. Now, kiss me till I pass out again, she said. Before Naruto could accept or refuse, the redhead covered his mouth with her own. For all that she was soft and gentle with him generally, she was a domineering kisser. Even while half asleep. This is your life now. She is your life now. The fox's words rang loudly through Naruto's mind as Gaara indulged herself on his lips. This was what he would wake up and fall asleep to for the rest of his life. The taste of blood. An ever-present reminder of who exactly this oh-so-sweet girl was. A daily gut check. Soon enough, Gaara messily removed her lips from his and wiped them clean with her wrist. So addicting. She murmured before closing her eyes and beginning to breathe evenly. As he watched her drift away into unconsciousness, Naruto made up his mind. He enjoyed the taste of blood. It was never going to be enough, Sasuke. Gaara's grip on his throat then tightened, putting tremendous pressure on his windpipe as he dangled over the edge of the stark drop-off. His face was streaked with blood, his body ached, and he was utterly exhausted. He had nothing left. The end was near, and there was nothing more that could be done to stave it off. Nothing to say? I'm not sure whether to be disappointed or elated. Endlessly irritating as you are, I'm not so cruel that I wouldn't let you have a few last words, the demonic girl jeered him. Sasuke grit his teeth and opened his mouth to snap back, but found that he could do no more than make strangled groans. At this, Gaara gave him a sickeningly sweet smile and tilted her head off to one side. What was that? I couldn't hear you, she asked mockingly. The Uchiha gave her a hateful glare as she admired her handiwork. Then, he felt her stranglehold on his neck ease up just a tad. Oh, do you need to breathe? All right then. Take in as much air as you'd like, she said before releasing him and letting him plummet downward. As he crashed towards the mercilessly solid surface below him, Sasuke's eyes remained glued to Gaara. For a brief moment, he understood. He had once been told that evil came in many forms, and that was a lesson he had learned the hard way on the night of the massacre, but now that teaching had returned to haunt him. First, he had lost his family because of it. Now, he was losing his only friend. With that dark thought, his back hit the floor. Sasuke snapped awake and sat up straight. He was in a cold sweat, and he swore he could feel her bloody hands on his throat. His heart was racing at a horrible pace, he was shaking slightly, and most of all, he was shaken mentally. Nightmares were commonplace for him. They had plagued him from a young age that predated the massacre of his clan. But this had been horrific. Dreams tended to bounce right off of him, since they usually held no real meaning and were fairly random thematically. Unfortunately, this most recent nightmare had been anything but off-topic. It had been vividly realistic. Every squeeze on his neck, every drop of blood that ran down his face, it had all felt so intensely real. Heaving a heavy sigh, Sasuke threw his blanket off of him and exited his tent. It was still dark out, and the air was bitter cold. Winter was coming, and it was coming quickly. 14 days still lay between the inevitable clash between himself and Niji and the pair of Jinchuriki, and there was bound to be snow on the ground by that time. It was fitting for such a potentially negative encounter to take place in the cold. For all that there was potential for a resolution, the chances of it all going horrifically wrong were significant. A number of things had to go perfectly for the mission to be a success. Most importantly, Gaara needed to be suppressed, but not killed. The task of overcoming her in combat was within reach, or at least, Sasuke believed it to be. She was more powerful than he was, but she was susceptible to fairly basic works of trickery. She was smart given enough time to adjust, but she tended to take quite some time to figure a way around a problem. The issue was that any mistakes at all on the Uchiha's part could cost him his life. He needed to walk a fine line, and he needed to walk it perfectly. Allowing the fight to devolve into chaos would be suicide. He would need to cripple her rather than kill her. Gaara dying would be disastrous for the mission. With her gone, Naruto would likely become impossible to convince, and he was far too strong to force into surrender. It was a difficult problem. Gaara was beatable, but only with perfect execution, and Naruto was completely unstoppable for either himself or Niji. Sasuke smirked. It would have been infinitely simpler to simply send Guy or Kakashi after them, but doing so would have been a poor look. The public probably wouldn't mind it if Naruto came back covered in his own blood, but they'd riot if they saw Gaara beaten up. Most people probably weren't paying enough attention to know that the monster fighting Naruto was actually her. Sasuke thought to himself. He then let out a low, short laugh. People are so superficial. Only reason they'd even be angry about it is because she's cute and short. Well, that, and they don't really know who or what she is. Reports never referred to her by name or really by appearance. Just as an enemy Jinchuriki. They don't have a clue, he mused. It was sad, but true. Perception was reality, and Naruto was perceived as a problem. The only reason they sent us out is because they could label it a triumph of friendship and camaraderie. Naruto and I being on the same team is common knowledge. Sasuke thought to himself. He then shivered slightly as a wind blew across the terrain. You really should be sleeping, you know. The Uchiha glanced back over his shoulder to see Niji emerging from the flap of his own tent. The Hyuga slowly made his way to his companion's side and stared out over the same dark horizon. I could hear you thrashing about in your sleep. Night terrors, I assume. Niji asked, earning a delayed, reluctant nod from Sasuke. Always is. I can usually just sleep through them, though. This last one was a little too real for me to sleep again, he explained stoically. The Hyuga cast him a knowing look. Let me guess, it had something to do with what is to come and how it may go horribly wrong, he inquired. The Uchiha raised an eyebrow. Sounds to me like you're speaking from personal experience. Are you? He asked curiously. Niji maintained his silence briefly, but soon gave a response. Likely about different aspects, but yes. Personally, I've been struggling with dreams of what will happen when I inevitably return home with news of my impending loss. Things improved for me slightly after Naruto and I fought, but Hayashi-sama is still a tremendously harsh man, he admitted. Sasuke shuddered at what Niji was suggesting. Hayashi Hyuga was infamously proud and taciturn. Facing punishment by his hand would be hellish. That sounds rough. I don't know what that would be like, but I'm gonna guess that it probably isn't fun, Sasuke said awkwardly. The Hyuga shrugged his shoulders. I've grown used to it. I despise plenty of things about my life, so it sort of blends in past a certain point. What have your dreams been about? He asked, changing the subject smoothly in the process. I keep dreaming about Gaara. About what she might do to me. I feel ready for her, but I still can't shake this feeling that I'm not, he said honestly. Niji put his hands in his pockets to shield them from the wind. Do you fear her? I certainly wouldn't blame you. What she did to you last time was horrific. You have every right to be afraid, he asked. The Uchiha's hands curled into fists and tightened to the point of numbness. It's more than that. I'd be lying if I said facing her again doesn't make me nervous, but I'm also becoming less and less sure of what I'm really fighting for, he said. At his words, a sudden ray of sunlight pierced out from the horizon. The sun was rising. I've been getting that feeling from you for quite some time. Maybe I'm stepping out of line by saying this, but I feel as though you're more invested in punishing Gaara than you are in retrieving Naruto, Niji said. Sasuke didn't respond. Instead, he simply stood in silence. He was fighting within himself. After a time, the Hyuga sighed. What do you want to be fighting for? What is it that you feel is the right thing to do? He asked. Sasuke glanced at him out of the corner of his eye and then shielded his vision from the newly risen sun's rays. I can't let go of what I've seen in her. She's a wolf in sheep's clothing. She'll eat him alive. I can't let that happen. I want to get rid of her, but I can't. I hate this. I hate it so much, he said. Niji put a hand on his shoulder. I can't say that I care all that much on a personal level, but I do understand how you feel. I don't have a solution for your problem, but I do have a suggestion. Should we be beaten and sent away empty-handed, let it go. Forget about them, he said. He then removed his hand from Sasuke's shoulder and made his way back to the tents. Let's save the stress for the moment of truth. That tension could serve us well, he said as he began to pack up his shelter. Though it took him several minutes, Sasuke eventually followed suit. The boys ran in silence for the remainder of the day. A bead of nervous sweat trickled down Gaara's face as the silence dragged on. For the past several weeks, two presences had slowly drawn closer to the borders of Uzushiogakure. At first, they had been too distant to identify, but the more the gap closed, the clearer their signatures became. 9 days ago, Gaara had finally pinned faces and names to the two entities en route for the ruins. Sasuke Uchiha and Neji Hyuga. Not particularly intimidating foes, but ones that held power over her for other reasons. Simply by association, their arrival would certainly complicate things for the redhead. No doubt, they were coming to retrieve the pair. Likely by force, if they were on a mission even remotely similar to that of the hunters. Naruto was still unaware of their impending arrival, and Gaara was quite stuck on whether or not to notify him. On one hand, telling him would likely make the encounter fairly simple. Sasuke was a fairly simple task, as was Neji, but put together, they would be tricky to deal with alone. Naruto still held a fairly large advantage over the redhead in terms of power, and he had beaten Neji once before in quite brutal fashion. The issues with informing him, however, were many from Gaara's perspective. Most prominently, his reaction to the knowledge of his former comrades, one of which being his teammate, coming to face him was difficult to predict. A small sliver of homesickness still existed within the blonde, and his bond with Sasuke almost certainly still held weight. Neji was less of a concern, but he was still a factor. Equally troubling was the fact that they seemed to know exactly where she and Naruto were. The more she thought about it, the more sure she became that a message needed to be sent. Something that would keep them all away. Something that would force all to leave her alone to enjoy a life with Naruto. The world was once again doing its best to tear down any foundations of happiness that she had found the strength to build. Fortunately, this problem was one that could be solved through force. With enough effort, she could rid herself of her opposition completely. They could be removed from her life entirely. The past 4 weeks had been a blissful existence unlike anything Gaara had experienced. She awoke and fell asleep to a kind and caring face every day. Even in the wreckage of a once great society, she had found peace with another person. She had suffered to create this new reality, and she would not allow it to be taken away. Taking a glance to her left, Gaara suppressed the urge to reach out and touch the boy sitting next to her. They were situated at the base of a residential wreckage a few meters away from the river. It was nearing nighttime, and the temperature was dipping rapidly. Despite the oncoming cold, Naruto had still fallen asleep sitting up. It was an endearing quality of his. The ability to make the best of even harsh situations, be them the bitter cold reality of winter or a life of oppression. He remained an inspiration day in and day out. "Let's get you to bed, Naruto," Gaara muttered. She then stood up and reached down to pick him off of the ground. It took a considerable amount of effort, but she eventually was able to sling him over her shoulder. Somehow, he was still asleep. It was roughly an 8-mile walk to the library, which was convenient given that the river was their lifeline. Every day, they caught the fish that dwelled in the river, and the water was clean enough to drink. Overall, it was a dull diet, but one that worked well and was unlikely to fail them. "Why must you be so heavy?" Gaara grumbled as she hauled her significant other along. Eventually, and painstakingly, she reached the entrance of the library. Once she was there, though, she was struck by an idea. Taking a glance around, Gaara spotted another building a fair distance east, one that was still relatively intact. Taking a deep breath and steeling herself for more exercise, the redhead carried Naruto another lengthy distance to the structure. She kicked open the door and peered inside, sighing with relief as she discovered a bed and blankets. They were dusty and disheveled, but they were still very much usable. Carefully entering the run-down house, Gaara laid Naruto down on the sheets and covered him with all of the blankets available. Once he was fully covered and situated, the redhead gently caressed the side of his face and sighed. Sasuke and Neji were bound to arrive inside of the next hour. Pinpointing exactly when was impossible, but it would be soon. There was little time left. The closer they came, the more sure of her decision Gaara became. "I know you'll be upset with me, but I'm doing this my way. Diplomacy is no longer viable. Sleep well, my love," she said before exiting the building and closing the door behind her. There was no realistic way for her to keep both Neji and Sasuke away from Naruto, but it mattered not, for only one of those names was on her mind at present. For all that her mind told her that defeating Sasuke Uchiha a third time would be a relatively simple matter, a nagging suspicion in the back of Gaara's mind argued the opposite. Their first battle had been a massacre in her favor. She had utterly dominated him the moment she had begun to try. Their near-immediate rematch had been harder, but circumstances had played a large role. Gaara had made the mistake of resealing her strength during her battering of Shino and Kiba, which had allowed Sasuke to enjoy a decent margin of success. She was outmatched in her human state, that much was clear. No waiting this time. I'm not taking any chances, she vowed, forming a hand seal and holding it for a moment. Then, a doppelganger of Gaara formed in front of her from the sand that was now leaking from her gourd. Intercept them, she said to the clone, receiving a curt nod in response. Gaara's copy quickly bounded away towards the southern border of Uzushiogakure. Once she was out of sight, the original redhead turned back toward the library and began a rapid walk. There was nothing left to do but wait. I'd heard about this a few times before. An abandoned village, forgotten by time. I never thought I would see it with my own eyes. Sasuke nodded and looked around as he and the Hyuga entered the boundaries of what remained of Uzushiogakure. It was in shambles for the most part, but there remained a timeless flavor of culture to what was still there. Whatever disaster had befallen the once great city had to have been absolutely devastating, as it was quite clear that what was before them now was only a sliver of the village's true size. If I remember right, it hasn't even been that long since this place was thriving. Only around 40 or 50 years. Looks to me like an earthquake hit. The way things have fallen apart and cracked, it all looks like it was shaken from the ground up. Sasuke commented as he stepped over a piece of fallen stone. If you're right, it really does put into perspective just how helpless we humans are in the face of natural disasters. On a whim, Mother Nature can wipe us off the face of the earth. It's a harsh world we live in. Niji said with a dry chuckle. Nature was indeed far beyond human comprehension past a certain point, and people lived according to its whims. And yet, there were those foolish enough to try to control it. At this thought, Sasuke began to think out loud. You could kinda say the same thing about the tailed beasts and their Jinchuriki, don't you think? We convince ourselves that locking them away is the right thing to do, but all we're really doing is delaying the inevitable, he said. Niji raised an eyebrow, but eventually shrugged his shoulders. I suppose you're right. Bijou can't be controlled by humans. Not really. Even those who suppress them aren't really in control. To be brutally honest, I don't think Jinchuriki are people who should be crossed. Perhaps that's discriminatory, though, he said honestly. If you both think that way, then why are you even here? Both boys tensed and whirled around to face rightward. Standing atop the roof of a ravaged building that was likely once the home of a native citizen was the first and last person they had wished to find. Though her clothes were slightly more worn and tattered than they normally were, there was no mistaking her for another. Gaara of the desert was upon them. You know, making us come to you may have been a wiser decision, Niji said as he and Sasuke glared up at the red-headed Jinchuriki. Gaara brushed back a strand of her crimson hair and leapt down from her perch, landing just a few feet in front of the genin. Oh, I will be making you come to me. Well, one of you. You see, my business is only with Sasuke. You're of no concern, she said bluntly. Sasuke scowled and stepped forward. I'm glad we're on the same page. Before we get to that, though, tell us where Naruto is. Do that, and I'll give you a head start, he said menacingly. Gaara smirked and folded her arms across her chest. Go and find him yourselves. It shouldn't be too hard. And, I won't be the one running. That would be you, Sasuke, she said. Before either the Uchiha or the Hyuga could respond, Gaara burst into a shimmer of sand, leaving an empty space where she had once been. After a moment of confused silence, Niji activated his Byakugan. She's in an enormous structure about a mile ahead, and Naruto. He began, scanning the area for a few seconds before finishing his report. Is in a much smaller building quite a bit closer to us. He looks to be asleep, he concluded. Sasuke nodded and stared ahead at the outline of what was likely the building that housed Gaara. It was massive, and looked to be in much better condition than the vast majority of the village. Go find Naruto. I'll handle Gaara, he said. He then began to walk towards his distant destination. Before he could make it even 100 feet, Niji called out to him. Try not to lose your mind. She'll do everything in her power to get under your skin. This will be a battle for optics, not for victory, he said. Sasuke turned around and gave him a puzzled look. What's that supposed to mean? He asked skeptically. Niji jammed a thumb in the direction of where Naruto was dwelling. I won't be able to hold him off for very long. When he beats me, he's going to come running to the two of you. I get the feeling that he'll be less agreeable if he sees you completely off your rocker. Same goes for Gaara, he explained. Sensing that it was a poor idea to wait much longer, Sasuke simply nodded and went on his way to face Gaara. Niji remained and watched him leave. Be careful, you mad bastard, he muttered to Sasuke under his breath. He then sighed and turned to begin his trek to find Naruto. Beating or not, I'll take it like a man. Sasuke struggled to contain his awe at the sheer scale of the building he now stood in front of. He was a mere ant in comparison. It rose at least 150 feet into the air at its peak. As such, the door felt quite undersized at only around 8 feet in height. Taking several deep breaths, Sasuke put his hand on the wooden door and pushed it inwards. It took some effort, but the door eventually gave way to the pressure. Stepping inside slowly, the Uchiha's eyes darted in either direction warily. He was on edge. There would be no surprises. His senses would not allow it. Slowly but surely, he made his way to the center of the bottom floor. He could feel Gaara's presence vividly. She was nearby, practically on top of him. It was an unnerving pressure that he had felt twice before. Unlike those 2 previous encounters, however, this was premeditated. He wanted to be here. He had thought of nothing else for the better part of 2 months. Come out, Gaara. Don't make this any more tedious than it needs to be, he called out into the enormous building that seemed to be a library. For the majority of the next 60 seconds, he heard no response. Just as his frustration was beginning to build, a voice rang out from above. I suppose I shouldn't keep you waiting any longer. It's not as though I haven't been consumed by the prospect of you coming to ruin everything too, came Gaara's voice. Sasuke dragged his glare upwards and to his right, where he spotted her descending one of the 2 stairwells. Though it was difficult, the Leaf Genin kept his calm as she calmly stepped down onto the book-ridden stones of the floor. She was now only a few meters away from her, allowing Sasuke to get his first good look at her since his arrival. She was more or less identical to how she had been at the border of Konoha, but her hair was slightly longer, reaching down to her shoulders with the same messiness. Her eyes were also somewhat bloodshot. Don't get it twisted. I'm here to fix things, not ruin them, the Uchiha snapped back. Gaara's blank face morphed into a snarl in the blink of an eye. You aren't fixing a damn thing. All you're doing is trying to drag us back to a society that wants nothing to do with us. You know as well as I do that Danzo wants nothing more than to weaponize Naruto. Is that what you want? She demanded through bared teeth. Sasuke remained unflinching. About that, actually. You probably aren't aware, but Danzo was found dead in his quarters more than a month ago. He's a non-factor. There's no reason for Naruto to remain out here, he said. Gaara's eyes instantly widened to saucers. Not bothering to wait for her to respond, the Uchiha spoke once more. Looks to me like that's what you were hanging your hat on. The war probably isn't going to happen either. Konoha and Suna are set to have a meeting soon. Chances are, they'll come to an agreement. There's no ground for you to stand on here. This was never about the war. Not for you, anyway. This was and always has been about Naruto, he said, his tone accusatory. Gaara's eye twitched. And so what if it is? Is it too much to ask that I be left alone with the boy I love? She growled back. Sasuke's expression shifted through several different extreme emotions as he processed her words. First, confusion, then understanding, soon followed by disgust. Shut the hell up. You don't know the first thing about loving a person. I doubt you even can. All you know how to do is slaughter. If I hadn't stopped you, you would have killed Naruto in his sleep. Drop this sentimental bullshit. It doesn't suit you, and it isn't real, he said. The redhead's hands tightened into fists. You're going to regret coming here. You've been a thorn in my side from the very beginning. I'm going to kill you this time. I won't let you rip him away from me, she hissed. Her eyes were now a burning gold color, and her canines had lengthened into fangs. Her body was exuding a dark chakra that Sasuke could practically see. He was ours first, Gaara. You stole him away by manipulating him and tearing his life apart. You aren't defending what's yours. You're just trying to keep him isolated, Sasuke said as his Sharingan manifested in his eyes. I deserve something. I don't care who I hurt or what I had to do. He deserved better, and so did I. I'll go to any lengths necessary to make a life worth living, Gaara said before sending a swatch of murderous sand forth from her gourd to crush him. Sasuke easily evaded the assault and punished her by closing the distance between them and driving his left knee into her solar plexus. The blow forced her to retreat a step, allowing the Leaf Genin to pursue her by kicking her knee inward and ruining her balance. The Uchiha then vanished from sight, reappearing 20 feet over her head. Fire style, fireball jutsu, he yelled after weaving the appropriate series of hand signs. A blast of superheated flames crashed down onto Gaara from above, sending a harsh orange glow across the library. Once he was satisfied with the volume of fire he had produced, Sasuke returned to his original position and assumed a taijutsu stance. It was far from over. As expected, once the smoke cleared, Gaara still stood unfazed. Her sand had absorbed the brunt of the jutsu, though it had been turned to glass in the process. You can't beat me like this, Gaara. You know that, he goaded her as she dusted herself off. She responded by slamming her fist into the glass that surrounded her, shattering it into thousands of pieces. Can't I? She replied. The storm of glass shards then swarmed after Sasuke. The raven-haired boy ducked and dove as best he could, but he couldn't fully evade the transparent torrent. After a few moments of pointless and painful evasion, Sasuke clenched his jaw and burst forward. He then knocked Gaara to the floor with a forceful punch to the left side of her jaw. With their wielder momentarily compromised, the serrated storm of glass returned to Gaara's side. With space to breath, the Uchiha retreated to regroup. No, you can't, he said in response to her mocking question. The redhead audibly sighed and sat up, rubbing her bruised jaw. Like I told you the first time we fought, you're like a housefly, she grumbled as she rose to her feet and assessed him. She then cracked her neck and narrowed her eyes. Even so, I'm not going to give you any more free success, she said. Sasuke quickly realized what she was likely implying. If you think I'll just let you transform, then you're dead wrong, he said as he prepared to attack her again. Gaara broke out into a giggle. It's already too late, she said vaguely. The Uchiha opened his mouth to demand an explanation, but the answer slapped him in the face before he could. I put a little bit more effort into creating that one. Just enough to make her serviceably tough. Sasuke's blood ran cold as he forced himself to look straight up to the balcony. Staring down at him with a disturbing grin was another Gaara. She had assumed the transformation that had been his undoing the first time, with an armored right arm, strange tattoos covering her face, and a pair of diamond-shaped irises. He then looked back to the more human Gaara. Sorry, but you've been played, she said with a false smile, her body fading away into a cloud of sand as her words reached him. Before he could react, the transformed, apparently real, Gaara leapt down to the floor from the balcony with a loud crash. Sorry about that. I just felt the need to be cautious. You battered my base state up and down the last 2 times we fought. I think you've more than earned this, she said, her voice husky and dark. The Uchiha nervously backed up a step. How did you transform that quietly? He asked. The redhead gestured towards the upper floor from whence she had come. There's a hidden ladder behind a bookcase that leads to an underground chamber. It's where Naruto and I have been sleeping at night to evade the cold. It also happens to be soundproofed, she explained as she stalked forward. A dark look then overtook her features. I'm not going to take my time like I did before. I'll bury you here, she said. Sasuke swallowed the lump in his throat and drew a kunai. A moment later, Gaara charged. Sasuke ducked down reactively, narrowly avoiding a broken neck as Gaara's right arm swung through the space where his skull had once been. The force of her charge was considerable, as even though he had avoided damage more or less entirely, he could still feel the wind whip through his hair. Taking a sharp pivot on his rear foot to face her once again, Sasuke drove a straight punch into the back of her head while she whizzed by. Though the strike wasn't anywhere near powerful enough to inflict any kind of lasting damage, it did knock her off balance by making her lurch forward. The redhead skittered onto her hands and quickly regained her bearings quickly. She then whirled around and re-engaged immediately. The message was clear, there would be no breaks. It was either adjust or be killed. Unfortunately, Sasuke was unprepared for such a rapid assault. He was hardly able to brace himself before Gaara slammed her entire weight into him and launched him back across the stone floor. The impact was horrific, but Sasuke remained alert enough to catch himself as he hit the ground. As expected, the next charge came a split second later. This time, however, the Uchiha was prepared. Rather than retreat or pivot away, Sasuke planted his feet and intercepted Gaara's entry into his distance. With all the force he could muster, Sasuke slammed his right elbow into the redhead's oncoming temple. The blow stopped Gaara in her tracks and forced her back a step. Ignoring the numbness in his right arm, the Leaf Genin stepped forward and struck Gaara across the jaw with his right hand and rolled underneath her wild counter to the same side. He was then saved by his reflexes, as his body unconsciously brought up his left forearm to block his face. His guard was then struck by the Jinchuriki's weaponized right arm. Despite his successful defensive maneuver, the sheer power with which Gaara had struck him sent him staggering back. She's definitely swinging harder than she was last time. I can't even afford to block. Sasuke thought to himself, barely hanging on to his composure. He had already found success cutting off Gaara's blitzes with intercepting strikes, and he had clearly inflicted some kind of damage, as she had retreated a step, but it wasn't a thing to rely on. The Uchiha took a glance down at his right arm and winced. It was bruised and throbbing. He had done more damage to himself than Gaara. He then returned his attention to the maddened girl, who was stalking about in his field of view. She was searching for openings. I can hang with her up close. Speed matters less there. She's way too quick in open space for me to time consistently. Yeah, I've gotta press her, he decided with a nod to himself. After swallowing his fear, Sasuke charged forward and rapidly crossed the distance that separated them. In a split second, he was only 2 feet from his foe. Seemingly surprised by his gusto, Gaara hesitated momentarily. Not used to being pressured? Sasuke goaded, snapping her head back with a stiff left-handed punch as he spoke. He then leaned back at the waist and allowed Gaara to punch the air just in front of his face in retaliation. As the redhead stumbled forward from her own overcommitment, Sasuke ran her into a spearing knee to her gut and shoved the girl back by her shoulders. Deciding to push his luck even further, the Leaf Genin launched an overhand punch at the left side of Gaara's head. Unfortunately, he had overstayed his welcome in close quarters. The moment he was close enough, Gaara sunk her sand-encased fist into his stomach and knocked the wind out of him. With Sasuke doubled over, the redhead seized him by the front of his collar and violently spiked him into the floor. The impact cracked the stone and caused Sasuke's vision to go black for a split second. When he came to again, Gaara was suspending him in the air by the same grip. "You're certainly making more of a fight out of this than it was last time, but your chances are no better. I can take what you give, but the same can't be said for you," she said. Sasuke replied by slamming his knee into the bottom of her chin to make her drop him. It worked as planned, and allowed the Uchiha to retreat back to a safe distance. Once there, he took a deep breath. "Maybe, but I've got something you don't," he said vaguely, earning a questioning look from his demon-carrying adversary. "With that being?" Gaara asked impatiently. Sasuke smirked and pulled on something unseen, making a ripping sound in the process. A large explosion then erupted from Gaara's body. When the smoke and debris cleared, Gaara still stood upright. This was short-lived, though, as she soon buckled and fell to one knee. "Unlike you, I've got a brain," the Leaf Genin said. The Jinchuriki wiped ash from her face and returned to her feet slowly. "When did you do it?" "The paper bomb." "When?" she asked, frustration audible in her voice. "Just after I ran you into my knee. When I shoved you off, I attached it to your shoulder with some wire on the end. I'm pretty surprised that you slamming me into the ground didn't screw things up, honestly. You actually knocked me out for a second?" Sasuke explained. The scheme had been a simple one, but basics won the day in many cases. Tricks such as this would be required for victory to be even remotely realistic. "I guess I'll just have to try harder," Gaara said, more to herself than to Sasuke. In the blink of an eye, at a speed that not even the Uchiha's Sharingan could react to, she made her way into his personal space. Once there, she simply stood there. It took a moment, but the Leaf Genin eventually did comprehend her movement. When he did, he attempted to counter her with a wide left-handed punch. When he stuck her, his arm simply passed right through her. He was then kicked square in the back. She had left an afterimage in the process of evading him and moving behind him. A feat of raw speed. "I should warn you. The only people to ever overwhelm me at my fullest are my late father and Naruto. 2 people who far exceed you in strength. The only stage I possess beyond this one is a full-blown metamorphosis, which shouldn't be necessary," the redhead said as she allowed Sasuke to turn to face her once again. Her body was unchanged, but it was now outlined by a subtle red light of demonic chakra. "You're a freak, you know that," the Uchiha said. Gaara tucked a strand of her disheveled hair behind her left ear. "A freak that hates you, and a freak that's going to drain your life away. Even if you escape, another beating by my hands would break you. I can see it in your eyes and hear it in your voice. You need this. You desire nothing more than to topple me," she said darkly. Sasuke drew a kunai. "You aren't exactly hard to hate. You should know that. It's not like you've had many friends," he said coldly. At his words, Gaara scowled. "You're the exact opposite of Naruto. He's kind, sweet, and warm. You're cruel, demeaning, and cold. You're disgusting," she growled. The Uchiha prepared himself to fight, well aware that his chances were narrowing. "You stole my best friend. You ripped him away from us because you were selfish enough to not care about the people you were hurting. He had friends, he had comrades, and he was making a life for himself. I have every reason to hate you. You're my enemy, and not because you're from Suna," he snapped back, his own temper flaring. "If you can't protect what's yours, you don't deserve to keep it. You weren't strong enough to stop me from taking him away. That's your fault, not mine," Gaara replied. At this, Sasuke's composure cracked, and he recklessly charged the amplified Jinchuriki. When they clashed together, the foolishness of his choice was made perfectly clear to him. Instead of dodging or defending, Gaara had simply allowed him to punch her square in the forehead. The blow did absolutely no damage. The redhead's neck didn't even budge. "As I told you, the people that have given me anything resembling a fight in this state are superior to you by orders of magnitude. I'm a bear, and you're a rodent," she said as she clamped down on his wrist. She then spun him around twice and launched him straight up into the air. For a brief moment, Sasuke simply floated in the air freely. It lasted only a few seconds, but for a time, there was silence. He was halfway to the intimidatingly high ceiling when he was first hit. The impact came from his left and sent him spiraling towards the rightmost wall. Just as he was about to collide with it, he was bounced painfully back in the direction from whence he had come. "You're the last thing I need to get rid of. Once you're gone, I can live happily." The screamed words came from right over Sasuke's head. As he sailed through the air, the Uchiha opened his eyes to see Gaara bearing over him from above, weaving hand signs. Her eyes were wide and crazed, and her expression was one of maddened desperation. There was no stability. "She's insane. Completely and totally. And she's probably gonna kill me," Sasuke lamented while Gaara completed her sequence. The girl then reared her head back. "Wind style, great breach," she yelled. An enormous blast of wind then unleashed itself from her throat and slammed into Sasuke. The jutsu sent him whistling down towards the stone floors below, and when he hit them, they shattered and embraced him. For the second time during his clash with Gaara, he lost consciousness. Neji stared at the door in front of him. It had been a long walk from the boundary to the house, but the time had elapsed in an instant, it seemed. He had run through a number of mental exercises on his way to Naruto's location, and while they had seemed to work, he was now unsure. He had never been one to partake in pointless endeavors, and this very much felt like one in a number of ways. He had virtually no way to win unless he got quite lucky, and the trek home would be hellish depending upon his injuries. More than that, though, he felt out of place. "This has nothing to do with me. I hardly know Naruto or Sasuke, and I've never actually met Gaara," her clone aside. "This isn't my conflict. This isn't my fight. Why am I even here?" he pondered as he reached out to open the door. He then pulled his hand back. "Am I a coward for not wanting to do this? Why take a beating for people that mean so little to me? What's the point?" he thought to himself, his feelings incredibly conflicted. In the midst of his struggles, a loud crashing sound came from the background. The Hyuga whirled around and searched for the source. It took him all of 30 seconds to hit upon the answer. It had come from the library. At this, Neji turned back to the door. "I have a job to do. That's why I'm here," he thought firmly. He then pushed open the door of the small, damaged house. It was a single room, and it had a small bed, a table, and a few scattered books. It was extremely messy, but that was to be expected of a home left to stand the test of time. Within the room was who Neji had come to find. Naruto was sitting on the bed with his eyes downcast. He was clearly conscious, which was somewhat odd. "I didn't think you'd be the one he brought along," the blonde said as Neji stepped inside carefully. Though it took him a moment, the Leaf Genin found his voice. "Neither did I. I suggested that Lee go in my place, but they refused, so here I am," he explained, earning an almost imperceptible nod from the Jinchuriki. A frown slowly spread across Neji's face as he studied his former comrade. "How long have you been awake, Naruto? You were asleep when I first located you," he asked skeptically. Naruto remained unmoving and silent for a few moments. "Around 10 minutes. I woke up when the air got warmer. I don't know how or why I'm in this house, but I have a few ideas," he said, sounding quite unsure of himself. "You may not be a censor, but you know what's going on. Don't be coy. You also know who put you here. I'm sure you know why as well," Neji said, quite irritated with Naruto's feigned ignorance. The Jinchuriki looked up at him and stood to his feet. "What's your point?" he asked, earning a look of somewhat shocked confusion from the Hyuga. Neji gestured behind him in the direction of the library. "If you're aware of what's going on, why aren't you trying to intervene? You're the strongest thing on this coast by a mile. Even if in support of Gaara, you could end the conflict in an instant," he asked with rising intensity. The Hyuga's indignation was a surprise to both of them. "That isn't my business. That's Gaara's fight to win or lose. I've got no right to step in," Naruto said. Neji scowled and took a step forward. "Not your business? Sasuke is your friend. Your teammate. Gaara is your companion, and, from what I've been able to infer, your lover. Why on earth are you being so impartial?" he demanded. The blonde frowned back. "Why should I have to choose when they're already fighting? I'm not picking sides," he replied defensively. The Hyuga's face contorted in disgust. "Are you kidding me? They were always going to fight. They're after the same thing. They're both here for you. You were always going to have to pick a side. If you don't, they'll make a decision for you. Is that what you want?" he questioned. Naruto opened his mouth to snap back, but shut it again. "You put yourself in this position, Naruto. You ran away, and you took her along with you. Did you think Konoha would simply leave you be and let you wander? This was inevitable," Neji said. When the blonde once again didn't respond, the Hyuga shook his head. "At first, I didn't understand why Sasuke despised the notion of you being left alone with Gaara so much. I thought it to be an overreaction. But looking at you now, I understand. She's made you indecisive and resigned. That's so far the opposite of who you are, or at least what I thought you were. She's breaking you, he said with a look of something almost resembling sympathy. Finally, Naruto reacted. Why are you even here, Niji? This has nothing to do with you, he asked quietly. The Leaf Genin stared at him intently. Because I was curious to see if there was any truth to what Sasuke claimed, and it turns out that he was correct. And now, he's fighting a battle he can't safely win. All for your sake. I was inspired by that motivation. I thought there were lessons I could learn from joining him, he explained. The blonde lowered his head back to the floor. Why's he going so far for me? He can't beat Gaara. He just can't. Hell, I don't know if I could do it again, he muttered. Niji swallowed his frustrations and put a hand on his shoulder. Yes, you could. Quite easily, I'd wager. Right now, though, Sasuke is wagering his life on the idea that he can break you of Gaara. I can't control who you choose to side with in this fight, but I implore you. Pick a side to fight for. Don't sit idly by and twiddle your thumbs, he urged the blonde. Give me some time. I'm just really stuck. I know what I want to do, but it feels wrong, Naruto said. Niji shook his head and turned around to exit the building. You don't have time. If you know what you want to do, come and stand behind that. Neither one of them are going to let up. There'll be a dead body before you come to any sort of concrete decision, he said, taking a deep breath a second later. I know what side I'm picking, though. I'm going to go help Sasuke. Sasuke slowly regained his senses. He had been knocked out again. For how long, he knew not. It clearly hadn't been excessively lengthy, as he was still very much alive. The first thing he saw as his vision returned to him was, unfortunately, Gaara's form looming over him. He was in the base of a small, stony crater, and the redhead was standing over him. I'm shocked that didn't kill you. It was supposed to. I put a good deal of effort into that, she said, reaching down towards him as she spoke. She then took hold of his shirt's front and plucked him from the rubble. Being suspended upright in the air caused a gash that had been opened on his forehead to bleed down into his eyes. After blinking numerous times, the Uchiha felt the pain come rushing through his body. You're comically tough. Only a few of your ribs are broken. I guess relying on gravity to smash you wasn't the most efficient of choices, Gaara said. Her armored right arm then twisted and morphed into a serrated spike. Naruto won't be happy with me for killing you this way, but I think he'll get over it. What do you think? She said mockingly. At the mention of Naruto's name, Sasuke's temper reignited. The sound of Gaara saying his name brought him rage. It was the tone more than the name itself. She spoke as though she owned him. The redhead then leaned into his ear. Don't worry. You'll get another shot at me. We'll see each other again in hell, she whispered. She reared back her bladed arm and thrust it forward toward his abdomen. In stark defiance of Gaara's desired outcome, Sasuke mustered his negative emotions and allowed them to grant a final burst of strength to him. We're not done yet, he growled, his since deactivated Sharingan manifesting in his eyes once more. The Jinchuriki's expression gained a degree of apprehension when she saw that a third tomo had formed in each of his irises. His dojutsu had fully matured in his desperation. Sasuke then seized her by the wrist that was holding him up and squeezed it until a loud cracking sound could be heard. Yelping at the sudden pain, Gaara released him from her grip and leapt back away from the crater. Well, this is certainly a surprise, she growled. Rising to his feet after having been dropped, Sasuke grit his teeth and sent a fiery glare Gaara's way. The majority of the Uchiha's shirt had been torn away by the impact of his fall, thus making the markings that were spreading across his body all the more visible. At this sight, Gaara stepped back nervously. The very same thing had happened during Sasuke's final push in the stadium hall. It had very nearly resulted in her decapitation. After a minute, Sasuke's body stopped changing in any noticeable way, leaving him with a widespread tattoo that was rooted in his shoulder. There was a spiraling aura of purple chakra emanating from his form, and his expression was intense and visceral. You aren't going to ruin him. I won't let you, he said in a rough tone. At this, he jumped up to the side of the crater opposite Gaara. I don't know how many times I'm going to have to flatten you to make you quit breathing, but I'm not stopping until I find out, the Jinchuriki said with a fabricated calm. And so, they began the final stage of their final contest. The library shook as Sasuke and Gaara clashed together forehead to forehead. The leap across the radius of the crater had provided great momentum for both combatants, and had resulted in a monstrous impact. Though they were able to stay airborne above the ground for a moment, they quickly pushed off of one another and rebounded off of the floor to engage once again. When they came together for the second time, Gaara swung for his head with her encased arm in an attempt to end the fight immediately. Unlike previous exchanges, though, the Uchiha was able to anticipate and counter her attempt to harm him. Just before her forearm could connect with his face, he ducked down underneath it and let her miss. A half beat later, he popped back up with an uppercut that snapped Gaara's head up. He then caught her unarmored wrist as she attempted to punch him despite her own ruined posture as a result of Sasuke's counter. With her arm seized, the Uchiha yanked her forward into a knee to the gut. In a moment of narrow-mindedness, Sasuke had taken his eyes off of Gaara's right hand after it had whizzed over his head. For this reason, he was blindsided on one leg with his knee buried in the redhead's abdomen when the Jinchuriki swung it back the other way and backhanded him across the jaw. Due to having been unaware that the strike was coming, Sasuke was stunned and knocked to his rear end by the crude blow. Luckily for him, he was able to recover nearly instantly and return to his feet. Once he was upright again, he was forced to defend himself immediately. During his momentary slip, Gaara had closed him down once again and reared back her right arm to strike him again. It was then that Sasuke made his read. Instead of simply ducking down and countering her, he took the same risk he had earlier and intercepted her entry. As she fully committed to striking him, Sasuke planted his feet and threw a straight punch inside of her wide swing that speared her across the left side of her jaw. Much unlike the first time he had tried the tactic, it worked this time. Gaara's knees turned to rubber while she missed wildly with her attempted follow-up. Try as she might, she couldn't regain her bearings and was unable to defend herself from the 3 punches Sasuke clattered her with directly after rocking her. After being lit up by strikes for a brief few moments, Gaara recreated space by leaping straight into the air. Predictably, Sasuke leapt after her to maintain his forward pressure. He attempted to strike her with a punch, but was knocked back down toward the ground by a stomping kick from the redhead. The strike had served 2 purposes for Gaara. It had both repelled Sasuke away from her, and sent her up onto the balcony above. She now held the high ground. "Look who's running. Do I scare you that much?" Sasuke goaded from down below. The Jinchuriki gave him no discernible reaction. Instead, she formed the same sequence of hand signs she had before launching the Uchiha into the floor minutes ago. Recognizing the motions easily, Sasuke began to form his own jutsu with hand seals. Within moments, their respective techniques were fully formed. They then reared their heads back. Wind style, Great Breach. Fire style, Fireball Jutsu. A great blast of wind then collided with a burning inferno of searing flames, both having been launched from the mouths of the foes. As was the elemental dynamic, Gaara's wind massively amplified the power of Sasuke's fire, but it also sent it into a chaotic storm of omnidirectional superheated energy. Both children were consumed by the flames along with the interior of the library. Through the burning fire, they both emerged in a charge towards one another, with Gaara leaping down from above and Sasuke launching himself off the ground to meet her. When they collided, Sasuke landed first, but Gaara landed harder. The Uchiha connected with a left-handed punch to her temple, but was immediately countered with a punch on the same side. Despite the difference in impact, they both fell to the ground and landed with a thud. For a time, they both lay motionless among the burning stones and books. Eventually, however, Sasuke rose to his feet. Gaara took slightly longer, but eventually made her way to a stable stance. "You're going to die here," Sasuke the redhead said breathlessly, her fatigue extremely obvious in her voice and body language. The raven-haired boy spat blood out of his mouth and cleared more from his eyes. "Before we tear each other apart, tell me something, Gaara. Why Naruto? Aside from him being a Jinchuriki, why are you so fixated? Why did you go to these lengths to try to keep him to yourself? Just tell me all of that," he asked raggedly. Much to his surprise, Gaara gave him a straight answer. "Because he actually bothered to try to understand me. I terrified him, and I still do, but he did what he could to make me happy. Even if he hasn't fully succeeded yet, the fact that he's been willing to try it all means more to me than I could ever express. I didn't plan for things to go this way, but I'll take what I can get," she explained in a pained tone. "You know, if you just kept quiet in that cell, things might have worked out for you. You would have been let out eventually, and Naruto would have helped you. Even if the escape was his idea, you encouraged him. This is on you, even if you didn't mean for things to fly off the rails," Sasuke replied, a hint of begrudging sympathy in his voice. "I want no part of the hidden village system. The discrimination against Jinchuriki is widespread and unfixable. If I was ever going to make a life with him, it would have been in isolation. There's no other way," the Jinchuriki said firmly. Sasuke shook his head and drew a kunai. "I still can't let that happen. I'll do what I have to stop you. Even if that means maiming you," he said darkly. Gaara's eyes narrowed and her posture shifted to an aggressive crouch. From there, they threw all caution to the wind. Neji strained his legs to carry him faster as he ran across the ruins toward the library. A large flash of fire had lit the early morning darkness moments before, and it had brought the Hyuga great panic. Things were spiraling out of control, and time was short. There was little he could realistically do to assist Sasuke, but he would try regardless. From what he could feel, Sasuke had somehow managed to close the gap in strength rapidly. Gaara's chakra signature was still noticeably more potent, but the difference was virtually non-existent compared to what it had been only minutes before. The issue was that the power Sasuke had acquired felt incredibly unnatural. It was dark, cold, and parasitic. It was allowing him to compete and inflict damage, but it was also ripping his body apart. Though Gaara's power was also foreign, she had wielded it for the majority of her young life. The longer the fight dragged, the more the advantage would belong to the redhead. Unfortunately, the Hyuga found himself unable to run any faster than he already was. It would still take him nearly 5 minutes to reach his destination. As thoughts of what could go wrong swirled in his mind, something came into the view of his Byakugan from behind. Neji quickly recognized the entity and felt some of his nerves settle. Running at a speed the Hyuga could not even begin to muster was Naruto, and he too was headed toward the library. Apparently, he had made his decision. What it was difficult to say for sure, but Neji had a somewhat confident theory. Within moments, the blonde tore past Neji at a blistering pace. At the sight, the Leaf Genin stopped running and sighed. It's probably best that I take my time, actually. My presence contributes nothing with Naruto involved. I figured we'd be waiting longer for him to make up his mind, he thought to himself with pursed lips. At his current pace, Naruto would reach the library within 2 minutes, and hopefully, he would put a stop to the violence. There were still no guarantees, but it was a hope that Neji clung to. This has been a truly sobering experience. Perhaps I should write it all down when I return home. Just for posterity, he mused dryly. He was exhausted mentally, and he hadn't even participated in any combat or long discussions. Just a single argument that had lasted less than 10 minutes. Perhaps it was the struggle to understand that had drained him. He had entered the assignment completely uninvested in the task at hand. In truth, he had only agreed to collect a paycheck and some potential notoriety. Now, though, he cared. He cared about the outcome of the conflict between Sasuke, Naruto, and Gaara. He still hardly knew them, but their struggles felt personal. I wonder why that is. What changed? Neji pondered. After a moment, he shook his head and resumed his journey to the library, but at a much slower pace. Indeed, it had been a long day, but it was still far from over. Gaara grimaced and clenched her jaw as she retreated away from Sasuke. Of the many exchanges she and the Uchiha had engaged in, the most recent collision had been one of the most painful. After having missed badly with a leading punch, Sasuke had slammed his forehead into her jaw in the form of a headbutt. His skull had bruised and injured her jaw. She was seeing double, and her face was in pain. Sasuke never let her rest. Not before, and not now. As such, he had increased his aggression at the sight of her discomfort. With great intensity, the raven-haired boy dug a punch into the right side of her rib cage with his left hand before cracking her over the top of her shoulder with his right hand. The combination buckled Gaara further and sent her to her back. Sasuke then crashed down on top of her to take advantage of her compromised state. As he did so, though, Gaara thrust out her armored right arm and grinned. The sand encasing the limb then sharpened into a blade as it had once before and sliced open the right side of Sasuke's face. The laceration sent a spray of blood down onto the Jinchuriki. Her retaliation had the desired effect and caused Sasuke to back off and take steps backward. Gaara took the opportunity to rise to her feet. Sasuke's face was almost fully masked in blood. He had a large gash on his forehead that leaked down onto his nose and eyes alongside the massive cut Gaara had carved into his face only a few seconds ago. His skin was more red than white. At this sight, a smirk spread across the Jinchuriki's lips. "You look quite nice in red. Though, that blood loss probably can't be good for your health," she called to him. Sasuke replied by launching a pair of kunai her way, both of which she easily deflected with her encased arm. She was then sent stumbling by a punch to the temple from her right side. She was able to remain aware despite the unexpected blow, and she turned to face her foe. "Surprised you fell for that, honestly," Sasuke said as he charged forward and swung a kunai at her neck. Gaara leaned back and narrowly evaded the blade and another punch from the Uchiha. When she tried to counter him, though, she missed 3 times consecutively. For all that their levels of strength were incredibly similar, Sasuke's heightened perception that he gleaned from his now complete Sharingan was a deadly weapon. He was incredibly difficult to hit when he was dictating pace and positioning. As payment for her numerous misses, Sasuke punished her with a counter-punch that landed squarely behind her left ear and ruined her equilibrium. Gaara took a knee in front of him and caught herself with her hands. She was then kicked across the face, a blow that caused her to tumble away. She quit sliding and rolling roughly 20 feet away from Sasuke, and when she was fully lucid again, the sound of chirping birds hit her ears. "Unless you have enough left in you to stop this head-on, there's no way you're dodging me this time." Gaara's eyes widened at the sight of a sparking purple mass of electricity emanating from Sasuke's right arm. He was in a familiar kneeling position, and his eyes were fixed on her chest. He was right. While both of them were exhausted and slower than usual, Chidori provided its user with a guaranteed level of speed. One that Gaara could hardly react to even while fresh. She was checkmated. "This is over," Sasuke said with finality. He then charged forward and instantaneously crossed the distance between them with his spear of electricity. All the redhead could do was close her eyes. No stabbing sensation ever came. The sound of electrical birds never ceased, but Gaara herself never felt any pain or any impact. Slowly but sure, she allowed her eyes to open. What she saw brought her a storm of disorganized emotions. "That's enough. Both of you, just stop," Naruto, who was somehow standing between them, said in a strained tone. He had stopped Sasuke's Chidori by seizing his wrist with both of his hands and pushing back against him. The jutsu was still active, but it was stalled. Where did you?" Gaara began, losing her voice at the end as she trailed off. The blonde shoved Sasuke back a few feet and took a deep breath. "Niji came and found me. He made me think about some things. I came running when I finally got things sorted out. The door was open, so I didn't need to make a huge entrance," he explained to the two combatants. "Why are you stopping me, Naruto?" Sasuke asked while he let his Chidori fizzle out into nothing. The blonde remained stoic and glanced back at Gaara, who averted her eyes from his. "Because nobody has to die today. Not you, not her. I know why you're fighting, and I know why you want each other dead. You're fighting over me and where I'm going to go," he replied. The markings on Sasuke's body slowly retracted and shrunk as his expression changed from one of aggression to one of reserved unease. "Yeah, we are, but don't you understand why? Am I supposed to sit back and let that freak take you off to the middle of God knows where? Not in 1,000 years," he said with an angry glare at Gaara. "I get why you're doing what you're doing, Sasuke. Believe me, I do. There are things you don't understand, though," Naruto said in response. Sasuke wiped some blood from his eyes. "I know she didn't force you to run away, but there's no way you can convince me that she didn't at least encourage you to do it. Also, I just can't get behind the idea of letting her be alone with you. She's incredibly dangerous," he countered. Naruto shook his head. "She's dangerous to everybody but me. First of all, she wouldn't hurt me. That much I'm sure of, and even if she tried, I'm a hell of a lot stronger than she is, and she knows it. It would never come to that anyway," he said firmly. "Do you really expect me to buy that? She almost killed me 2 or 3 times, and she would have murdered Shino and Kiba if I hadn't stopped her. How can you be so sure she won't just turn you into a corpse?" the raven-haired ninja snapped back. The blonde once again looked to Gaara. "I know that she's cruel and violent with most people, but I'm completely sure she wouldn't and won't hurt me. I know you haven't ever seen it, but she has feelings, and she can be gentle. You just weren't ever going to be in any position to understand that. It isn't your fault at all, but still," he said a bit more quietly. Gaara, who had been silent since Naruto's sudden arrival at the scene, finally spoke. "I love him dearly. I fought you to keep him from being taken from me, that's true, but not because I wanted to hurt him. I would never. I'd rather die," she said. Sasuke's eye twitched. "That can still be arranged," he growled. Naruto immediately stepped forward and allowed his eyes to shift from blue to red. "Unless you think you can take me down, don't try anything. I just want the fighting to end," he said dangerously. Well aware that his chances against the blonde were utterly non-existent as he was now, Sasuke sobered somewhat. "I still can't forgive her for what she's done. I also can't let go of the insanity I saw all 3 times I fought her. She isn't a good person. Not even close," he said. Naruto pursed his lips. "Even if you can't forgive her, please don't make me fight against you. I'd hate having to hurt you to prove a point. I know that she isn't a good person in a lot of ways, but she's still human, and she deserves a chance to change. Also, over time, I've come to love her too. She isn't perfect, and there are things I'll have a tough time getting over, but she isn't a monster," he said. Initially, Sasuke didn't react. Over time, his expression progressed through several stages before settling on one of exhaustion. "How did it all come to this?" he asked, seemingly more to himself than Naruto or Gaara. His former teammate walked forward carefully and put a hand on his shoulder. "It was out of our hands. Maybe neither one of us is right, but I still stand by what I said. I'm not leaving her alone. I get why you want me to, and who knows? You might be right. I know that you suffered for this, and you went to hell for me, and I appreciate that. I really do," he said softly. Sasuke met his eyes and did his best to stay calm. "I can't put into words how much I hate this," he said stiffly. Naruto sighed and lowered his eyes to the floor, his hand dropping from the Uchiha's shoulder at the same time. "I know you hate it, and honestly, I don't love it either. Even if I actually do like being around Gaara, I still don't like being all alone out here. It's a mixed bag, but this is where I'm gonna stay," he said. There was then a moment of silence. "Can you accept that?" the blonde asked. Sasuke took a deep breath, held it in for a bit, and then released it. Just as he was about to speak, the sound of footsteps alerted all three ninja. A glance toward the door revealed Niji, who had just arrived. Choosing to ignore the Hyuga for the present, Sasuke turned back to Naruto. He then gave a reluctant nod. "I don't have much of a choice, so yes," he muttered dejectedly. Before the blonde Jinchuriki could respond, Sasuke reached forward and tapped him on the forehead with his index and middle fingers. He then promptly turned around and made his way over to a sympathetic-looking Niji. "If you ever want to come back, my doors are open," he said before exiting the library with his head down. Naruto touched the spot on his forehead that had been poked and stared at where Sasuke once was. "I'm sorry, Niji," he said to the Hyuga, who simply shrugged his shoulders tiredly and turned to follow his companion back to Konoha. "As I said, it's up to you. I'll extend the same offer Sasuke did. If you ever wish to return, just tell me. I'd make space for you in the branch house," he said before disappearing out the door. For a stretch, Naruto gazed out into the cold morning. Eventually, he turned back to Gaara. What he saw made him gasp. She was unconscious on the floor of the library, which was still on fire in some areas. Rushing to her side frantically, Naruto pressed his ear to her chest. He heaved a sigh of relief when he found a fairly strong heartbeat. She had reverted back to her human form, and she had likely passed out from exhaustion and attrition. "He really did a number on you, huh?" he said to the unconscious girl. He then picked her up and cradled her against himself. The blonde carried her up to the second level of the library and found the correct bookcase, which he pushed to the side to reveal a ladder. "Let's get you to bed." Naruto snapped out of his near sleep at the sound of stirring sheets. Turning around in his chair to view the bed, he saw Gaara sitting up. She had been asleep for nearly 4 hours, and it was now nearly 10 o'clock. Her awakening was a great relief to the former Leaf Genin, as the duration of her sleep had been greatly concerning. She still looked groggy, but she was very much conscious now. "Hey, you alright?" Naruto asked the girl. Gaara turned to face him briefly, but quickly looked away and gripped the sheets tightly. Easily understanding the source of her struggle, Naruto stood up from his chair and sat down on the edge of the bed. "Look, I know today's been kinda awful, especially for you, but please. Talk to me, Gaara," he gently urged her. Though it took her a while, the redhead finally did look at him. "I'm sorry, Naruto. I'm so sorry," she said britly. Naruto didn't speak for a fair amount of time. There was much he needed to process. Much he needed to solve. "Be honest with me. Will you ever let me have other relationships? I don't mean romantic ones. You're all I need for that. I mean friends and acquaintances," he asked. Gaara nodded her head and fiddled with her blankets. "As long as they don't try to take me from you or drive a wedge between us, I don't care if you get to know other people. I'm not the only thing that should make you happy. If they do try, though, I'll kill them," she said with absolutely brutal honesty. Naruto winced. "You really shouldn't, Gaara. Killing is wrong in every way. Especially if they didn't try to take your life first," he said. Gaara reached out and touched his cheek at his words. "You're all I'll ever kill for now. I know how wrong it is, but losing you is something I'll do everything in my power to avoid. That includes murder. No questions asked. I'm sorry if that bothers you, but my heart is set," she said. The blonde laid his hand over hers and took hold of it. "I'll accept that, but only on one condition. If you think somebody is trying to take me from you, let me deal with them first. If I can't make things right, then, I guess you can go wild. If I do manage to solve things, then leave them alone." "That sound reasonable," he said diplomatically. Gaara thought about his proposal for a moment, eventually nodding. "Yes, I can agree to that. I'll always leave things of that nature up to your discretion," she said, giving Naruto great relief. Once he was fully calm again, he extended his hand and brushed back Gaara's bangs. "Man, you two really trashed each other. Too bad you don't heal as quickly as I do," he said as he gazed at her marked face. The redhead frowned. "I don't know how he damaged me this much. I beat him senseless last time. He closed the gap so quickly. I just don't get it," she said frustratedly. Naruto recalled the odd tapping gesture Sasuke had performed on his forehead. "Something about people is that they're at their strongest when fighting for something they believe in strongly. I don't really know how else to put it," he explained. Gaara studied him. "Perhaps I was at my strongest then. Because, selfish as it was in some ways, I was fighting for you. You're all I believe in, and all I care about," she said. Her tone was flat and apathetic, but her words were sweet and warm. It was a simple statement of facts for her. "I'll try to be worth believing in, then. And hey, I care about you a ton too. I'd have gone insane if I hadn't been able to stop Sasuke from skewering you," Naruto replied. Gaara smiled for the first time since her awakening. "Thank you for saving me. That's the second time you've saved my life. I don't really know how to repay you. It's not as though I have anything to give you," she said gratefully. Her fellow Jinchuriki laid down beside her over the covers. "You can give me your word on something, actually. That'd be a way to repay me, even though I don't really need you to, he said. The redhead gestured for him to continue. Every once in a while, I want to bring Sasuke and a few other people out here. Not to stay permanently or anything like that, but just to visit. If I do that, can I trust you to be calm and maybe even a little social? He asked. Gaara's face contorted momentarily, but she soon mellowed. Give me 2 years entirely alone with you, and I'll agree, she said. Naruto leaned forward and kissed her on the forehead. Yeah, sure. It'll be a bit before it's even safe to bring them, so that's fine with me, he replied with a thumbs up. Naruto then sat up and stretched, prompting Gaara to kick her legs out over the side of the bed to sit beside him. Can we go outside? I need some fresh air, she asked. The blonde nodded and offered a hand as he stood up. She took the hand eagerly and allowed herself to be led up out of their underground dwelling and into the charred library. They quickly exited the building to escape the smoky air. Once there, they walked to the river at Gaara's request. I have a request, Naruto, she said when they reached the edge of the flowing body of water. Naruto raised an eyebrow. Okay. What do you need? He asked skeptically. Gaara pointed to the cold stream and then back to herself. Can you teach me how to swim? She asked innocently. The blonde chuckled and shook his head, much to her disappointment. It's November, Gaara. You'll freeze to death in there. Maybe in a few months, he said. The redhead sighed and latched onto his left arm. Can I make another request then? A different one, she asked. The blonde Jinchuriki kicked a stone at his feet into the water for his amusement. Sure, but I can't really make a whole lot of things come true for you right now. We're a little bit limited right now, he warned her casually. Gaara stepped in front of him and wrapped her arms around the back of his neck. This is something you definitely can make come true, she said vaguely. Seeing that Naruto was confused, the redhead gave him a warm smile. Can we have a family here in a few years? She asked hopefully. Taken aback, Naruto reddened slightly and scratched the back of his head. It'd have to be in a few years, like you said. Let's grow up a little first. But once we're ready, yeah. We can do that, he said somewhat awkwardly. The redhead gave him a kiss on the lips and made more space between them. Fine with me. As long as I can have your children someday, I don't care when it is, she said sweetly, causing him to blush heavily again. After a few moments, he regained control of the heat in his cheeks. You could say that another way, you know, he grumbled. Gaara shrugged her shoulders and threaded her fingers through his. She then pulled him along to walk with her by the river. A few minutes into the walk, a voice chimed in from Naruto's mind. So, are you prepared to live this life? You have no way out now, the fox asked, earning a calm response from the blonde. Yeah, I am. I made this choice, and I'm satisfied with it. She's flawed, but she's so damn lovable, he replied. The demon shifted around in the far reaches of his consciousness. Lovable though she is, evil will always exist within that girl. Shikaku's mark has been made, and it cannot be erased. Not even by you, he warned his container. Naruto looked to Gaara, who was happily leading him along with a tranquil smile upon her face. I know that. Today taught me that lesson. Sasuke was probably fighting against a demon before I showed up, but with me, she's just a cute, happy girl. As long as I can keep her positive, she'll be harmless, he said. The fox laughed a bit at his optimism. Well, your life is my life, so I hope you're right, frankly. Regardless, you've accomplished something remarkable. He began, pausing for dramatic effect. You've made her love somebody other than herself,